Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be going to what if the Assel Pirates didn't split part 4. Make sure to like and subscribe, it helps, and it means the world to me. Also join the Discord. Disclaimer. There may be mature content and maybe 18 plus content, and I don't own this story, and link to the author down below. Go check them out. With that stuff out of the way, let's begin chapter 31. Like lambs to the slaughter. It was silent in the brothers' room. No one was speaking and no one was going to. They were all scattered around the room, Luffy on the bed staring at the ceiling, Ace laying against the door, head in his knees, and Sabo was sitting at the desk, holding his head in his hands. The air was thick with tension, but none of them had it in them to try and get rid of it. They just wanted to sit in silence and worry, wanted to overthink all the outcomes of seeing their grandfather. Whatever happened today would be the deciding factor in the brothers' lives. If Garp decided he wanted nothing to do with them, they would have to flee, probably go after Shanks, and hope he would help like he had said he would. If Garp accepted them, they might end up returning home, see Makino and Dayton and the bandits again. If Garp took them and forced them to become Marines that instant, needless to say, they would do the same thing as an option 1. There were so many outcomes and possibilities whirling in their heads that they couldn't even focus on worrying about just one of them. Ever since they had gotten out of the facility, their lives had been filled with more stress and nervousness than ever before. The whole point of escaping the facility was supposed to be for them to finally be free. Free of these bad feelings, free of people trying to control them, free of anyone who could hurt them, but at the moment, they were basically trapped in a glorified facility where the pirates were the doctors instead. Time must have passed much quicker than the brothers had realized, because in no time at all, Sabo could hear shouts on the deck of someone spotting Garp's ship. He knew that this meant someone would be sent to get them, and that he should tell Ace and Luffy, but at the moment, all he wanted to do was curl up in the bed and sleep for a year. He's here. Sabo eventually managed to say, his voice coming out in a soft whisper of regret. Ace and Luffy heard it nonetheless, and soon Ace was standing and moving away from the door, while Luffy shuffled off the bed, fidgeting with his straw hat. Sabo made his way to the door, barely making it on time to open it after the first knock sounded, coming face to face with Izo. He couldn't say that he expected the 16th Division commander to be the one there. Normally it was Marco, and if not him it was Thatch, but instead there was Izo, smiling and waving to the three. I came to tell you that Garp is here, Izo said calmly. Sabo nodded, putting on at least a tiny smile. Thank you, Commander. We should probably be on our way then, Sabo said. Izo began walking away, expecting the brothers to follow, and they did, filing out of their rooms and heading down the hall to the deck. It was a strange sense of déjà vu for them, and Sabo was beginning to think that this hallway would always be filled with their feelings of discomfort, because every time they walked down it, they were on their way to do something that terrified the brothers to no end. Reaching the end of the hall, the brothers shared a glance, steeling themselves for any of the many outcomes they had come up with in their head to happen outside the door. We can't run now, can we? Ace asked, eyeing the door to the deck wearily as Izo moved closer and closer to opening it. I wish. Sabo responded, holding back a snort. Luffy shifted nervously, gaining their attention. Grandpa's still like us, right? Luffy asked. He hadn't said anything, but that was the scariest part to Luffy, that his grandfather wouldn't like them anymore because of what happened. Sabo and Ace didn't know what to say. On one hand, they didn't want to give the boy false hope if Garp ended up hating them, but on the other, they didn't want him to walk out there thinking that his grandfather was going to hate him. We just have to go and find out, Lou. I'm sure everything will work out in the end. Sabo decided on saying eventually, Ace eyeing in relief that Sabo had handled it. Luffy nodded mutely, looking to the ground and grabbing his brother's hands, holding them tightly and relishing in the warm feelings coming from Ace and Sabo. He knew they were nervous, he didn't need his powers to know that, but he was grateful that they were still trying to keep him happy. It may be a little selfish of the youngest, but it made him happy. Izo opened the door, oblivious to the silent conversation happening behind him, and they were finally out on the deck. Ace scanned it quickly, using his superior vision to scan even the farthest end of the deck, making sure there was no threat at all that could harm him or his brothers. He continued scanning until his eyes landed on Garp, taking in the appearance of the man he knew from long ago. He looked different, his black hair fading to a gray now, though there was still a bit of black there, and he had more wrinkles than he remembered, or maybe he just never noticed them in the first place. For the most part, the man looked the same, still big and burly, still an intimidating figure, but there was something about him that seemed more subdued than he remembered. His big smile was gone, the childish air he normally held was gone, and he looked much more depressed than Ace ever remembered seeing him before. Ace hadn't realized he'd been staring at the man for so long until they were right up to him, all three of them gazing at their grandfather while he did the same back. Luffy still hadn't looked up yet, hadn't seen his grandfather. He was too scared that if he did he would just see hatred in the man's eyes, and Luffy didn't know what was worse, Shanks taking back his hat or seeing hate in Garp's eyes. He tried reaching out, tried to tell what the man was feeling, and all he got was an overall feeling of nervousness which confused Luffy. He didn't know that the man could even feel nervous. He was always so brave and strong, what did he have to fear? He could also feel an underlying tone of happiness, and Luffy took that as a good sign. Hey there Garp. Sabo managed to say weakly, using his free hand to wave a bit. The blonde could barely keep his legs from shaking as he stood in front of the man who once chased him and his brothers through the jungle for hours on end in the name of training. It was like a dam broke at those words though. Tears gathered in Garp's eyes and were falling just as quickly as he charged forward, the brothers too shocked to move. In seconds they were engulfed in his arms, all squished together tightly, painfully. I'm so glad you boys are okay. The Marine cried out loudly, the brothers quickly becoming uncomfortable with the situation. Jesus shitty Gramps, you've gotten soft haven't you? Ace asked weakly, prompting Garp to nearly drop the three. I told you to call me Grandpa you ungrateful brats. Garp roared, remembering quickly that Sabo had called him Garp. The two oldest flinched, remembering what usually followed that exclamation. Preparing themselves for the painful hits they were surprised when they never came. Peeking open their previously closed eyes they saw that Garp had been stopped by Luffy, the youngest having run into their grandfather's arms and hugging him, and though he made no sound, it was obvious by the slight shaking that the boy was crying. Daiji, I am sorry we got caught, and we were taken, and they hurt us, and I'm sorry. It was almost like when they saw Shanks all over again. Garp looked shocked for a minute before he was crying again, hugging Luffy tightly in his arms. No one had the heart to say anything within this moment. Ace and Sabo watched on silently, neither one wanting to interrupt the two. It looked like they both needed this. After a few moments, the two finally began to calm down, and Garp set Luffy back down. Where have you boys been? Garp asked, his voice rougher than it normally was, but they ignored that, Ace and Sabo glancing at each other, while Luffy wiped away his remaining tears. Well, why don't we go talk about that somewhere a bit more private? Sabo suggested nervously, glancing at the many eyes on them, all waiting for them to spill about what had happened to them in the facility. Understanding that this was an important topic, Garp's expression became much more serious, and he nodded. We can go to my ship then and discuss things there. Garp offered, the three nodding in agreement. Whitebeard, we'll be back shortly. Thank you for taking care of my brats. Garp said, addressing Whitebeard now. The giant captain nodded to the Marine, smiling. It was no problem, Garp, he said. With that the brothers were following their grandfather onto a Marine ship, the Marines saluting at once. Garp gave some orders, one of them being for no one to disturb him, and they began making their way to a private room, much like they had done on Shanks' ship. Once they were settled and Sabo was sure there was no one lingering close enough to the room for them to listen in on them, he launched into another retelling of their long 7 years apart, feeling no qualms about hiding anything that happened from Garp. That didn't mean he was happy telling it, but he didn't skirt around the truth when it came to their abilities and weaknesses. He talked about Ace's devil fruit, his and Luffy's slight resistance to sea stone and water in general, all of their heightened senses, their fear of doctors and nurses, Luffy's abilities. All of it. Luffy had left like last time as Sabo told Garp about what happened when Luffy got his abilities, and the blonde could see the fiery hatred in Garp's eyes, his fists clenching painfully tight as he tried to keep the anger from coming out. By the time he finished, Sabo felt exhausted, having relieved his entire time in the facility for the second time in 2 days. It wasn't pleasant to think about any day, and when he had to relive every moment it was worse. When he was finished, Ace and Luffy sitting beside him once more, they waited for Garp's response, wondering how the man would react. I'm sorry, he said, his face morphing from anger to shame, shocking the brothers even more. That was probably the last emotion they expected their grandfather to show. Sorry? For what? Ace asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair, curiosity taking hold of him. Luffy shifted uncomfortably as he felt the shame Garp was feeling almost double, making him feel shameful himself, even though he had nothing to be ashamed of. That place, the facility, it's a government-run building, Garp said softly. The brothers' eyes widened in shock, even Luffy's. He knew enough to know what that meant. Why you mean? Sabo couldn't form a coherent sentence anymore, as he felt panic begin to rise in his chest, knowing he should try to control it. By the looks of it, Ace felt the same way, his eyes wide and darting around the room, already looking for a way to escape. If that place was a government-run building, as in the Marines controlled it, then they were literally surrounded by their worst enemy. They were the mice who had willingly walked right back into the mousetrap after having just escaped from it. They've been over there for a while, don't you think? Thatch asked. He was leaning over the railing, his chin in his hands as he stared at the Marine ship. Beside him, Namor rolled his eyes. They're seeing their grandfather for the first time in, what was it? 7 years. They have a lot of catching up to do. Besides, don't you have lunch to be making right now? Namor asked. It was nearly noon now and the chef had been standing at the railing the entire time since the brothers had left. Yeah, Thatch started with a sigh, standing up straight and dusting off his clothes, lighting a cigarette. I guess I'll go do that then. Tell me when they get back. Thatch mumbled, beginning to walk away. You're getting too attached, Thatch. They have a family that they're probably going to return to now, Namor said, knowing his brother was sometimes much too caring, and would only be heartbroken when the boys had to go. So what if I get attached? How can you not? Thatch asked, raising his arms in exaggeration, as he continued to walk away from the fish man. Namor shook his head, a smile playing on his lips at his brother's antics. Well, I guess you're right about that one, Thatch, Namor mumbled, taking Thatch's place as he leaned over the railing. Why you tricked us? You let them take us there. Ace accused, jumping out of his seat, pulling Luffy with him as he did. Sabo wanted to argue against Ace, tell him to calm down, tell him Garp wouldn't do that, but it had been exactly what he had been thinking as well. He found himself scooting away from the table, getting ready to stand as well. You let them take us for 7 years and didn't even come for us. Ace continued, his white panicked eyes narrowing in anger. Ace? And now what? You want to take us back? Ace asked, squeezing tightly at Luffy's hand. The youngest of the three looked petrified, looking at Garp with a look of betrayal. He was too panicked because of Ace and Sabo's emotions, as well as his own, to even feel anything Garp might be feeling, and he didn't trust himself to take down a wall to see what color surrounded his grandfather. He was terrified that if he did successfully take the wall down, he would see a familiar black surrounding the marine, but he was also terrified that he was too panicked and would take down both walls and end up seeing the man's memories as well. Well, I'm not gonna let you bastard. Ace finished, already starting to move for the door. Before he could reach it though, the marine blocked it, placing his hands on the fire teen's shoulders. Ace, listen to me. Garp pleaded. Ace was going to retort, about to flame up so Garp would let go of him, but the man continued. I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't know you had been taken to the facility. If I had I would have found you and gotten you out. Garp said, his hands slipping from Ace's shoulders as he spoke, dropping back to his side as he looked at the ground, glaring and clenching his fists again. It was silent and tense in the room, a feeling the brothers had become highly accustomed to by now. And why should we believe you? Ace growled out. The marine looked up, opening his mouth to respond, but sighed and closed it, looking back down. You shouldn't and you don't have to. If you don't want to, that's fine. I'll take you to any island you want and let you three go, never see me again, or I'll even let you just stay with the Whitebeards and decide things from there. But please, believe me, I would never do that to you boys, you're my grandsons. Garp pleaded. Everyone lapsed into silence again, and Luffy tried calming down, so he could feel Garp's emotions. He could only feel sincerity from the man, which made Luffy believe his grandfather was telling the truth. Not lying. Luffy tapped to Ace and Sabo. Sabo, who had stood up once Ace started charging for the door, walked up behind Ace, placing a hand on his shoulder to calm the hot hat down. We believe you, or at least, Luffy and I do. Ace might need a while to cool off. Sabo said carefully, as calmly as he could. Garp nodded, sighing again. I understand. He said, shuffling back to his seat and sitting down. Sabo looked at Ace, who was staring at the door, glaring as he thought. You can go if you want, Ace, but I'm staying to keep talking. Sabo tapped out, already turning to sit back down as well. Luffy looked between his brothers with worry, feeling the anger rolling off of Ace, being careful not to let it get to him by feeling the peace and calm coming from Sabo. Mind made up, Luffy turned as well, sitting back down beside Sabo. Everyone waited, watching to see what Ace would do, and after many moments of silence, he finally gave out a huff of annoyance, spinning on his heels and shuffling back to his chair beside Luffy, grumbling all the while. So it's a government-run facility. Did you know about what they did there? Sabo asked, because if Garp did know and allowed it to exist, that would be almost as bad as him ratting them out and sending them there himself. No, of course not, only Sengoku and a few other really high-ups know what happens there. I only know that it's a government building where they're doing some sort of testing. I didn't know it was human experiments, on children no less. He said with a scowl. Sabo nodded. When I found out you three disappeared, I had my men looking everywhere for you. We searched all the blues, and when we didn't find you there, I knew you were on the Grand Line or even the New World, which made it much harder to find you. I asked for Kagami's help, and he asked for Whitebeard's help. Thank God he happened to be on that island. I don't want to even think about what could have happened instead. Garp said, shaking his head and looking down again. The brothers shivered at the thought as well. Ace and Sabo would probably still be locked up there, and if they were lucky, Luffy would have left the island, but even then, his chance of surviving out on the sea by himself was slim to none. The Marines know that the facility has been destroyed, and have already sent people to try and get whatever they can from the building. Seeing as you were there for so long, you were the center of many of their tests, and because of that, the Marines know of you. They don't know that it's you specifically, all they've got on you is your numbers, the ones on your wrist. They're already having search parties sent out to locate and recapture any escapees, and they especially want you three back. Garp said, worry-lacing his tone. Panic filled the brothers again at those words. So there were people coming after them then. In that case, it was probably a really bad idea to try and go back to Dawn Island and pretend nothing had happened. What would happen if a search party came and found them? Would they hurt the people there just to get them back? They didn't want to find out. The good news is, they don't have any clue what you three look like. The most they know is your powers, devil fruit abilities and all, and roughly your age. If you refrain from showing others your powers and the numbers on your wrists, then you should be safe. Gar continued softly as if someone was listening in on them, which Sabo was sure there wasn't, seeing as he hadn't heard anyone get closer, and none of them could sense anyone with their hockey. That's great and all, but what now? Do we just go back home and forget any of this happened? Hide for the rest of our lives? Ace asked, fury at being powerless once again taking form in him. Garp sighed, leaning back in his chair, shaking his head. No, it's too dangerous. Even though Dawn Island is known to be protected by me, that obviously didn't stop them from getting you the first time. I've got an idea, but I don't think you three will like it all that much. Garp said with a resigned tone. Ace raised an eyebrow, his frown deepening. We're not becoming Marines if that's your big idea. He stated bluntly. Their grandfather shook his head. No, that's not it. Besides, it would be a bad idea to try and make you three Marines now. They would find out too easily who you are, Garp said, shocking the brothers. Garp had been a poster boy for the Marines, always boasting that it would be the best and only place the boys would end up in their lives, and now he was telling them that it was the worst place for them, and that they shouldn't join. Ace said dumbly, clearly shocked. What's your plan then? Sabo asked. I think you should stay with the Whitebeard pirates. Are they back yet? No, Thatch. How about now? Still no. NOOWW. No? But what about? Thatch, I swear to Kami, if you ask if they're back one more time I'm going to cut your hair off. Thatch gasped at the threat. Izo. You wouldn't dare. Thatch cried. Izo turned a glare on the chef. Try me. Thatch cheeked, clutching his precious hair and running back into the kitchen. Almec. The red force crawled slowly yet surely across the waters. The winds had died down a bit, and any good progress they had been making to the next island had stopped, the sails pushing the ship along lazily with every small gust of wind. The crew milled along lazily, much like the wind, finding no motivation to do anything that involved more than walking a few feet. After seeing the brothers and the party that had ensued, the pirates of the red-haired captain's crew were all fighting their massive hangovers, headaches throbbing and light blinding them. That didn't stop the loud yelling from coming from the captain's quarters though. Can't believe they've been there for 7 years. Inside, the Captain Shanks was ranting to his first mate Ben, the two having been in there ever since they had left the brothers with the Whitebeards. They didn't know what had happened to their favorite anchor and his brothers, but from the yelling they've heard so far, it was nothing good. 7 years, Ben. I should have asked Whitebeard if there were any surviving bastards so I can go kill them. Better yet, let's go find a necromancer or something. Someone who can bring them back to life just so I can kill them again. Surely someone's got some kind of devil fruit that'll make that work. Yassop and Lucky Rouge shared a glance at the words, wondering just what these people had done to piss their captain off this much. Well, they did take their little anchor, but they felt that something really bad must have happened to him for their captain to go this all out. What do you mean that's too crazy an idea? Fine, how about someone who can damn their souls to hell for all eternity? Do you think we could manage that? Shank's voice was bordering desperate, but more of a wild desperate that threatened violence along with it if his demands weren't met. Hey, does anyone else see that ship over there? Someone near the railing asked. Yassop looked, realizing that there did seem to be a quickly approaching ship. Ah, Marines. Think they're here about our little visit to Whitebeard? Yassop asked. Lucky Rouge shrugged beside him, taking a chunk out of the meat he was holding. Who knows? Who wants to go tell the captain? Lucky Rouge asked, everyone quickly calling out nodders. The poor unfortunate soul who hadn't said anything had been too preoccupied nursing his headache to pay any attention. Looks like you're up, Richie. Knock him dead. Someone said, Richie looking up in confusion. Once he was briefed about what was happening he paled, swallowed, then nodded, standing and nervously heading to the captain's cabin. The yelling had yet to die down, mind you. There was a cease in the yelling momentarily, most likely because Richie had interrupted him, before the yelling was back, louder than ever. And now these bastards are here too. Good, I need a good fight. Shank's voice got louder as he walked out of the cabin, face red with anger and eyes blazing as he narrowed in on the marine ship. Ben walked out behind him, shaking his head, though he looked annoyed as well. Damn, I was hoping it'd be bigger than that. Needless to say, the Marines didn't even know what hit them. Chapter 32. A new home. Alright old man, you've officially gone insane. Ace said with wide eyes. Sabo couldn't help but find himself agreeing with his brother's statement. First, they found out that Garp didn't want them to be Marines, and now they were finding out that he wanted them to stay with pirates. Luffy, who had been silent up until then, staring at the table, looked up with an almost questioning look, a small frown playing on his lips as his shifting stopped. He was trying to read his grandfather's feelings, but it was hard, the man feeling shame one second, guilt the next, and then relief, but now, it was calm. He felt almost a resigned feeling coming from the Marine, and it confused Luffy more than ever, not sure how to take that. You want us to stay with pirates? Sabo asked slowly, trying to wrap his mind around Garp's thinking. It's not really that I want you to, it's more that at this point in time, it's the safest place for you three. Garp tried explaining with a shake of his head. Sabo's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Since when did you think staying with pirates was safe? Ace asked, eliciting a frown from Garp. When the Marines took my grandsons for 7 years, Garp muttered darkly, effectively silencing the brothers. Everyone sat in silence, thinking over Garp's plans. But people? Luffy finally asked, gaining everyone's attention. Garp raised an eyebrow, not quite understanding the youngest question. Are they good people? Shanks said they're good people, and they've been nice, but there are so many colors, and if we have to stay with them, they have to be good people because bad people are mean. Luffy rambled, Garp finally understanding the question. Yes, Luffy, the Whitebeard pirates are very good people, they would never hurt one of their own, Garp said confidently, knowing that that was rule number 1 when becoming a Whitebeard pirate. But we won't be one of them, we'll just be there. Ace countered because if this was happening, he was going to make sure that these people wouldn't hurt them. Just being there will make you one of them, Ace. You don't have to have their mark for them to think of you as their family. Garp explained, and it was still a strange contrast to see someone who once expressed daily their hatred for pirates, suddenly start praising them. They won't hurt us? Luffy asked, wanting to make sure. They won't, I promise, Luffy. And Luffy believed him, not only because he was his grandfather, but because he could feel the sincerity in the man's emotions. Say we do agree to this, are we just supposed to stay with them for the rest of our lives? Ace asked, crossing his arms and narrowing his eyes at his grandfather. They had always dreamed about becoming pirates because pirates were free, but when you're forced to become a pirate with no other choice in your life, it takes that freedom away, and when that freedom is gone, were they really becoming the pirates they had always dreamed of being? For now, yes, but hopefully, in the future, this will all blow over. If you stay hidden long enough, the Marines may just believe you three died and give up on the search. If that doesn't happen to be the case, then I can't blame you if you decide to leave the Whitebeards, or even become pirates. Garp said, and it sounded like he didn't want to be saying the words, yet he did. You've become much more understanding, Sabo said in surprise. Garp sighed. Well, a grandfather can be picky about how his grandsons choose to live their lives, especially when their options have been significantly narrowed, Garp said, looking to the ceiling with a frown. That's great and all, but have you talked to the big man about all this? What if he says no? What then? Ace asked. Sabo nodded in agreement, surprised Ace was bringing up such great points. Garp laughed, not his normal bellowing laugh that the brothers were used to, but more of a knowing chuckle. Oh, believe me, I don't think it'll take that much convincing, Garp said, the smile not leaving his face. This only confused the brothers more, but they shrugged it off. Why don't you let us talk this over for a few minutes? Sabo asked, the Marine nodding as he stood up and left the room, leaving the brothers alone. Sabo waited until he heard the man's footsteps get far enough away that he wouldn't be able to hear their conversation, and turned to his brothers. Well, what do you guys think? Sabo asked, already having a feeling he knew how they felt about it. I think it's a horrible idea. They're pirates, and now we know the Marines are looking for us too. If they find out we're the ones they're looking for, who's to say they won't turn us in for money? Or use us for our power? Ace asked. Sabo nodded, understanding where his brother was coming from, and to be honest, he was having many of the same thoughts himself. You're right about that, Ace, but playing devil's advocate, where would we go instead? We can't go back to Dawn Island, and we have no idea where in the Grand Line we are. Even if we just go to the nearest island, we have no money, no supplies, and no experience with sailing these waters. We would also be much more vulnerable to attacks, Marine or pirate. Sabo said, not quite sure himself what the right answer was. We could fight him, and besides, we could just borrow a few things. Ace said with a shrug. Sabo sighed, shaking his head. We're trying to stay hidden, Ace, not raise attention towards ourselves by stealing and using our powers against anyone we come in contact with, Sabo said. Ace pouted, crossing his arms over his chest. So you're saying you want to stay with the pirates then? The eldest asked accusingly, narrowing his eyes at the blonde. Sabo frowned, shaking his head again. No, that's not what I'm saying at all, I'm just being realistic. The last thing I want is to go back to the Whitebeard ship and stay with them for who knows how long, but our other options aren't looking that great either. Sabo argued, leaving Ace silent. Jai said they were good people, Luffy said eventually, not meeting his brother's gazes. Since when do we listen to the shitty geezer? Ace asked with a raised eyebrow. Luffy shrugged meekly. I dunno, but he wasn't lying, and Shanks said they were good too, and he wasn't lying either, Luffy said softly. Lou, they may have said that, and meant it, but that doesn't mean it's true. The Whitebeard pirates might be completely different people when Garp and Shanks aren't around, so of course, they would think they were good people, even if they really weren't. Sabo said slowly, frowning as he spoke. Luffy frowned now as well, shaking his head. Bad people have bad colors and feelings, the Whitebeards didn't have those. If we leave, the bad people might find us again, and I don't like the bad feelings, they're slimy and gross. Luffy said with a grimace. Sabo looked up to Ace, hesitating. But if we stay with them they could turn into bad people too, like those doctors that started blue and turned gray. Ace said. It wasn't that they wanted to scare their younger brother, but they were just trying to take into account every side of this story. But bad people don't keep promises and don't have the warm feeling. Giant Mustache had lots and lots of the warm feeling, he's not bad. And Mr. Chef kept his promises too, he's not bad. Luffy argued, glaring a bit now. Realizing things were beginning to escalate, Sabo tried to calm the boy down. We believe you, Luffy, they might be good people and they might stay good people, but what about all the others? What are the chances of everyone staying good? It only takes one to ruin a bunch, and we have to be aware of the fact that, even if things are good for a while, when they find out about us, there's a chance they might turn on us. Sabo explained slowly. Luffy went silent now as he began thinking. He knew Sabo was right, that there was a chance that they would turn on the brothers once they found out about them, but Luffy didn't really like their other options either. So what's our choice then? Sabo asked with a sigh, leaning back in exhaustion. This was all emotionally taxing on him, and he just wanted his life to go back to simple normalcy. If we stay, he knows how long we'll be with the pirates, but if we leave, he knows how long we'll stay hidden before we're found out, Sabo muttered, running through every outcome as quickly as he could. It seemed like a hypothetical question, one that, no matter what answer you gave, it was never the right one. The three sat in silence, none of them liking either option more than the other, but all of them knowing they needed to choose, and soon. Assuming they don't find out about us or turn on us, then staying with the Whitebeards would be the safer option, Sabo said eventually, though not because he liked saying it. In theory, it was easy to keep their past hidden, but reality was much different. They would have to keep Ace and Luffy from using their devil fruit powers around the pirates, which was easier said than done. It was a miracle they'd kept them hidden this long. But if they do turn on us, then they'd be the worst option. Ace countered. If we keep this up, then we'll get nowhere. Sabo sighed, leaning over the table and putting his head in his arms. I think we should stay with the pirates, Luffy piped up. Sabo raised his head back up in shock, while Ace raised an eyebrow at the statement. Really? Sabo asked. Luffy wasn't fond of strangers or large crowds in general after everything that happened in the facility, more so than Ace and Sabo, so for him to be saying that was surprising. I think they're good people too, Luffy said, determined. But Ace trailed off, not quite sure what to say to that. It was obvious Ace wanted nothing to do with the pirates anymore, and Sabo still wasn't sure where he stood on the whole thing, but to hear Luffy so boldly claim that he wanted to stay made them hesitate. Why? What if they're not good people? Ace asked. Luffy shrugged, swinging his feet as he looked to the ground. We leave. Ace and Sabo are strong, I think they could beat him up and get us out if we needed to. Luffy said confidently, raising his head and beaming at his brothers. Sabo looked away from Luffy, looking towards Ace now. Ace? He asked, wanting his brother's opinion of this change of events. Ace's lips thinned as he thought about it, his eyes narrowing and eyebrows furrowing. If, and I mean if, we stay with the pirates, then we need to set some ground rules. Ace said sternly, Sabo and Luffy nodding in agreement. We can't let them know about the facility or our powers. Ace said, beginning to count off on his fingers. And that means no devil fruits either, alright Luffy? Ace asked with a pointed look to Luffy, who pouted but nodded regardless. And we won't ask for much. We're gonna avoid them turning on us any way we can. Ace said, ticking the rule off on his finger. He got more nods of agreement in response. If we are staying indefinitely, they're probably gonna make us do chores or something, so no complaints about that either, Sabo added as a bit of an afterthought, Ace nodding in agreement along with Luffy. And Luffy, you'll still have to keep an eye out for any dark colors. Ace said, Luffy's face growing serious as he continued nodding. Sound good? Sabo asked, mostly to Luffy. The youngest still had a determined, serious look on his face, but he nodded. Let's get this over with then. Ace grumbled. Hey Thatch, they're coming back, Flamingo muttered from where he stood, seeing the three along with Garp finally emerge from wherever they had gone to. Thatch practically ran to the railing, beaming brightly. Finally. It's almost the end of lunch. Thatch said happily, some commanders laughing at the chef's over-enthusiasm. The entire crew watched as they reboarded the Moby, Ace scanning over everyone with a glare, while Sabo was speaking quietly to the youngest who was looking at the ground as he walked, Garp leading them. Hey, you guys. Lunch is almost over, but I've still got enough for you if you want to go eat. Thatch greeted the brothers who looked to Garp. The Marine nodded. You boys go on, I'll talk to Whitebeard. He said, the brothers nodding and following Thatch, who began talking animatedly. Garp, what is it you wanted to talk about? Whitebeard asked as Garp made his way over, sitting in front of the captain. I've got a bit of a favor to ask you, Nuge. Garp began with a sigh. The giant raised an eyebrow. Oh? He asked, waiting to hear what this favor was. Garp nodded, frowning. I want you to watch over my brats for a bit. The man requested. Whitebeard leaned back in his chair while the commanders watched in confusion. And how long is a bit? Whitebeard asked, not having expected this request. Another sigh escaped Garp as he looked at the giant. As long as you would be willing. Whitebeard frowned along with some of the commanders. Wouldn't you want to take them with you? After all, you just got them back after they've been gone for years, Marco said, watching Garp nod in agreement. I would like to take them with me, but I can't keep them safe anymore, Garp said softly, only confusing everyone more. You're a Marine, are you implying that pirates are safer than the government? Izo asked with a raised eyebrow. For those three, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Marine said almost painfully. Whitebeard frowned. And why would that be? Whitebeard asked curiously, wanting to know more about the three he was interested in. He did want to take the brothers in, they would make good additions to his family, but it didn't make sense why their real family would want them gone so suddenly after finally reuniting with them again. The place they escaped from it was a government-run facility, Garp said, looking away and frowning, hearing some of the commanders gasp. That place was allowed by the Marines, Josu asked, having seen firsthand what was happening at that place. Others nodded, showing they were thinking the same thing. As much as I hate to say it, yes. I didn't know what they were doing there, but after the boys told me, Garp trailed off, and this only made the pirates more curious. They hadn't gotten anything out of the brothers about what happened in that place, but it seemed they had told the Marine, not that that shocked them all that much, he was their grandfather. After they escaped, the Marines started sending search parties out for anyone with the numbers on their wrists. They especially want my grandsons back. Garp growled out. Why them especially? Fossa asked. Garp frowned. Because they were there the longest, they have the most information on them. They don't know what they look like though, they only know their ages and their numbers, but just that much is enough for them to find them and take them back. I can't let that happen, not after I just got them back, so I'm asking if you'll take them with you and keep them safe. Garp said, nearly pleading now. The doors to the galley opened and the brothers were walking back out, Thatch still talking happily beside them, as they made their way back over to the captain, who was deep in thought, glancing to the brothers. Sensing the serious mood, Thatch slowly stopped talking, joining the other commanders, while the brothers joined Garp. I assume you know about what your grandfather was requesting? Whitebeard asked, the brothers nodding. Yes, Whitebeard sir, we would appreciate it if you took us in, but we understand if you cannot, Sabo said with a slight bow. Whitebeard watched them for a moment, the brothers resisting the urge to shift nervously under the man's gaze, before smiling. Alright, I'll take your brats in for you, Garp, Whitebeard said eventually, eliciting a sigh from both Garp and the brothers. Thank you, Newgate, Garp said, standing. Whitebeard nodded while Garp turned to the brothers. You three be good, you hear? And no causing trouble for Newgate and his men. Garp said with a stern glare, the brothers nodding. I've raised you three to be good Marines, but I guess that's no longer going to be the case, so you better be the best damn pirates this world has ever seen. Garp exclaimed, tears beginning to fill his eyes. The words filled the brothers with so much emotion it shocked them. They hadn't ever thought they would hear Garp encourage their dreams of being pirates, but they also hadn't expected to hear many of the things Garp had said that day. I'm gonna miss you, Jai Jai. Luffy cried, running to give Garp another hug. I'll miss you too, Luffy, but I'll come to visit when I can, so you three better not get weak on me. Next time I'm here, training will resume. Garp announced, sending shivers down the brothers' spines as they remembered their grandfather's training sessions. In that case, don't come back, you shitty geezer. Ace grumbled, earning a glare in response as Garp cracked his knuckles. What was it, you ungrateful grandson? Garp asked. Ace made a very unattractive noise before he bolted away, Garp chasing after him with his fist raised. Is this how you thank me for making you strong, young boys? It was thanking you, insane bastard. I told you to call me Grandpa Brat. Chapter 33. Getting situated. After Garp stopped chasing Ace, he finished saying his goodbyes before he boarded his own ship, promising to visit again when he could. The brothers waved as he sailed off, much like they had done with Shanks, but this time, no one else was coming. They were going to be stuck with the Whitebeard pirates for a while. What now? Ace asked when they finally finished waving. Sabo sighed. We can't get away with hiding away in our room all day anymore, we might as well stay out for a bit. Sabo responded reluctantly, glancing at their surroundings and noticing they were once again the center of the Whitebeard pirates' attention. You'd think they'd know not to stare by now. Ace responded with a sour look as he continued glaring at everyone. Sabo sighed as the brothers turned and began walking off in a random direction. Curious people stare, Ace, it's just what they do. Sabo said as he took in their surroundings. Now that they knew they were going to be here a while, they should at least get used to the layout of the giant ship. Yeah, well, they shouldn't be so damn curious. Ace tapped, but even he was looking around to better orient himself. Luffy was glancing around as well, using his sense of smell, so that he could place smells with objects or people. He was listening to his brothers tapping, following their silent conversation with ease, even if he couldn't see it, as he focused on a bundle of rope that smelled especially salty, probably having been in the ocean not too long ago. Looking around some more, he noticed a familiar sweet scent, turning to find that it was coming from Lady Not Lady, who was making their way towards them. He wasn't worried about the lady not lady hurting him or his brothers. After all, they were projecting only calm and even happy feelings, and their color had been blue last time Luffy checked, so he focused more on their scent, doing his best to remember it. Aizo. That's right, that was lady not lady's name. Sabo's tap alerted Ace to the presence of the commander, and he tensed slightly before continuing to walk normally, as if he didn't know the commander was there. Ace, Sabo, Luffy, Aizo's words had the brothers stopping, Luffy peering up at his brothers, gauging their reactions. Sabo looked like he was steeling himself, taking a deep breath before smiling and turning to face the man, Ace turning as well, though the only thing he did was hold back a scowl, while Luffy turned timidly. He didn't know how to feel about lady not lady. On one hand, they were nice, that much Luffy knew, and they hadn't done anything to hurt him or his brothers so far, and he had a good color and good feelings too, so that helped, but they didn't know much about him at all, and that was enough for Luffy to be cautious. Commander, Sabo said, nodding in greeting. Aizo waved the word off. Call me Aizo. Seeing as we're going to be shipmates for a while there's no use keeping up formalities. Aizo said, smiling once more. There was a bit of hesitance, but Sabo nodded nonetheless. Anyways, I just thought I'd come by and give you guys a better tour. We didn't think you would be staying with us that long, so Marco only showed you the important places. Aizo said with a shrug. Do we have to? Ace tapped out, and Sabo could practically hear the whine. It would be helpful, Ace. Besides, we were already going to look around. This way we'll actually know where we are. Sabo tapped back, Ace holding back a pout. Even though the eldest knew they were going to be there a long time, and he knew they would be seeing a lot of the pirates, that didn't mean he was volunteering to go spend time with them willingly. Lady not lady's nice. Luffy tapped simply, having been checking Aizo's feelings as his brothers discussed what to do. Aizo, Luffy, their name's Aizo. Sabo corrected, not wanting Luffy to mention that nickname to the pirate in case they took offense to it. Thank you Aizo, that would be much appreciated, Sabo said with an easy smile. Aizo nodded, moving to be in front of the brothers as he gestured to the area they were already in. Well, in that case, for starters, this is the way to the stern of the ship, Aizo started, gesturing to the set of stairs in front of them, all of them beginning to make their way up them. As they moved along from one side of the deck to the next, Aizo explained to them what each part of the ship was, and what it did or what you could find there. This went on for a bit, the group even venturing a bit inside at one point. And over there is the helm, and over here is where everyone likes to do most of their fishing. Sabo took in everything Aizo said, because he had no clue how long he and his brothers would be there, so any information was important information. We almost done. I wanna take a nap. Ace said, and Sabo could see that the fiery teen's eyes were beginning to droop slightly. Even though he had gotten a good night's sleep on Shanks' ship, the eldest was still tired after having more than a few sleepless nights on the Moby. The stress hadn't helped either, along with his insomnia and narcolepsy, and Sabo was hoping that Ace wouldn't have an attack right now, when they were surrounded by pirates on all sides. Well, we've seen the entire deck now, and a bit of the inside. I could ask Aizo for a break for now, but we have to finish this later. Sabo said as he thought it all out. Ace suppressed a yawn, and Sabo knew they were going to have to cut this short. I'm sorry Aizo, but seeing as the ship is so big, do you think we could continue this tour later? Shanks' party ran a little late last night, and we were all a bit tired still. Sabo said apologetically, forcing a yawn, finding that it wasn't that hard to do so. Even he was feeling a bit tired, and by Luffy's slightly sluggish movements and lack of response during the conversation, he was tired as well. Seeing this, Aizo nodded, smiling to the three. Of course, you three go take a nap, Aizo said with a wave. Sabo responded with a wave of his own as he and his brothers turned toward their room. Thank you Aizo, see you later, Sabo said, not waiting for a response as they walked away. The walk back was made in silence, the brothers ignoring any lingering stares from pirates who hadn't seen them since they got back from Garp's ship. They had only just closed the door to their room when Ace slumped to the ground, only slightly alarming Sabo and Luffy before they got over it, Sabo picking the hot hat up and carrying him to the bed. Well, at least he had good timing, Sabo said as he finally laid Ace down, Luffy yawning loudly behind him. You should nap too Luffy, I'll stay up for a bit, wait for the hot hat to get up, Sabo said with a shrug, as if it wasn't a big deal, and, really, it wasn't. Luffy looked at the blonde for a second before nodding, crawling into the bed beside Ace and curling up, enjoying the fact that Ace was practically a radiator. And that was how it was for the next few hours. Sabo sat at the desk, making patterns in the wood with his finger as he listened to the pirates, listening for anyone talking about them. People were more likely to speak their minds about someone when they didn't think that person was listening. A large number of pirates were mentioning the brothers, but nothing interesting or noteworthy, mostly just confusion, wondering what had happened in the facility, or talking about the fact that they were related to Garp or knew Shanks. I barely even saw him today, but I heard Aizo was giving him a tour. Really? I thought they would have been in their room. A mystery those three, I don't think we'll understand them even if we spend a whole year with them. Poor kids are already being hunted down by Marines. It never ceases to amaze me how low Marines will stoop to keep something quiet. Sabo recognized that last voice as being one of the commanders, though Sabo couldn't quite place which one of them it was. Fossa maybe. Or was it Atmos? Sabo hadn't been listening to any one conversation. Instead, he was changing from one to another, until he happened to hear the commander talking. Before he could listen in more, he noticed Ace's breathing begin to pick up, an indicator that he was waking up, from a nightmare no less. Getting up from the desk and stretching, Sabo made his way to the bed, already shaking Ace, careful not to wake Luffy as well. It only took a minute to get Ace out of his own nightmare, the eldest bolting upright and looking around frantically. "It's fine, Ace, we're in our room," Sabo said soothingly, watching the panic leave the eldest's eyes as he remembered where he was, recognizing his surroundings. He noticed Luffy sleeping beside him as Sabo began heading back to the desk chair. "You had another attack, so I had Luffy take a nap too. He seemed tired, and I guess you were too. It's been about 3 hours." Sabo said, taking note that dinner would be started soon. "I think I woke up after my attack, but I ended up going back to sleep." Ace mumbled as if he didn't quite know himself. Sabo raised an eyebrow at him. "Huh, I didn't notice then," the blonde said, thinking back to the past few hours, not remembering the sound of Ace waking up. "Really? What's got you so distracted?" Ace asked, looking around the room as he spoke in a hushed tone. Sabo smiled, shaking his head. "Nothing much, I was just listening to the pirates talk about us out there," Sabo said with a shrug. Ace frowned now. "We're a hot topic then, huh?" Ace asked, remembering back when Sabo would listen in on the doctors when they talked about the brothers. "More like they have nothing more interesting to talk about. The only other thing they talk about is recent pirate attacks or where they're heading next. Apparently, it had been pretty quiet here until they found us," Sabo said with a sigh. The two fell silent after that, and it stayed that way for a few more minutes, until Sabo noticed Luffy was starting to have another nightmare. "Wake him up," Sabo said, nodding his head to Luffy. Ace frowned but nodded, knowing that meant the youngest was having a nightmare. All three of the brothers were plagued with nightmares nearly daily, every other day if they were lucky, but Luffy tended to have the worst nightmares of the three, enough to make him more resigned for even hours after having them. Ace was already shaking the youngest, whispering soothing things to calm him down, and within a few minutes the Raven was waking up in much the same way Ace had, bolting upright with panicked eyes that darted all around the room. It seemed he had had one of his worst nightmares if the sweat on his face and the wild look in his eyes were any indications. Sabo frowned as he once again stood from the chair and went to the bed, moving closer to help comfort the youngest with Ace. "Hey, everything's okay, Luffy, we're all okay," Sabo said soothingly, Ace nodding from where he sat. "Yeah, we're fine, it was just another nightmare," Ace said in an equally calming voice, rubbing Luffy's back. Luffy rubbed his eyes, almost a little too hard, and shook his head, crawling out of the bed. "Wanna go outside?" Luffy mumbled, not even waiting for his brothers, which shocked them slightly. Even though the youngest had a nightmare, he was about to willingly go outside where there were tons of pirates, and he wasn't even waiting for Ace or Sabo. Whether the boy thought that the two would follow him anyways or he just didn't care, they didn't know, but either way Ace and Sabo scrambled out of the bed, rushing up to Luffy. "Wait, Luffy, hold on," Sabo said, taking the littlest's hand in his, slowing his brother's fast pace before he could reach the door. "Yalu, you do know there are about a few hundred people out there, right? Are you sure you want to go out there right now?" Ace asked with a worried expression as he looked over Luffy, wondering if his brother was beginning to go crazy. Luffy merely frowned at his brothers, moving his free hand forward and grabbing the doorknob, before they could protest anymore. Even though Sabo had a hold on Luffy's other hand, that didn't stop the rubber man from leaving the room, forcing Sabo to let go of his brother to keep from anyone seeing Luffy's arm stretching as he walked away. "Luffy?" Ace and Sabo hissed quietly as they ran after the youngest, barely remembering to close their door behind them. The straw-hatted boy didn't respond, continuing to walk briskly down the hallway and out onto the deck, ignoring any looks from the pirates, as he moved to the railing and climbed onto it swiftly, taking off his hat and staring at the sea with a solemn expression. Ace and Sabo, who had followed the youngest, glanced at each other with worry, not having seen Luffy act like this before from a nightmare. Not wanting to cause a scene though, they resumed their normal positions, Ace sitting on the ground and keeping an eye out while Sabo joined their brother on the railing, also looking at the sea. It was around 5 in the evening now, the sky beginning to turn orange as it slowly got darker. The trio sat in silence, Ace and Sabo still thoroughly confused as to what was happening with Luffy, and not knowing quite how to address it. The pirates seemed to notice the tenseness in the youngest, and the worry in Ace and Sabo, many of them shooting them curious glances because of this, but all they could do was ignore it. "Luffy?" Sabo tried, deciding now was not a time to talk, especially with everyone around them listening in. Luffy gave no indication that he was going to respond, and Sabo was ready to leave it at that, but almost reluctantly Luffy responded, his taps slow and soft, almost too quiet for Ace to hear them. "Sorry." The two eldest frowned at this, Sabo bumping shoulders lightly with Luffy, in an attempt to cheer the youngest up. "There's nothing to be sorry for, Lu, it's okay, you didn't do anything wrong," Sabo said, Ace nodding in agreement. Luffy frowned, shaking his head. I worried Ace and Sabo, and I made you guys come out here even though I knew you two were nervous and scared, and you didn't want to come out here, but I couldn't stay in there cause I couldn't breathe, and it was small and stuffy, and I wanted to see the ocean. And Sabo had to forcibly stop Luffy's ramblings, covering the teen's hand with his own. Luffy hesitated, realizing he had been tapping louder than he had meant, some pirates turning at the noise, but shrugging it off once they realized what it was. Sorry, Luffy tapped out again, much softer as he hung his head, still frowning. Lulu, it's fine, Ace and I understand. You had a nightmare and it messed you up a bit more than Ace, and I thought it would. It's okay, it happens. Sabo tapped reassuringly. It went silent again as Sabo and Ace began sending warm pulses to Luffy, trying to show that they forgave him. He knew that Luffy could feel the sincerity coming from him, but sometimes the youngest would ignore those things when he was convinced of something otherwise. Are you feeling better? Sabo eventually asked after a few minutes. Slowly Luffy nodded, grabbing his hat off his head and twirling it in his fingers, a small smile blossoming on his face. Yeah, Ace and Sabo are the best. Luffy responded, laughing quietly. Sabo laughed a bit as well, ruffling Luffy's hair fondly. And don't you forget it. Ace spoke up, turning to look at Luffy as well. Luffy's smile widened as he looked back at Ace. Luffy hummed happily, any bad feelings from his nightmare gone now. Marco watched the brothers carefully from where he stood against one of the Moby's many masts. He, as well as many other brothers of his, had noticed the tenseness that was surrounding the brothers when they had re-emerged from their room after their nap. Worried that something had happened, Marco had decided to keep an eye on the three, debating whether he should go over and say anything or not. The brothers had been a mystery to everyone on the Moby ever since they had gotten there. Even to Marco. Even from the beginning, they were doing things that only raised more questions in the first mate's mind, rather than answering anything. He remembered when the brothers had first gotten their own room, a room he knew for a fact had 2 separate beds, but after only a few hours the three had managed to somehow move the beds together, despite the fact that they were bolted to the ground. Not only that, but there had been the time Sabo had abruptly shut the door in his face when he was getting them for a meal. At the time Marco kept a closer eye on them, thinking something was wrong, but they gave no indication that anything was out of the ordinary, so Marco decided not to question it. There was also the time the youngest, Luffy, had practically fainted during one of the meals after acting strangely and staring at Oyaji. No one had gotten any answers other than the boy was tired, but that didn't explain why the boy had been so interested in Oyaji or what he had been looking for before he had fainted. Even Whiskey couldn't find anything wrong, so once again, they were left with no other option but to move on and wonder about it privately, because they weren't going to get any answers from the brothers. Not only were the brothers mysterious in every sense of the word, but they also seemed to be resourceful when necessary. Before the pirates knew that they needed larger quantities of food, the brothers had done a good job at hiding that fact, not complaining in the slightest or giving any indication that they were still hungry. There was also the time that they had managed to cut their hair without anyone noticing, showing that, if they needed something, they wouldn't bother asking anyone for help finding it, they would just manage to do it themselves. Marco and Whitebeard had had many conversations in private about how puzzling the brothers were, but neither of them got any closer to figuring them out. Marco was pulled from his thoughts when he noticed Luffy was tapping his fingers against the railing loudly. He couldn't see the boy's face, but he could see the worried look that Sabo gave him, and after a few seconds of the loud rapping Sabo stopped it, covering the youngest's hand with his own. Luffy froze up as if he hadn't realized he was tapping in the first place before he hung his head, but Marco didn't miss the minute movement of his fingers, as he once again tapped against the railing, much quieter than he had before. The first commander narrowed his eyes at that, remembering how many times he'd seen the brothers tapping like that. Whether it was against their legs, on the table, or on a railing, the brothers seemed to have a habit of tapping. Marco wondered if it was a nervous habit or something they did unconsciously. The tension around the brothers increased for a second as Luffy hung his head, but within a few minutes that tension dissipated and Luffy was grabbing the hat off his head, smiling along with his brothers. Sabo ruffling the youngest's hair fondly while Ace seemed to say something that Luffy easily agreed to. Marco sighed, shaking his head as he smiled slightly, moving away from the mast to go join Whitebeard. Well, at least things on the Moby were going to be interesting for a while with those brothers around. After Luffy had cheered up, he no longer wanted to sit at the railing, wanting to explore the ship a bit. Ace and Sabo saw no harm in it. They were already surrounded by pirates. What difference would it make if they were on the other side of the deck instead of by the railing? They were trying to get used to being around large amounts of people, but it wasn't easy. Even though they were able to be near them, the feelings of discomfort and the anxiety they got didn't make it seem worth it. Luffy obviously felt the same, but was still forcing himself to at least try and explore the ship. The three eventually moved away from the railing, slowly making their way through the many mingling pirates as they moved across the deck, using all of their senses to make sure no one got too close or tried hurting them. The three explored the areas they had seen on their tour with Izo, Luffy familiarizing himself with the smells associated with each spot before they would move on. They did this for a bit before they heard the bell that signaled it was dinner time. Everyone began filing towards the galley, but the brothers hung back at the stern of the ship, waiting for everyone to already be inside before they made their way there as well. Man, this crew is huge. Ace muttered as they watched the many crewmates playfully shoving and laughing together as they filed into the galley. It is the strongest man's crew, so really it's not all that surprising, Sabo said with a shrug as he watched all the pirates carefully. Lazy face is coming. Luffy tapped, having smelled the man ascending the opposite set of stairs, already spotting the odd haircut peeking around the corner as the man hunched slightly forward before straightening back up, making his way to the brothers. Told Thatch not to leave those stupid poles on the stairs, the man muttered to himself, though the brothers were able to pick it up. Apparently, the man had tripped making his way up the stairs, explaining the hunch he had before. Hello there, First Commander. Sabo greeted with a smile, suppressing a laugh at the man's misfortune. Marco glanced over at the brothers, scanning over them quickly before nodding back in greeting. Yes, Marco is fine. What are you three doing here? Dinner's ready, Marco said with a raised eyebrow. Sabo smiled a bit to the man, shrugging. We thought we'd wait for it to get less crowded before we went, Sabo said, gesturing to the many pirates still trying to get into the room. Marco nodded, making a noise of understanding. What are you doing? Ace asked bluntly, slightly shocking the man with the fact that he had spoken. He recovered quickly though, responding with a slight hint of frustration. Well, it seems Thatch forgot something up here that he wanted me to get him, He also forgot to pick up his fishing poles too, Marco said, sending a glare to the objects that were out of sight. What did he forget? Luffy asked a bit timidly. Marco was once again surprised, because as rare as it was to hear Ace talk, it was even rarer to hear Luffy talk. Once again though he got over it. His lighter. Apparently, it fell out of his pocket when he was messing around with Haruta, and he's stuck in the kitchen, so I told him I'd get it for him, Marco explained, glancing around for the item, though having no clue where to start looking. Even though he knew it was in the area, it was still a large section to search for such a tiny item, and he had a feeling it would take longer than he would like to find it. Luffy, however, remembered what the lighter looked like, remembering how, when they were escaping, Thatch had used it to light up the dark hallways for them. Luffy took only a second to try remembering the smell before he discreetly sniffed the air, finding the familiar scent in the air. Oh, I know where it is, Luffy said with a smile, Marco turning to look at him with a raised eyebrow. Really? That would make things much easier, Marco said. Ace and Sabo turned to look at Luffy, slightly confused. The brothers hadn't moved much up here, and if Luffy had found the object he most likely would have pointed it out to the brothers, so how did Luffy know where it was? Despite this, Luffy began walking away, everyone following as he moved towards the smaller set of stairs that led even higher up the stern. Beside the stairs was a bundle of rope coiled together, but Luffy stuck his hand into the middle, pulling out the lighter with ease, turning to hand it to the commander with a smile. Thank you, Luffy, How did you know it was there? Marco asked, curious as he took the object from Luffy. The youngest looked a bit nervous for a second before Sabo interrupted. Is that what you were talking about when you said you thought you saw something shiny in the rope? Sabo asked, easily supplying the lie for Luffy, knowing his brother couldn't lie to save his life. Grateful, Luffy grinned, nodding. I remembered it. Luffy agreed. Well, thank you again. I think I would have been here searching forever if you hadn't seen it, Marco said gratefully. No problem, boss. Oh look, it seems things have finally settled down. Come on Luffy, let's go eat. Sabo interrupted, hearing Luffy beginning to say his signature nickname for the first commander. Even though the man hadn't seemed to mind too much the first time he heard Luffy say it, he didn't want to push it by letting Luffy say it more and more. He was really going to have to start teaching the youngest everyone's names. Yeah, come on Lu, Sabo, and I'll eat everything if you don't hurry, Ace added, starting to walk away for dramatic effect. Luffy's eyes widened as he glanced from Marco to his now retreating brothers. Gotta go. Ace, Sabo, don't eat without me. Marco laughed as he watched the youngest run off after his brothers, feeling as if he had just witnessed something special. The brothers had almost seemed relaxed around him, even though Marco could still tell they were on edge when speaking with him. The first mate looked at the lighter in his hand, twirling it around. He did find it odd how the straw-hatted boy had found the object so easily, almost as if he had put it there himself. And the oddly nervous look the boy had when Marco questioned him confused him even more. Why would he be nervous answering such an easy question? Sabo had seemed to save the boy from answering though, and that only confused Marco more. The brothers were definitely a strange trio. Did you see Thatch's fishing poles on the stairs? Marco's sure gonna talk his ear off for that one, Curiel said with a laugh. The brothers were in the galley, eating their food quietly, listening in on the conversation as they resumed their normal positions, Ace and Luffy on guard, while Sabo did any talking necessary. Yeah, he's been telling him for weeks to move those things. When do you think he'll finally do it? Jiro asked. Haruta laughed quietly, confusing the commanders. Hopefully not for another week if I can help it, Haruta said casually, taking another bite of his food. What are you talking about? Atmos asked, completely lost. Haruta shrugged. I've given myself a little game. Since things started getting boring now that we're back in paradise, I had to find new ways to get entertainment. Haruta said. And how does that involve Thatch not putting away his fishing poles? Bakuyo asked. It's simple, every time Thatch looks like he's gonna put him away I distract him. My goal had been a week in the beginning, but now we're so close to a month of them being there that I can't quit now. Haruta explained with determination. The commanders burst out into laughter, Haruta smiling proudly. Well, in that case, good luck, let's just hope Marco doesn't find out you're the reason that those things are still there. You'll probably end up with watch duty and clean up for double the amount of time that they've been there, Jozu said, patting Haruta on the back. It's the risk that makes it even more fun, Haruta said before continuing with his meal, the commanders laughing once more before the doors opened, Whitebeard entering and sitting in his usual spot. Hey there Pops, have you heard about Haruda's new game? Flamingo asked, beginning to slip up at Haruda's name before remembering the brothers sitting quietly at the table. Whitebeard raised an eyebrow, about to question Flamingo about said game, but Haruta began shushing them. SHH, here comes Marco, Haruta said in a rushed whisper, trying to look casual as he began eating his food, though it was too forced, and only made him look a bit suspicious. Once again the commanders began laughing, but Marco didn't question it, only sitting down in his usual spot and beginning his meal as well. Hey, Marco, where have you been? King Du asked, completely unfazed by the previous conversation. Marco pulled out Thatch's lighter, showing the table. I went to look for Thatch's lighter for him, even though the damn idiot left his fishing poles out again. It was obvious to the brothers, Marco and Whitebeard, that some of the commanders were trying to hold back laughter, Haruta sending them all glares, but Aizo was composed enough to speak. So, you found it. That was fast, I'm surprised no one else found it first then. Aizo said, thinking that if anyone saw the lighter on the ground they would notice and take it to the chef, or even Whitebeard. Marco shook his head. I didn't find it, Yoi, Luffy did, Marco said, moving his head to gesture to Luffy who was eating quietly. The commanders looked to the boy with curious expressions. Really? Good job kid. Vista said, smiling to Luffy who shifted a bit, obviously nervous with all the attention directed his way. Where was it anyways? Namor asked, the attention leaving Luffy at the question, and turning back to Marco. In the rope, we had up there, Yoi, Marco responded, confusing the commanders. How'd you they're gone well, Marco, how'd you know it was there? Flamingo asked, noticing the brothers had once again run away leaving empty plates behind. Marco merely responded with a shrug. Beats me, the kid found it the second I mentioned it though. When I asked him about it he got nervous, and Sabo interrupted, Yoi. Apparently, he has seen it when they were up there earlier. Marco said, causing a few of them to frown. A tiny lighter in a bundle of ropes. Kid must have some damn good eyesight then if that's the case. Curiel said, some nodding in agreement. Oh, hey you three, you done with dinner already? The brothers were stopped on their way to their room by Thatch, who had just walked out as well. The brothers hesitated, not having expected anyone to stop them. Normally they could get to their room without issue after meal times. Yeah, we actually just finished, what are you doing? Sabo asked, curious seeing as Thatch had been in the kitchen the entire time, not even coming out to say hi like normal, probably busy. Thatch sighed, looking off towards the stern. Well, I've been getting a bit distracted lately every time I go to pick those fishing poles up, and if I forget anymore Marco's gonna have my hide, so I'm gonna go pick him up before I eat. Thatch said, causing the brothers to remember the game Haruta had been playing. Luffy looked like he wanted to say something, probably spilled the beans about Haruta, but Ace placed a hand on his brother's mouth, stopping him. Oh, well Haruta was looking for you, he said it was important. Ace said with a mischievous glint in his eye, Sabo smiling a bit at that and nodding. Really? I shouldn't keep him waiting then, but this should only take a second. Thatch said, seemingly debating what he should do first. He mentioned something about your lighter too, Sabo said, putting on a look as if he was thinking back to this imaginary conversation. My lighter? Maybe he found it. Thatch asked, more to himself as he turned to the galley doors, already walking towards them. Thanks, guys, I'll see you later. Thatch said, entering the galley, fishing poles forgotten. Sabo and Ace snickered, Luffy watching with confusion, having felt his brother's feelings of deceptiveness and mischief, confused as to why they were lying to the nice chef. He followed them back to their room regardless, though he didn't try to hide his confused expression. Would you lie to Mr. Chef? He's nice. Luffy said with a bit of a pout. Still smiling, Sabo ruffled Luffy's hair. Ace and I were just playing a bit of a joke on him. Remember how Rita mentioned he was playing a game with Mr. Chef? Sabo asked, Luffy nodding with a perplexed expression on his face. We were just helping him win. Ace said with a shrug, also smiling. Understanding flashed across Luffy's face at this. Oh I get it. Luffy said cheerily, his brothers shaking their heads at Luffy's simple thoughts. So how did you know that the chef's lighter was in the ropes? Ace asked, still curious about it. Luffy beamed, clearly pleased with himself. I remembered it from when he helped us escape, so I smelled for it and found it in the ropes. It smelled like Mr. Chef, which made me hungry, but it also smells like fire too," Luffy said, tacking on the last bit as more of an afterthought. Understanding showed on Ace and Sabo's faces now, wondering how they hadn't thought about that first. "Well, be careful when you do that. You helped, which is good, but you can't lie, so when someone questions you about it, you could end up giving yourself away," Sabo said, not in a chastising tone, but more of a tone of worry, not wanting his brother's abilities to be found out. Luffy seemed to understand the weight of Sabo's words, nodding. "We should probably teach you how to lie better, or else Sabo's gonna have to save you every time," Ace said, folding his hands behind his head and laying down on the bed. "But lying's bad," Luffy said, remembering all the doctors who would lie to them, tell them that the shots wouldn't hurt, that they wouldn't feel a thing, that the medicine was helping them. The youngest shivered, his brothers noticing. "Yes, lying can be bad, but sometimes, like when we had to lie about how you found the lighter, it's helpful," Sabo explained, Luffy slowly nodding in understanding. Sabo sighed. "Well, if we're doing this, the first step, lying doesn't always have to be false information. Maybe if you add a bit of truth in your words, it'll be easier." Chapter 34. The New Normal. Sabo, per usual, was the first of the three to wake up the next day. Normally when it came to the Moby Dick, one of the many pirates would walk by and wake the blonde up, but this time it wasn't a pirate, it was Luffy. His heavy breathing and rapidly beating heart tuned him into the fact that Luffy was once again having a nightmare. It seemed the youngest's nightmares were getting worse and worse with each passing day. Sighing, Sabo sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes and shaking the youngest, trying to rouse him from his slumber. Luffy was in between Ace and Sabo, so when the blonde began shaking Luffy, he pushed him into Ace, slowly waking the fire teen as well. "What's going on?" Ace mumbled, his eyebrows scrunching together as he sat up groggily, looking around. "Blue's having a nightmare," Sabo responded, yawning. It was earlier than they would normally get up, still dark out, which indicated it was either late at night or early in the morning. Sabo focused his attention back on his brother, shaking him again and speaking softly to him, while Ace tried to wake up enough to help. It took a few minutes this time, to the point where Sabo was beginning to think Luffy might be stuck in his nightmare, but with a start, Luffy woke up. He didn't bolt up like before, but his eyes shot open in panic, and he began breathing heavier, flickering his eyes around in confusion. "Everything's okay, Lou, just as a nightmare," Ace said, very obviously still tired if the slight slur was anything to go on. Luffy sat up, trying to calm his breathing back down, as Ace and Sabo sent him warm feelings, hoping to calm him down. "Do you want to go outside?" Sabo asked softly, knowing that it helped him last time, but this time Luffy shook his head, laying back down and burying his face in his pillow. Ace and Sabo looked at each other before slowly laying back down as well. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ace asked quietly. None of them had shared what they dreamt about, because they already knew what the nightmares were about, but Ace wanted to help the youngest in any way he could. Luffy shook his head though, curling into a tight ball and pulling the blankets up closer to him, and forcing himself to try to go back to bed. The nightmare had been a pretty bad one, worse than the night before, but Luffy was still tired, and he didn't want to bother Ace and Sabo by forcing them to go outside again, especially not this early or late, Luffy wasn't sure, in the day. Instead, the boy decided that he would just try and calm down and fall asleep, hoping that the feeling of Ace and Sabo at his side would help him. He could tell that they were worried, he could feel it after all, and he tried ignoring those feelings, instead focusing on the warmth they were sending him, the love, the happiness. He basked in the feelings and allowed them to slowly calm him down. He could tell when they fell asleep not too long after, because their feelings became dulled slightly, almost non-existent, except for a small hint of a stronger emotion, depending on the type of dream they were having. Luffy turned so he was on his back and looked at the air in front of him, allowing himself to see Ace and Sabo's waves that were still visible, even in the dark of the room. He hadn't needed to look at his brother's waves in a while, but seeing them now was comforting. The fact that he couldn't see through them at all now also comforted him, showing that both of his brothers were in good health, completely healed up after everything that had happened. The youngest smiled slightly as he reached his hand up to swipe at the waves, though his hand merely passed right through them, the air not feeling any different, not that he expected it to. After staring at the waves a bit longer, Luffy turned onto his side once more, closing his eyes with a smile on his face, his nightmare forgotten. Ace and Sabo would keep him safe, even from his own nightmares. The next time the brothers were waking up, it was because it was breakfast time. Due to the wake-up call in the middle of the night, they weren't feeling all that refreshed, but it was nothing new to them, so they got up and made their way to the galley. Ace's glares were just a hint harsher than normal, his mood a bit sour from the lack of sleep, and Luffy was even more timid than usual, clinging to Ace and Sabo, as if it was his first time seeing the pirates. Sabo wasn't faring much better either, his normally easy-to-force smiles now much harder to conjure up, as he greeted overly chatty pirates trying to stop them for a conversation. Apparently, now that the brothers were going to be here longer than anyone expected, that meant everyone wanted to try being their friends. Every time they turned a corner there would be a different person trying to start up a conversation with them, but Sabo would just smile and politely inform them that they were heading to the galley, and that they would talk later. I wish everyone would leave us alone. Ace tapped, clearly irritated by everyone prying into the brothers' lives. Sabo sighed but felt himself feeling the same way. They're just trying to be friendly, Ace, though they could be a little less. Sabo trailed off, trying to find the right word. Annoying. Ace replied as he glared rather harshly towards someone who was seemingly making their way towards them. I was going to say eager. Sabo said with an eye roll. Ace huffed at that but didn't say anything more. Luffy had been listening to their tapping silently, gripping tightly onto their hands and staring at the ground. Even though he had felt happy when he went to sleep, he had woken up and immediately remembered his nightmare from last night, which made him remember the facility, which made him remember all the horrible feelings he had felt when he was there. Even though he knew these pirates weren't going to hurt them, at least not unless they were provoked, he still had an inkling of a feeling that, at any moment, someone would grab them and strap them to chairs. He shivered at the thought, staring even harder at the ground as they walked. His brothers seemed to notice his shiver because he could feel the worry coming off of them, quickly replaced with warmth and love, the two feelings mingling together to put Luffy at ease. When they finally reached the galley it was like a safe haven, because everyone in here was too preoccupied with their food to bother talking to them. Well, everyone except for the commanders. Sitting in their usual spot, Sabo noticed that everyone was there now, even the captain. As they ate breakfast their moods slowly started evening out. Ace's glare softened back to how it normally was, Luffy wasn't clinging as tightly as before, and Sabo didn't feel so overwhelmed. Luckily the commanders or captain hadn't pulled any of them into a conversation, either because they noticed the brothers' moods or just because of chance, but as they were finishing up and getting leave that changed. They had just stood up from the table, ready to slip away without anyone noticing, but Haruta had other plans. Seeing the brothers walking away the commander quickly shoveled some food in his mouth, uttering a quick, "Be right back," before chasing after the trio who were now leaving the galley, the doors swinging closed behind them. Hey, wait. Haruta's shout had the brothers pausing as they saw the commander run out of the galley, smiling brightly to them. The brothers immediately tensed, wondering what was happening, but waiting for the commander to speak before they did anything. Can we just ignore him? Sabo shook his head a bit at Ace's taps, feeling Luffy grab onto his hand, noticing he had grabbed Ace's as well. No Ace, that would just be rude, we're not trying to make them hate us. Sabo responded, squeezing Luffy's hand a bit in an attempt at comforting the boy. The youngest had just gotten over his nightmare from last night, and this was not helping. Doesn't feel bad, feels happy. Luffy tapped to his brothers, noticing no ill feelings coming from Haruta as he made his way over to the three, only joy. Sabo took this as a good sign. Commander, what do you need? The blonde asked with a polite tone, though his body expression gave way to the tenseness he felt. Haruta continued smiling. Well, I wanted to thank you guys. Haruta said cheerily, confusing the trio. For what? Sabo asked, having no idea what Haruta would be thanking them for. The man's grin widened though as he explained. For yesterday. I totally would have lost my game if you hadn't distracted Thatch for me, so thanks. Haruta said, and Luffy decided he liked the man, having felt only pure, happy feelings from him. Understanding now what Haruta was talking about, Ace and Sabo both relaxed, smiling a bit as well as they remembered. It was no big deal, we just overheard you telling the other commanders about it, and thought you would like to keep the game going, Sabo said, shrugging it off. Haruta laughed now, nodding. Yeah, it would be no fun if it stopped now. Anyways, thanks again, maybe I'll see you guys later. Oh, and you can call me wait, no, Ruta, you can call me Ruta, commander's too formal. Haruta said, already waving and walking away as he spoke, leaving no time for a response. The trio watched him walk off before they began walking as well. The deck was nearly clear of any pirates, all of them still in the galley eating breakfast, but that didn't mean that no one was out there. Sabo knew for a fact that there were people in the crow's nests, he could hear them muttering to themselves or shuffling around, and there was a handful of people who had already finished their meal, lounging around on the deck. Can we sit on the rail? Luffy asked, already looking towards their usual spot. Sabo looked at Ace, and when he nodded Sabo changed their direction to the railing. Surely, Sabo answered, the three of them quickly reaching the railing and assuming their normal positions. They sat in silence, as usual, none of them finding any reason to speak. It was another beautiful day, and Sabo had to wonder when the weather would change, because from what he remembered reading, Grand Line weather was never predictable and could change in a second. Time passed quickly, and sitting, staring at the ocean, gave the brothers a good excuse not to talk to anyone, especially Ace seeing as he was pretending to be asleep. Unfortunately, this didn't mean others were deterred from wanting to talk to them, and by the time breakfast was over the brothers were, per the usual, the center of attention, everyone practically buzzing around them. Sabo could hear their quiet chatter, many of them wanting to approach, but no one doing so. It was a bit irritating, and it made all of them twitch nervously at the feeling of everyone's eyes on them, but that didn't stop them from trying to at least enjoy their time there. It was strange because Sabo could remember not all that long ago when the three of them could barely leave their room without being on the edge of a panic attack, but now they were able to sit out on deck with almost no issue. They were still nowhere near ready to go walking and talking with these pirates, but it was already a dramatic change to how they had been when they first got there. It definitely helped that Luffy had yet to feel the darkness or see even a hint of grey around anyone. Marco Sabo began turning around at Ace's tap, ready to greet the commander. Luffy continued facing the ocean, but he turned his head so he could watch Marco as well, taking note of his feelings, searching for anything bad. No bad feelings, Luffy informed, relaxing Sabo a bit. Hello there Marco, Sabo said with a smile, Luffy sending the man one of his own, while Ace continued to pretend he was asleep. Marco nodded back in greeting, going into his normal position for whenever he talked to the brothers by the railing. Did you want to talk about something? Sabo asked, swinging his legs slightly to give a carefree air around him, even if he wasn't feeling that carefree at the moment. Luffy was swinging his legs as well, but he had been doing that the entire time, even before Marco had gotten there. Yes, actually. Oyaji and I were just discussing living arrangements, seeing as you three are staying much longer than we had first anticipated, Yuri. Marco said, Sabo, nodding in understanding. Of course, this was going to have to come up sometime. The pirates hadn't been fully prepared to take in three teenagers who had serious issues, whether they knew about those issues or not. Of course. And? Sabo asked, wondering where this conversation was going to go. Right before Marco responded though, Sabo heard the faintest tap from Ace, drawing his attention to the fiery teen, though he kept his eyes locked on Marco. Sleep attack. And just like that, Ace's body slumped down ever so slightly, breathing evening out. Sabo's lips pursed slightly, but if there was ever a time for Ace to have an attack on deck, at least it was when everyone already thought he was sleeping. Ace fell asleep. Sabo tapped covertly to Luffy, the boy nodding minutely back as he focused more on making sure no one got too close to Ace now. Well, seeing as we thought you three would only be here a few days, we weren't equipped with clothing, shoes, or any other things you would need, so we'll need to stock up on the next island for you, Yuri. Marco started, Sabo nodding along as he kept his guard up, now extra tense seeing as Ace was down for the count. All he could do was hope that Ace wouldn't have a nightmare. Also, if you three would like separate rooms, we can arrange that, Marco said, and even though Sabo knew they were just trying to be accommodating, he still felt a pulse of anger at the words, but kept calm on the outside, shaking his head. No, it's fine, we'll continue sharing. Was there anything else? Sabo asked, wanting to move on. Marco nodded, continuing. Yes, seeing as you're not a part of the crew, we don't expect you to do anything like fighting or taking watch, but seeing as you'll be here indefinitely, we decided that you should at least do some sort of chores like washing dishes, Yuri, Marco explained, Sabo continuing to nod, keeping a close ear on Ace's breathing. Of course, we expected to have to do at least that much, Sabo replied, because they had. No pirate was going to take on three teens for free and let them laze around forever. It was at this point that Sabo heard Ace's breathing picking back up, and he nearly sighed in relief, noticing that the teen wasn't having a nightmare, rather he was waking up. Before Ace could panic about where he was or what was happening, Luffy began tapping to him, telling him that they were still talking to Lazy Face, and seriously, Sabo had to stop that nickname. Anything else? Sabo asked, wanting to go back to relaxing so he could catch Ace up. Marco sighed. Well, there's one more thing, Yuri. Marco started, a bit hesitant. Sabo raised an eyebrow at that, wondering what Marco was about to say. Clearly, it was something that the man knew they weren't going to like hearing, but what that was, he had no idea. Sensing the hesitance, Ace and Luffy tensed up, not knowing what to expect, but knowing it probably wasn't going to be good. What is it? Sabo asked in as evenly a voice as possible. Marco sighed before he responded. We know that you all have a strong disliking for Drs. Yuri. The brothers involuntarily shivered at that, but waited for Marco to continue. But seeing as you're going to be staying here, it would be their job to help you if any of you got hurt. Because of that, Whiskey just wants to get a bit of simple information, just enough to know if she should avoid certain procedures if she has to, Yuri. Marco explained, watching the brothers carefully for their reaction. The commander knew of the brothers' phobia of doctors, but this information was necessary, so that Whiskey would be able to better perform her job if needed. Marco also knew that the brothers weren't very giving when it came to information about themselves, so Marco knew that this was going to be a task. No? Hell no. Ace sat out, still a bit groggy from his attack, but coherent enough to know exactly what was happening. We can't exactly deny. Sabo replied, feeling a bit panicked at the corner they were in. Marco hadn't exactly been asking, more like telling the brothers that they had to do this, something none of them wanted to do at all. Don't want to talk to the doctors. Luffy said, fear in his eyes as he turned to face the ocean, hiding his expression from the onlooking commander. I know Lou, but there's nothing I can tell him without possibly making him mad. Sabo said, feeling fear himself. Then make him mad, we're not talking to no doctor. Ace responded, a scowl quickly making its way onto his face at the thought. We can't just make him mad, Ace. We're going to be staying here for a while, remember? We can't have them already hating us. Sabo tapped back urgently, trying to keep it discreet and quiet enough that Marco wouldn't think much of it, but loud enough that Ace could hear it without seeing it. He's worried. Luffy butted in, sensing the worry rolling off the commander as he watched the brothers, his face not changing from his neutral expression. Of course he's worried his plan will fail. Ace tapped back. And what plan would that be, Ace? Sabo asked, nearly frowning. The plan where he gets on our good side and then stabs us in the back. Ace replied, anger beginning to form in both the eldest brothers. Luffy started swinging his feet faster, worried that this was going to turn out worse than he would like. He didn't want to talk to any doctor, but he didn't want Ace and Sabo fighting either. He didn't know which one was worse. Luffy did his best to block the anger from entering him, but the only other feeling he could focus on was the worry coming from Marco, and that wasn't helping either. Maybe he should try and feel the giant captain's feelings and hope for the warmth, but he didn't know where he was, not having seen him leave the galley after breakfast and not seeing him in his chair. His feet began moving even faster than before as the nervous energy built up within him. If we speak to her, can we do it out here? On the deck? Sabo asked, trying to find a compromise that would put them at least a bit at ease. None of the brothers would want to go into the infirmary where they would just be bombarded with horrible memories and smells, but they also didn't want to talk to Whiskey in the first place. Sabo. The anger was rising within Ace, and it was becoming harder and harder for Luffy to ignore it. If that's what you would prefer, I'm sure she wouldn't mind, Marco said, a bit of his worry disappearing at what sounded like an agreement to talk to Whiskey. We're not talking. Ace's taps were sharp and deliberate, but Sabo ignored them anyway, putting Luffy more on edge as he swallowed, glancing between his brothers nervously, not even bothered if Marco was watching or not. Then we'll answer to the best of our ability, Sabo said, but it came out almost forced like he didn't want to be saying it at all, which he didn't. Ace had to hold back a shout of outrage at that moment, ready to wring Sabo's neck for agreeing so easily. Was that blonde idiot insane? He was going to willingly give their information over to a doctor. A rational part of the fiery teen's brain told him that it wouldn't be as bad as he was thinking it would be, that he should trust Sabo in what he was doing. But all he could think about was the facility, and how every single doctor there had hurt them every day, just so they could get information about them. What if Whiskey heard something and wanted to know more about it? Would she start doing tests on them? Would she have the Pyres hold them down while she injected them with who knew what? That's good to hear, Yuri. Do you want to do it right now? Marco asked, slightly surprised that Sabo had agreed at all. Sabo hesitated, knowing he was pushing the limit on Ace's anger. I think that would be best, Sabo said, Marco nodding, saying he would go get the nurse before walking away. Ace didn't even attempt to hide that he was awake anymore, opening his eyes and spinning a glare onto Sabo, who gave a sheepish smile back. Sabo, what the hell? Ace tapped out, clearly furious. As much as the hothead wanted to scream at the blonde, he held back, not wanting to draw any more unwanted attention to themselves. Ace, just listen. Listen, Sabo, you just agreed to talk to a doctor. Giving our information to a doctor. Ace tapped with such speed and intensity that Sabo and Luffy almost couldn't understand it. Yes, but what if they end up hearing something they want to know more about? Who's to say they won't strap us down and start testing on us here? Ace continued, not listening to anything Sabo was trying to say. Luffy knew it was going to happen, knew that all of Ace's anger would flow into him, but he had been trying so hard to stop it. Ace. This was a horrible idea. I should have never agreed to stay with these bastards. Ace wasn't stopping for a second in his rant, glare still plastered on his face as he looked at Sabo. Luffy was watching with worry, feeling the anger slowly taking hold. Calm down. Sabo finally got out, doing what he had done to Luffy by placing his hand on top of Ace's, stopping any more taps from the eldest. Ace's glare hardened at that, and it was obvious he wanted to continue talking, probably yell at Sabo for even suggesting he calm down. You're going to get Luffy mad, do you want him charging off again? When there's a doctor on her way here to talk to us right now? Sabo asked, sending Ace a stern look, gesturing to Luffy who was slowly going from nervous to angry, his features morphing into a glare as he stared at the sea. The sight made Ace's anger fizzle out, realizing what was happening. Even though they had promised they would listen to each other to stop from influencing Luffy, he had gone and done the exact opposite. Sorry, Lou. Ace finally tapped remorsefully, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder. The anger slowly dissipated from Luffy now, the nervousness returning at once, as the straw-hatted boy noticed what had nearly happened, and what was going to happen. Ace, I know you don't like it, Sabo started, Ace scoffing quietly. What gave you that clue? Ace asked, causing Sabo to roll his eyes, but continue nonetheless. But, we have to. We can't exactly avoid it forever, and remember, you were the one saying we don't want them turning on us. Sabo said, this time causing Ace to roll his eyes. Yeah, I also said we weren't going to tell them anything about our powers or the facility. Ace countered. And we won't, we're just going to tell them harmless information, and if they start asking something too personal, I won't answer. Don't worry, you don't even have to look at the doctor if you don't want to, Sabo said, knowing that even the sight would put them all on edge. Ace glared a bit at that though, crossing his arms. And let her stab you with a needle. No thanks. You do the talking, I'll do the watching, Ace said, causing Sabo to grin, realizing Ace was finally becoming at least accepting that this was going to happen. Luffy felt some of his nervousness disappear at the fact that his brothers were getting along again, but any relief he felt quickly disappeared as he smelled the familiar burning stench of a doctor walking out onto the deck. With the salty air and everyone else's smells, the doctor's scent wasn't as overwhelming as normal, but it was still enough for Luffy to feel a bit of a headache. Doctor's here. Luffy tapped hesitantly, keeping his eyes locked firmly in front of him, watching the horizon. He didn't want to see the doctor, didn't want to remember everything that had happened at the facility. Ace and Sabo placed their hands on his shoulders. Don't worry Lou, you don't have to say or do anything, Ace and I will take care of everything. Sabo tapped, noticing the nervous tension rising in the youngest. Luffy only responded with a nod, not saying anything else as they waited for Marco and the nurse to reach them. Hello there boys, I'm happy that you agreed to speak with me, Whiskey said with a smile, and Sabo knew she was trying to keep them calm, but everything she did had the opposite effect. The smile morphed in Ace and Sabo's minds to be a devilish grin, the happiness in her voice turning sickly sweet, hiding her ulterior motives, the carefree way she moved, holding her clipboard becoming much more menacing to them. There was a collective shiver from all three of the brothers, even Luffy who wasn't even looking. Just the smell and sound of the nurse was enough to unnerve him. Regardless, Sabo swallowed thickly, forcing a smile onto his face as he shifted a bit on the railing. He still didn't feel up to speaking yet, even though that was all he was going to be doing, so he just nodded to the nurse, hoping she would continue on. I just need a bit of simple information, nothing too complicating. If you can't answer something that's fine, just try your best, she said, still keeping the chipper attitude. Sabo nodded again, still trying to find his voice. Ace, who was still standing, had his eyes narrowed, watching every minute movement the nurse was making, just waiting for her to grab a needle. Would you like Marco to leave? Normally we do this in my office where no one can listen in, doctor-patient confidentiality and all, Whiskey said, and Ace tilted his head a bit at that, having never heard the term before. Well, he also had never seen a doctor before the facility, unless Magra counted as a doctor, which, in his mind, he didn't. The doctor can't give away anything we tell them, they have to keep it secret, Sabo informed Ace, having read about it before. Ace nearly scoffed, remembering the facility where their information was thrown around without a care. It's fine, he can stay, Sabo said, taking into account that Luffy had deemed Marco a nice person in both feelings and color. If after hearing this his color started turning gray, then the brothers would know that they should probably leave the ship. If just a bit of information on the brothers had the first mate turning gray, then what did that say about everyone else? Alright, then let's get started, we'll start off simple. Do you three have any allergies? Anything we should avoid? She asked, holding her clipboard up, ready to take notes. Sabo shook his head, finally finding his voice. No, nothing we know of, he said. Whiskey nodded, writing stuff down before looking back up. Before the facility did you three see a regular doctor? She asked, Sabo, answering with another no. Even though he had been born into nobility, he had only gone to a doctor a few times before he ran away. It wasn't exactly something he would call regular. Whiskey nodded, writing that down. Do any of you have a pre-existing medical condition that I should know about? She asked, causing Sabo to hesitate a bit at that. He had already pushed Ace into allowing this conversation, and if he gave away the fact that he had narcolepsy to the nurse, he was sure Ace would go ballistic. Not that he wanted to tell the doctor in the first place, he was just worried that the nurse would find out and get mad that he had lied. No, Sabo said simply, not trusting himself to say any more than that. Whiskey bought it as easily as the other answers, and Sabo practically sighed in relief, seeing Ace, who had tensed at the question, relax a bit as well, clearly having been worried about the same thing as him. Any medication that you three used before that you would need? Whiskey continued, to which Sabo was able to answer much easier, giving another no. The rest of the questions were much easier to answer, their height, an estimate on their weight, did anyone in their family have any medical issues that might show up in them later? Of course, she had assumed that they had the same parents, but either way, Sabo answered a no on that one. They didn't know much about Luffy's parents, and his own hadn't had any issues. Sabo decided it was best not to mention Ace's parents either. Well, that seems to be about it, thank you three for answering, Whiskey said, smiling once more to the brothers. Colors. Sabo grabbed Luffy's attention with a tap, and even though Luffy did not want to look at the doctor, he still forced himself to at least glance, focusing more on the colors surrounding the person, rather than the person itself. Blue, no gray. Ace and Sabo practically sighed in relief at the answer, both of them relaxing a bit. There was no problem, Mrs. Nurse, I'm glad we could help, Sabo said, able to force a smile easier knowing that the nurse would be leaving any second. Please, Whiskey is just fine, she said calmly, Sabo nodding, though he didn't plan on talking to her again anytime soon. With that, Whiskey was finally walking away, any tension the brothers had leaving as she disappeared into the depths of the Moby. Now that that's over, lunch should be ready soon. We can head in there now if you want, Yoi, Marco suggested, nodding towards the galley. Sabo glanced at Ace and Luffy, both of them nodding in response. That would be nice, thank you, Marco, Sabo said, standing and smoothing out his clothes as Luffy got off the railing as well, Ace stretching a bit. Marco nodded and began walking to the galley, and Sabo had to take a second to realize that they felt more relaxed around Marco than anyone else here. Maybe it was because the man didn't show any outward interest in the brothers. Everyone else was always staring at them, always talking about them when they thought they couldn't hear, but Marco never did any of that unless he was discussing accommodations for the brothers. He didn't ogle the brothers like they were sideshow attractions, and he didn't force them into anything they didn't want to do, besides the whole answer nurses questions thing. Sabo shrugged this off and began following the commander, his brothers close at his side as he did. No matter how relaxed he felt around the man, he still wasn't all that trusting of him. The possibility that he was just trying to get on their good side was still there, and not to mention, it only took one wrong thought to change a clear blue ore to gray. The brothers and Marco made their way to the galley, only a few people in there, and Marco went to the kitchen, telling the brothers he would be right back. Aizo was the only one sitting at the commander's table, so the brothers didn't feel all that nervous when they went to sit down. Aizo greeted the three with a smile, when that Sabo returned, before their return to silence, Aizo working on something in his lap. The four sat in silence, but seeing as there was no one to be worried about, Ace and Luffy were much more relaxed than normal, not needing to keep their guard up as much. Because of this, Luffy was becoming more and more interested in what Aizo was working on, smelling something that he recognized to belong to the commander with the cool mustache. "Nah, what's lady not lady doing?" Luffy asked, trying not to stare so he didn't draw the man's attention, but still extremely curious. Ace and Sabo looked at Luffy for a second before turning their attention to Aizo, though they were unable to see whatever it was seeing as the man was sitting on the other side of the table. "I don't know, Lu, I can't see," Sabo said, causing Luffy to pout as he waited for lunch to be ready. Within a few more minutes, Marco was walking back out of the kitchen, Thatch close behind, the both of them holding food for the brothers which they set down in front of them. "Thank you, commanders." Sabo thanked politely, Ace and Luffy already digging in. "No problem. So, what have you three been up to? Anything interesting?" Thatch asked, sitting across from them at the table, beside Aizo. "Nothing all that interesting," Sabo said simply, beginning to eat as well. Thatch sighed, nodding. "Yeah, it's been a bit of a bore here in paradise. Maybe things will pick up soon," Thatch said wistfully, resting his head in his hand. Marco and Aizo both rolled their eyes. "You should be grateful for this moment of relaxation, Thatch. It means you've got no paperwork for the moment," Aizo mumbled, still clearly concentrated more on the thing in his lap, rather than the conversation. Thatch groaned. "Yeah, but now there's just nothing to do," Thatch whined. "There's lunch that you should be helping make," Marco said offhandedly as he sat at the table as well, having been standing before. Thatch shook his head but stood from the table now. "A bunch of party poopers is what you two are," Thatch whined sadly as he began trudging away. "Well, goodbye you three, maybe the next time I see you things will have picked up again," Thatch called, already disappearing back into the kitchen. "Don't mind him, he can be overdramatic to put it lightly," Aizo said to the brothers, sending them a small smile before returning to his task, whatever that was. "That's alright, we don't mind the theatrics," Sabo said, returning the smile. It was much easier to keep a conversation with the pirates when there was only a small group. Less overwhelming, less stressful. Sabo felt he had a lower chance of making anyone angry, if only a few people were listening rather than tens and hundreds. "Well, that's good, Thatch is known for being theatrical," Aizo said, pulling the thing in his lap a second before raising it, smiling brightly. "There, finished," he said, holding up a white glove that Sabo vaguely recognized. "Nice work as always, Aizo, you're..." Marco complimented, examining the article. The brothers, though, were still confused. "Did you make it?" Sabo asked, the commander's attention turning to him at the question, making him a bit uncomfortable. Aizo shook his head, placing the glove on the table. "No, I just mended it. It's his glove actually, he ripped it so he asked me to fix it for him," Aizo informed. Sabo glanced at the object, nodding. "You must be pretty good then, I can't even tell it was ripped in the first place," Sabo complimented. Aizo beamed, looking pleased by the compliment. "Well, of course, I've had many years of practice, but I can do much more than just mending. I'm good at embroidering and even making clothes, like yours," Aizo said, nodding to the clothes that they were wearing that day, ones that Aizo had given them when they first got their room. Sabo raised an eyebrow, Ace and Luffy listening, but not really following along. "Really? That's impressive," Sabo said, genuinely meaning it. Aizo smiled to him again, and the conversation died off there. It didn't take long for the brothers to finish their lunch, and for them to be out of the galley right as the rest of the pirates on board began heading in for their own lunch. The brothers spent most of their time that afternoon exploring the ship again, Luffy enjoying the giant figurehead, Sabo and Ace having to keep him from jumping up onto it, knowing that the surface was slick from the ocean spray, and knowing Luffy he would fall in. By the time it was nearing dinner, the three had explored the entire deck, deciding that tomorrow they might go explore the inside of the ship, and Sabo remembered they never did finish Izo's tour. The pirates were milling around the deck again, and Sabo recognized a few of the commanders that happened to be out as well. Whitebeard was even out now too, having been gone from the deck earlier. The brothers had decided that they were going to head to their room for a bit, maybe take a nap, but as they were descending the stairs from the upper deck, a particularly strong gust of wind came and blew Luffy's hat off his head before he could grab it. Hat! Luffy cried, Ace and Sabo having to grab onto Luffy before he could fling himself after it. The straw hat had been blown over the railing, the brothers watching as it landed on the water, already beginning to float away from the Moby. Ace, Sabo, my hat! Luffy cried in dismay, and the brothers felt their hearts practically breaking. They knew that that hat was extremely important to Luffy, they knew that it was a major source of comfort for the boy, and without it, they knew Luffy wouldn't be nearly the same. I wouldn't worry so much. Thatch's voice clued them in that others had noticed their brother's predicament. They turned to see that nearly everyone was now looking at them, Thatch, Marco, and Izo standing near them. But my hat, Luffy said softly, watching the straw hat floating even further away now. He was barely containing his tears, wanting nothing more than to stretch his arm out and grab it, but knew that would only upset Ace and Sabo, and get them into trouble. It's okay Luffy, Namor's already going after it, you're. At Marco's words, there was a splash in the water, and the brothers could see the fishermen swimming after the object, filling them with relief. It's pretty important to you, huh? Izo asked, Luffy nodding fast with a stern look on his face. He hummed, everyone watching as Namor swam back, someone sending down the rope ladder for him. Luffy smiled widely, running up to the fisherman with no regard to the fact that someone could hurt him in that moment. Ace and Sabo were shocked for a moment as they saw their brother from 7 years ago, smiling carefree, running up to strangers without worrying about possible consequences, but as fast as it had come, it was gone, the timid Luffy returning within seconds after taking the hat from Namor. Thank you, Luffy said meekly, realizing he had run away from Ace and Sabo. He also noticed he was the center of attention at the moment, and that did nothing to help the sudden anxiety welling inside him. There was no problem Luffy, Namor said kindly, smiling softly to the boy who gave him a small smile back, suddenly remembering what Sabo had taught him, and bowing a bit before rushing back to his brother's sides, clinging the straw hat tightly in his hands. Sabo ruffled Luffy's hair, sending him happy feelings and praise, proud that he had remembered to bow, while Ace patted his back a bit, feeling the same as Sabo. Hey Luffy, could I see your hat for a moment? I promise I'll give it right back. Izo said, and everyone could see the apprehension on Luffy's face as he looked from his hat, then back to Izo. After a few moments, Luffy handed the hat over a bit uneasily, even though Izo was smiling and only feeling calm feelings. Once the special object was in Izo's hands, the brothers watched him carefully, ready to take the hat back if he started damaging it, but instead, Izo pulled a white string from his pocket, securing it to the hat. He placed it on Luffy's head, tying the string for him. There, now you won't lose your hat anymore, Izo said, standing back and allowing the brothers to see it. Luffy beamed, holding the string in his fingers. Wow. Thanks, lady not lady. Luffy thanked happily, letting his nickname for the man slip out. Izo laughed at that. There was no problem, we wouldn't want you losing it anymore, Izo said, Luffy nodding in agreement. Ace, Sabo, look, now hat can't fly away anymore. Luffy said happily, holding the string up to show his brothers. They both smiled to him, nodding. You're right Lu, that's pretty cool. Ace agreed, which only made Luffy beam even more. Thank you Izo, that was extremely kind of you, Sabo said, bowing to the commander in thanks, Luffy doing the same along with Ace. There was no problem, really, Izo said, waving of the gratitude. After that the brothers began walking back to their room, the pirates all returning to their usual activities. PFFT, Izo, I didn't know we could call you lady not lady. Thatch, I swear to call me, if you start calling me that you'll regret it. Chapter 35. That day. Multiple times throughout the night the brothers were woken up because Luffy would have a nightmare. Instead of having the one nightmare and then a peaceful sleep, the youngest had been plagued with them every time he closed his eyes, and no matter how hard he tried getting a restful sleep it didn't work. Ace and Sabo were definitely feeling the effects. Every time they woke up to Luffy's thrashing, or whimpering, or sometimes even screaming, they would feel tireder than the last time. By the time light was finally starting to shine in their room, the three had given up on trying to fall back asleep, instead deciding to get up for the day, despite the fact that none of them felt as if they had gotten any sleep. Today marked the second week since the three had escaped the facility, 2 whole weeks that they had been on the Whitebeard pirate's ship, and even though they made progress in terms of physical recovery, they had barely moved an inch when it came to mental recovery. The trio were sitting in bed, all with their eyes closed, yet not falling asleep, just trying to relax a bit before breakfast was ready. Sabo vaguely realized that he was starting to drift off again, but couldn't find it in himself to care, as his senses slowly began dulling, the haziness of sleep beginning to take over his mind, and he happily welcomed it. Only seconds after this though a noise caught his attention, and he shot up in bed, eyes wide with panic and breathing suddenly much faster than it had been before. The suddenness of Sabo's movements made Ace and Luffy jump up as well, thinking something was happening, but after a few seconds with Sabo saying nothing, the blonde slowly began to calm down, slowly slumping back into the mattress. Sabo? Luffy asked softly, concerned as to what had just happened. He had felt the sheer terror coming from his older brother, which had unknowingly influenced him into feeling it as well, but now the blonde was calming down. That didn't explain what had happened though. Hey, you okay? Ace asked softly when Sabo didn't respond to Luffy. Finally, Sabo nodded, letting his eyes shut again. Yeah, I'm fine, just heard a rolling cart, Sabo muttered, and just like that Ace and Luffy understood. The two nodded, also lying back down to get a little bit of rest while they could. Luffy was terrified of falling asleep again, not wanting to have another nightmare, so he stared at the ceiling silently. When Sabo had been drifting off, he hadn't been in the right state of mind, so when he heard a rolling cart that sounded just like the food cart in the facility, he had panicked, his brain thinking he had to get his brothers up, get them ready for another day of testing. Eventually, the day started and Sabo informed them that they should leave for breakfast. Like yesterday, all three of them were on edge, reverting back to how they had been their first day on the Mobi, but instead of getting better after breakfast, the unease stayed. Luffy was extremely timid, not wanting to move even an inch away from his brothers, in fear that something would happen. All of the nightmares he had had were replaying in his head, and even though he knew it was illogical for some of the dreams to happen, that didn't make him any less scared of them. Ace was also even more on guard, spinning to see every minute movement. He knew it was bad when a fly buzzed by, and he nearly flamed his fist up to attack it, as if it were a weapon. Sabo wasn't any better than the other two, using his hearing to listen to anything and everything, paranoid that someone was going to somehow sneak up on them, even though it was nearly impossible to with how guarded and tense the three were. The lack of sleep that night wasn't doing any of them any favors, and it seemed the Whitebeard pirates knew something was up. It wasn't hard to figure out with how twitchy and jumpy the three were throughout breakfast, but no one knew what to do, not wanting to upset the brothers. Some suggested getting a nurse, but that was ultimately decided to end up doing more harm than good, so instead, they decided to give the three a bit of space. It was conflicting for the brothers, because more than anything they wanted to be left alone, but at the same time, they didn't want to go back to their room where they would be confined in such a small space. They were exhausted, but they needed, the fresh air, the feeling of being able to move around. In the end, the brothers ended up going to their usual spot at the railing, assuming their normal positions and trying to relax. Of course, the key word there was trying. Even as they forced themselves to enjoy the view of the ocean, or being able to lay down in Ace's case, they were still buzzing with nervous energy, feeling as if any second something was going to happen. Within a few minutes Ace was falling victim to another sleep attack, and that did nothing to help Sabo and Luffy relax, the three even more wired than before, as they focused on making sure no one got too close to them or Ace. Sabo was aware of the fact that Ace's sleep attacks were getting worse, this being the third day in a row in which he had one, but he also knew that it was because of the lack of sleep and the high emotional state he'd been in recently. Sadly, it didn't seem like things were going to get any better. If Luffy's nightmares continued this way, none of them would get any sleep. And the fact that they were going to be on the Mobi for a while surrounded by possibly murderous pirates wasn't going to help Ace calm down from his overly stressed state anytime soon, either. Eventually, Ace was waking back up, dazed and confused, as he tried to figure out where he was and what was happening. Sabo calmed him down before he did anything too drastic, telling him where they were and that he had fallen asleep. Unlike yesterday, it seemed the sky was finally beginning to see a change in weather, as Sabo could see dark clouds on the horizon, and Sabo couldn't help but snort at how fitting it was for this to be the day where it finally gets stormy. His brothers gave him questioning looks, but he ignored them, watching the ocean again. More and more time passed, though not nearly as fast as the brothers would have liked. Unlike usual where they would at least communicate with each other through their silent language, today they weren't saying anything to one another, but that was okay. None of them were up for conversation, instead wanting to mull over their own anxieties alone. But even that came to an end when one pirate came running out from below deck. Any other time the brothers would have glanced at him, noticed he wasn't running towards them, or even in their general direction, and went back to what they were doing, but this time was different. Harita, guess what? The brothers froze at the name, and with their already high stress and anxiety, the sound of that man's name at the beginning of the commander's name tipped them just over the edge. Most of the pirates had noticed that, around the brothers, Harita was called Ruta, but apparently that pirate hadn't gotten the memo. Now there were many eyes on them, everyone wondering how the trio would react to the name. Much like the first time they had heard it, they were frozen, lost in their own memories of the facility. Luffy was beginning to shake, and Ace was so tense it was beginning to hurt, while Sabo was gripping the railing so tight he was afraid it was going to snap beneath him. No words were spoken. Ace merely stood up, grabbed Luffy's hand, pulled him off the railing, and walked away, Sabo close behind. They were walking in such a zombified manner that it stunned some pirates, watching as the three disappeared below deck. It had gone silent, no one wanting to speak, but the sound of the door shutting shocked them out of their stupor. Ah, I forgot it was Ruta now. Today was definitely not the day for this. Ace was still trying to shake himself out of the memories of the facility, annoyed that this was even happening at all. He was out of there, this shouldn't be happening anymore. He had nothing to worry about, it's not like those people could come get him right now. But they could. These pirates had seen the facility, had defeated the doctors. What if it was all a show? What if they contacted the doctors and one day they would wake up right back in their cell again? But it had been 2 weeks now, why would the pirates wait that long? Maybe the facility was rebuilding itself and would come get the brothers when it was ready. No matter how outlandish the idea was, Ace's brain managed to rationalize it enough that he believed it, became paranoid that the possibilities would come true, that one day, they would see Hare's ugly face again. Sabo and Luffy weren't any better than he was, Sabo thinking the exact same thoughts as Ace, wondering if this was all some elaborate trick, that the pirates really would betray them and send them back. There was no way of knowing for sure, no way of knowing that they wouldn't send them back once they realized the brothers were too difficult to take care of. Luffy was even worse though, still shaking from having heard Haruta's name. The triggering word had sent him into a pit of thoughts and memories that he couldn't climb out of. He was suddenly remembering his every moment in the facility, how painful every shot was, every cut, every test, how cold the cells were, how gross and slimy the doctor's feelings were. He was even remembering his nightmares from last night, things that hadn't happened, but it seemed so real that Luffy didn't know if they were repressed memories or something his brain made up to scare him. Had they done that test to see if he could regrow limbs, or had that been a figment of his imagination? Could he really jump super high because of the painful stimulant they had put into his legs, or was that fake too? It was getting difficult for Luffy to differentiate his nightmares from his memories. None of the brothers could snap out of it. They were stuck in their own heads, stuck back in a facility that they had escaped from. They didn't know how long they sat there in their room, stuck, but when the ship suddenly started violently rocking, it was enough to sober up Sabo, the blonde looking around in dazed confusion. He could hear a commotion outside along with a loud patter of something on the deck. Oh, it was storming. Apparently, those dark storm clouds he had seen earlier had finally reached the Moby, and now the pirates were fighting their way through it. He could hear some commanders ordering others on what to do so they could get out safely and use that to ground himself. He wasn't at the facility, he was on the Moby. Sure, these pirates could betray them, send them back, but right now they weren't, and if they did, they would deal with it then. They wouldn't go back, they would do everything in their power to not go back. Besides, now they had Garp and Shanks on their sides, they would help them if they were taken again. Slowly returning back to reality, Sabo noticed that Ace and Luffy were most definitely not in the same reality as him. It took a bit of coaxing, but he had eventually gotten Ace out of his trance, the two of them working together to get Luffy out of it, who was much further gone than they had been. It took a bit of time and a lot of effort, but they did it, the three of them listening to the crashing waves and pelting rain outside. Ace and Luffy were even able to hear some of the pirates shouting too. The three laid on the bed, trying to relax a bit. Today's been a shitty day, Ace muttered, Luffy and Sabo nodding in agreement. We just didn't get enough sleep. It messed us up, Sabo said with a sigh. Sorry, Luffy mumbled meekly, Ace and Sabo sending him warm feelings at how small his voice sounded. It's fine, Lou, it's not your fault, Ace said, Sabo nodding in agreement. Luffy pouted. But I kept waking you guys up, so it is my fault, Luffy said, feeling bad that he had woken his brothers up so many times throughout the night. He wasn't a kid, he should be able to get over his own nightmares, but he couldn't. But you can't control what dreams you have, can you? Sabo asked, Luffy shaking his head no. See, so it wasn't your fault. Everyone has nightmares, and after everything we've been through we just get them much easier and more often than normal people. That's all. Sabo said, cheering Luffy up a bit. Now, speaking of sleep, why don't we try to take a nap? It was now much later in the day, almost time for dinner, lunch having come and gone. The commanders were all in a meeting with Whitebeard, discussing their next course of action. When they had found the brothers at the facility they had been restocking after having helped one of their islands, but now they needed to get back to the New World, before the Marines got too twitchy about them being in the calmer waters. It was agreed that they would land at one more island before Sabati, so that they could restock again, as well as get the necessary items for the brothers. I made them enough clothes for a week, so they must have already gone through everything by now. I don't have any more fabric to make more clothes, so that should definitely be top priority in terms of things they need. Aizo said, everyone, nodding in understanding while Marco wrote things down, putting that at the top of the brothers' list. And Ace and Luffy eat a lot more than anyone else, we'll have to up our food budget to accommodate that chatted, eliciting more nods from the group. Other than that, we should restock the med bay. After helping all those kids from the facility, we're starting to run low on supplies. Flamenco finished. The meeting had been long, but that was normal, especially when they were making lists for restocking. Now that everything was done, the commanders began relaxing, chatting about the day they'd had. Did you notice how tense the brothers were today? At Raku's question, all attention turned to him, everyone suddenly invested in the topic. Yeah, how could you not? They looked ready to bolt the entire day. Haruta said, though there was worry laced in his tone as he remembered how on edge the trio had been all day. I wouldn't say bolt. Remember when Jack said your name, Haruta? They woke off like they were sleepwalking. Atmos said, many nodding as they remembered. Their reaction to your name was much stronger today than it had been before, Namor noted, remembering back to the first time the three had heard it. They must have been having a bad day today, Yoi, Marco said, still writing things down on his list. Yes, those three did look troubled the entire day today. Whitebeard agreed, having been keeping a closer eye on the brothers today, worried about them with how they had been acting, almost as if they were cornered animals getting ready to snap. After the Haruta incident, though, the brothers had stayed holed up in their room, not even coming out for lunch. Of course, this worried everyone even more, but when the platter of food that Thatch had left outside their door ended up empty, the captain decided not to send the nurses after them, rather let them stay in their room for the time being. Obviously, they needed the solitude, a place where they wouldn't be disturbed, and if he sent the nurses after them, even with good intentions, that would only make it worse. The brothers, like every other child they had saved from the facility, had an obvious disliking towards the nurses and needles, and if they were having a bad day because of the things that had happened in the facility, nurses were the last thing they needed. Whitebeard sighed, watching as his children began talking amongst themselves once more. He hoped that one day the three would open up, be comfortable enough that they could act like normal children without worry. He knew that it wouldn't happen overnight, that it would be a long time coming, but if they continued to help the brothers, he hoped that they would see that they weren't going to hurt them, that they didn't want them to be scared of them. Everyone on the Moby was family, and those three weren't an exception, many already thinking of them as brothers, even though they weren't officially a part of the crew. Family helps each other get over trauma, and that's what they were going to do for the brothers. They wouldn't push them, they'll let them open up on their own, but they weren't going to shy away from them either. They were going to show those three that not everyone in this world was a bad person. Now they just had to hope that tomorrow was a better day than today had been. Chapter 36. Luffy's questionnaire. The next day began much better than the previous. Although Luffy still had a nightmare, it was only once, when they were already waking up anyways. Now that they were fully rested, they all felt much better than before, the edge they had been on yesterday gone as if it hadn't happened. The three laid in bed, waking up still, all of them staring at the ceiling with barely open eyes. Is breakfast done yet? Ace asked in a mumble. Sabo listened for a second before nodding. That's just finished. If we go now, we'll get there before everyone starts crowding in, Sabo said, already dragging himself up into a sitting position. Ace groaned but also sat up, already missing the feeling of the comfy mattress and warm blankets. Luffy sat up as well, doing so silently, and stood up, stretching his arms over his head just a bit further than a normal human would be able to. The fact that the boy hadn't used his devil fruit powers once in front of the pirates was something that continued to amaze Ace and Sabo, having expected him to use them without thinking, but that wasn't the case. Sabo was reminded of the fact that Luffy had also managed to fool everyone into thinking he was a mute because they told him not to talk to anyone, and suddenly he wasn't as surprised. Not using his powers though seemed to be putting a strain on the youngest, because whenever they were alone, Luffy would stretch his arms or legs, using his fruit in the process, making the brothers think that maybe he was more bothered about it than they thought. The three walked to the galley, ignoring any looks they got from curious pirates. After they had heard Haruta's name yesterday, they had shut themselves in their room, not even coming out for meals. Luckily Sabo noticed that Thatch had been kind enough to leave a platter outside their door for them at lunch, and then for dinner as well. The brothers had definitely not been expecting it, thinking the pirates wouldn't want to waste food on them if they weren't in the galley to eat it, so when the chef did it, they felt a bit better, even if their day had been horrible until then. Sabo was going to make sure to thank the chef when he could, grateful that he had fed them. The brothers knew they were going to be staying with the pirates for a while now. They knew that they should at least become friendly with them, but there was that piece of them, warning them that the second they started getting closer, they would be betrayed. Of course, no matter how close they got to anyone, they weren't going to tell them anything about their powers, because that would just be opening the door for betrayal. The brothers could try and be distant forever, but how long would it be until the pirates got fed up with them and turned? That wasn't something the three wanted to risk, so if they could avoid it, they would. Hey, you three made it. As they entered the galley, Thatch was the first to notice, smiling brightly as he set a plate on the table, probably food for himself. Sabo smiled at the man, nodding as he and his brothers went to the table and sat down. We did, Sabo said as Thatch ran back to the kitchen, coming out with food for the brothers. Well, I'm glad you could make it. We missed you yesterday, Thatch said, making Sabo feel a bit uncomfortable at the mention of their bad day yesterday. Ah, yeah, sorry about that. We were a bit out of it yesterday. Didn't get enough sleep, I guess, Sabo explained, quickly eating to get himself out of the conversation. Thatch nodded in understanding, sitting down and picking up his fork. That's understandable. Well, anyway, we're all glad you're feeling better then, Thatch said, waving his arms out to gesture to the few other commanders who were at the table with him. Seeing as breakfast was only just finished, there was only a handful of commanders there, the ones who usually got there early. Izo, Marco, and Josu all nodded in agreement with Thatch's previous statement, all with food of their own. Ace and Luffy were back to being on guard during breakfast, the crowd of pirates slowly filing into the room until nearly everyone was there. The rest of the commanders and the captain were here as well now, everyone having their usual, joyful conversations, while the trio tried to stay as out of the way as possible, not wanting to get involved in any conversations. As they did this though, Sabo remembered how he had wanted to thank Thatch for giving them food yesterday when they didn't show up for meals. Waiting for a chance where the chef wasn't talking or being called back into the kitchen, Sabo finally spoke up. By the way, Mr. Chef, Sabo piped up eventually, drawing his brother's attention. They hadn't expected Sabo to initiate any conversations, and from the looks of it, Thatch hadn't either. Really, just Thatch is fine, what's up? Thatch asked, turning his attention to the blonde. The brothers were just finishing their breakfast, so Sabo found this was the best time to have this conversation. If they needed to leave, they could. We just wanted to thank you for giving us food yesterday, seeing as we didn't come here to eat, Sabo said with a genuinely grateful tone. Realizing what Sabo was talking about, Ace and Luffy relaxed, both nodding their thanks to the man as well, who still looked a bit surprised. Oh, that. It was no big deal, besides, as long as you're on the Moby you're not gonna go hungry. Not when I'm your chef. Thatch boasted proudly with a smile. Sabo smiled at the thought, nodding to the happy chef, as some of the commanders laughed around them at Thatch's antics. Wait, so how did you know it was me? Thatch asked after the laughter died down. Ah, Sabo started, he and his brothers standing up, getting ready to leave. You have loud footsteps, Sabo said, flashing the chef a smile, waving as they walked away, leaving a confused chef behind. They're not that loud, are they na, Fossa? Do I have loud footsteps? Sabo snickered to himself, Ace smiling and Luffy much more relaxed than he had been so far on this ship. It was true though, out of all the people on this ship, Sabo had noticed that Thatch's footsteps were a bit heavier and louder than most, making it easy to identify the man whenever he walked by. Now that they were done with breakfast and feeling much better than they had yesterday, the brothers decided to do a bit of exploring. Even though they never finished that tour with Izo, they didn't want to bother the man who was still eating breakfast, so they decided to just walk around and see what they could find inside the Moby. The trio had only really gone through the hallway where their room was, and although Ace and Sabo had explored a bit while looking for Luffy when he ran off, they hadn't been paying much attention. Seeing as everyone was in the galley, the three didn't see any harm in speaking aloud, especially since Sabo would be able to hear anyone coming. The three talked about mindless things for a while, until Sabo remembered Luffy's penchant for nicknaming the commanders. By the way, Luffy, you should at least learn the names of the commanders, Sabo said after Luffy once again mentioned Marco by using the nickname Lazy Face as they walked. Luffy pouted, clearly unhappy with what Sabo had just suggested. But those are their names, Luffy whined, crossing his arms where he stood in between Ace and Sabo. No, they aren't, Lu, they're weird nicknames that you made up. Ace deadpanned, causing Luffy to pout further. So what if they are? They're easier to remember, Luffy mumbled, kicking his foot against the ground. Sabo sighed, shaking his head. Yes, but sometimes your nicknames can make people a little unhappy, even if you don't think they would. Sabo tried explaining, knowing that Luffy meant no harm in his nicknames, but sometimes they could be taken offensively to the people he said them to. What do you mean? The youngest asked, confused. You know how you get mad whenever Shanks calls you Anchor? Ace asked, Luffy nodding. Yeah, it's not my fault, I think, Luffy said, remembering the nickname. Ace held back a laugh, nodding. See, that nickname upsets you, just like some of your nicknames upset others, even if you don't realize it. Ace said, Luffy finally seeming to understand. Oh, I get it now. So I should learn their names then, Luffy said determinedly, Sabo smiling gratefully to Ace, to which the eldest gave a smug smile back. That's right, Lu, for starters, Marco's the first commander, not Lazy Face, Sabo said, Luffy frowning as he tried to remember the name, nodding. I still think Lazy Face is better though, Luffy mumbled after a minute, causing Ace to laugh. Sabo glared at him. You're not helping, Ace. I know you might think it's better, Lu, but that's not his name, it's Marco. Sabo said again, saying the name slowly in hopes that his brother would catch on to the name and stick to it. And that's how the conversation went. As they familiarized themselves with the inside of the Moby, Sabo taught Luffy a few of the commanders' names, the ones they normally talked to, like Thatch, Marco, Izo, and Namor. He let Harita's nickname slide for obvious reasons. By now breakfast was over and they were passing more and more pirates, so the brothers decided to talk silently, rather than out loud as they explored. The Moby was definitely big, and they were getting a bit tired and disoriented after everything they'd explored so far, so they decided to try and find their way back to the deck, Luffy using his sense of smell, while Sabo used his hearing, and Ace kept an eye out for anything weird. When they finally reached the deck, Ace and Sabo were about to head to the railing when Luffy stopped them, tilting his head as he stared across the deck. "What is it, Lu?" Sabo asked, looking across the deck to try and figure out what Luffy was looking at. Ace did the same, waiting for a response. "Can we go on your big mustache, Captain?" Luffy asked, staring at the giant captain. Ace and Sabo raised an eyebrow at that, glancing at each other. "You want to go near the captain?" Ace asked for clarification. Luffy looked hesitant, eyebrows scrunching in thought. "Nobody has a lot of warm feelings, and no one else has had warm feelings besides Ace and Sabo," Luffy said, having been curious about that since he first figured out that the captain contained a lot of the warm feeling. The two oldest seemed hesitant, but they were also curious about that as well. None of them had figured out how someone felt the warm feeling, but none of the doctors had had it. After a while, Ace and Sabo had been able to figure out how to send that feeling to Luffy to calm him down. But that had taken a lot of trial and error, and a lot of meditating to help them figure out where the feeling was coming from in the first place, so for the captain to have such an abundance of it was a bit confusing. "As long as you don't let the warm feeling influence yourself too much," Sabo said, Luffy nodding in agreement. With that said, the three made their way along the railing, towards the captain, but not getting too close. They eventually sat on the railing in their usual position some feet away from the captain, close enough that they could easily see him, but not close enough that the man could reach them if he tried. The pirates noticed the brothers' change in location, but said nothing, opting to instead give them curious stares as they went on with their duties. The trio ignored them though, Sabo pretending to look at the clouds with Luffy again, while Luffy started trying to decipher the captain's feelings. He couldn't find even a hint of any bad feelings in the man, no anger, frustration, annoyance, not even a feeling of being tired. The only thing that the captain was feeling were happy feelings, joy, pride, contentment, love, and of course the warm feeling. It confused Luffy because these were pirates, and he had never felt anyone feel these feelings without the slimy greed behind all of them. Luffy let himself take in just a small bit of the warmth that the captain was sending out, amazed when even that much made him want to feel more. He remembered what Sabo said though and forced himself to stop, instead trying to focus on the other feelings, searching as far as he could for even a hint of dark feelings, because surely no one else but his brothers could feel only good emotions, right? The captain was an enigma to Luffy, a puzzle he couldn't solve, something too good to be true. He decided to take down one of his walls to see if the captain's soul had changed color at all, looking for even a trace of gray in the vastly blue ore. Finding none, the straw-hatted teen slumped a bit, not understanding. Were his powers defective? Surely these pirates weren't all nice. Maybe the doctors had messed up and he only saw a few people's true feelings. Maybe he only saw happy feelings in people he'd never met before. He didn't have any explanation for what was happening, because the captain couldn't possibly be this good of a person, right? Mind made up, Luffy jumped down from the railing, ignoring the shock and surprise coming from Ace and Sabo, as they both got to their feet as well, moving closer to him. Determined, Luffy walked down the stairs into Whitebeard's amphitheater-like zone and looked up at the giant. He could feel the worry rolling off of Ace and Sabo, but again chose to ignore it. He could even hear them tapping to him, telling him to stop whatever he was about to do, to not anger the captain. By now all eyes were on them, everyone curious as to what was happening, because, by the looks of it, Ace and Sabo had no idea either. Only Luffy, who was staring at Whitebeard with narrowed eyes, seemed to know what was happening. Ace and Sabo had no idea what Luffy was planning, and they didn't want to find out. They hadn't been expecting the timid and anxious boy to suddenly stalk up to the giant pirate captain without a word to them. Ever since everything that happened in the facility, Luffy had been much more wary of strangers, but seeing him now reminded them of 7 years ago, before any of the hell that was the facility happened. But what had caused this? Had Luffy felt the bad feeling? If they had a feeling, he wouldn't have reacted in this way, or he at least would have told them before doing this. Giant mustache captain. Inwardly, Sabo cursed for not teaching Luffy the captain's name, but how was he supposed to have predicted that the boy would go and do this? Luffy? Ace is so low and quiet that Sabo wasn't even sure if Luffy heard, the fire user shuffling closer to Luffy as he did. Luffy had to have heard it though, because his eyes flitted over to Ace for a brief moment before he promptly ignored the oldest, turning back to face Whitebeard with his narrowed eyes. Yes? Whitebeard asked, obviously curious as to what was happening as well, and Sabo just hoped that Luffy wouldn't get them into any trouble. If ever there was a time for the brothers to be worried about the pirates turning on them, it would be now. Your mustache is stupid. The bluntness of the statement made everyone blink, not having expected the youngest to say that of all things. Luffy? This time it was Sabo who hissed, but before he could turn to apologize to the captain, he was interrupted. You're a cheeky brat, huh? Whitebeard asked, a grin on his face, but Ace and Sabo, for the life of them, couldn't figure out if there was any ill intent behind it. In any case, they shuffled closer to Luffy, grabbing his hands tightly in theirs. Luffy didn't reply, instead staring at Whitebeard for a moment with the same narrowed eyes and determined look. I bet I could beat you. Again, the bluntness threw everyone for a loop, and Ace and Sabo's stomachs continued to drop more and more, wondering if Luffy was trying to get the captain to attack them. Again Whitebeard laughed in response, leaving Sabo with no chance to try and explain Luffy's actions, not that he could even if he had the chance. Oh? I think you're 100 years too soon to be challenging me. Whitebeard said confidently, his smile never leaving his face. Still, Luffy wasn't fazed by the answer, once again staring at Whitebeard for a moment before speaking up again. How do you feel about family? Once more, the bluntness of the question caught everyone off guard. There seemed to be no pattern to the questions Luffy was asking, no reason for them. They were completely random, and no one could figure out what was going on in the boy's head, not even his brothers who merely stood by, watching. They knew they should stop Luffy from speaking anymore, but the determination showed that, obviously, Luffy was trying to figure something out, and whatever it was probably important, so they let him ask the questions, just hoping that this wouldn't be the moment they had to jump ship. They still hadn't found where they kept lifeboats. Family, you say. Family looks out for each other, keeps each other safe. You don't hurt or betray family. You don't turn away from family. Whitebeard answered easily, raising an eyebrow now at Luffy's questions, and Ace and Sabo hoped that didn't mean he was starting to get annoyed with the youngest pestering. And everyone on the crew is family? Luffy asked, furthering the conversation. Whitebeard nodded, face serious. Everyone on my ship is my sons and daughters. We're all a family. Whitebeard confirmed. Luffy went silent again, everyone watching, waiting for his next question, not knowing what to expect next. Eventually, Luffy grinned his large toothy smile that was rare these days, only shown to the brothers when they were in the safety of their room, away from prying eyes. Shi, you're a good guy, Whitebeard. Luffy said, still grinning as he turned to walk back to the railing, though it was the railing much closer to the captain, clearly not trying to distance himself anymore. Ace and Sabo looked at each other in a mixture of shock and confusion. They had no idea what the purpose behind Luffy's actions was, nor how those questions deemed the captain a good guy, but they followed Luffy back to the railing silently, ignoring any looks they could feel coming from the pirates. Luffy was back to facing the ocean as Ace and Sabo reached him, Sabo sitting beside him, while Ace took his position on the ground, listening for the taps he knew were to come. Luffy? Sabo questioned almost hesitantly. The boy, who was smiling brightly, glanced at Sabo out of the corner of his eye, acknowledging that he had heard him. What was that all about? Sabo asked, wanting more than anything to figure out what had just happened. Luffy's smile widened even more as he turned his eyes back to the ocean, holding back laughter. Shanks and Jai-chan were right, giant mustached captain's a good guy. Luffy said though, that did nothing to explain what had happened or how he had figured this information out. What's that gotta do with what just happened? Ace questioned from the floor, tapping just loud enough for Luffy to hear. I was checking to see if he was a good guy. Bad guys don't have so many good feelings. Luffy replied, still smiling. Sabo and Ace both felt even more confused. You deemed him a good guy because he was feeling happy? Ace asked incredulously. Luffy tilted his head, as if unsure of how to answer that. No but yeah but no. Luffy said, a bit confused himself now. Sabo resisted the urge to fassip him. Then explain to us what happened. Sabo resolved, wanting to move forward with the conversation. Luffy nodded at that, thinking of how to explain it. Well, I was feeling Giant Mustache's feelings because only Ace and Sabo have had the warm feeling, but he had a lot too, so I was confused. I checked his other feelings and there weren't any bad feelings, not even anger or sleepiness, so when I asked him questions I tried to make him mad, but it didn't work, so that's why he was a good guy. Luffy tried explaining, though his brothers were still confused. Wait, what do you mean he didn't get mad? Not even a bit. Ace asked, thinking back to some of the questions. Sure, Luffy's insult had been kind of lame, but it was still an insult, and his challenge should have been a surefire way to get a pirate captain ready for a fight. It was the perfect excuse, so why hadn't the captain even felt an inkling of wanting to fight them? Was he that confident he would win that it didn't matter to him? Nope. He didn't get mad, he was only interested and a bit confused, and when I asked him about family he didn't lie to me. He meant everything he said, so he's a good guy. I like him. Luffy determined, smiling again. Ace and Sabo went quiet a moment, both thinking over Luffy's words. They had already felt a bit more comfortable near the captain over all the other pirates, purely because of the fact that the man exuded a lot of the warmth. They hadn't known anyone else who had it, so that was a good sign to the brothers, but now that Luffy was so confidently claiming the man to be a good person, it made Ace and Sabo that much more inclined to like the man. It also helped that, even when presented with the perfect opportunity, Whitebeard hadn't fought their brother. He had the perfect opportunity to get rid of one of the brothers at that moment, yet he hadn't done anything, choosing to laugh it off instead. Both of them glanced to the captain, realizing some of the pirates were still watching them, very clearly still wondering about what had happened. A while passed since Luffy's interrogation of Whitebeard and the pirates were finally beginning to disperse, allowing the brothers to relax a bit. As usual, it didn't last long though, Ace spotting the first commander making his way over to them. After informing Sabo and Luffy of the incoming commander, Ace sat up slightly, making it look as if he was waking up, stretching a bit before letting his eyes flick over to Marco fully now. It didn't take long for him to reach the brothers, Sabo and Luffy turning around to face him as well. "Hello Marco, how are you?" Sabo asked politely, smiling to the man. "Good, thank you, Yoi," Marco replied. Luffy began trying to get a read on the man, hoping to figure out why he came to talk to them in the first place. Like Whitebeard before he interrogated him, Luffy felt a bit more comfortable near the first commander, Thatch as well, because both of them had helped him save his brothers, and he knew that both of them kept their promises, but he had to be sure, like he was with Whitebeard, that he was really a good person. "So what is it you needed?" Sabo asked, making himself comfortable as he gave his attention over to Marco. "Nothing much, I just came by to tell you all that we're on course to an island that we should reach sometime tomorrow. We figured we could restock and get you three some necessities like clothes, Yoi, seeing as you'll be staying with us now," Marco explained. The three perked at the thought of being able to go onto land soon, and maybe even away from the pirates for a bit. "Anything else?" Sabo asked, wondering if the man would bring up Luffy's stunt earlier. The commander shook his head though, surprising Sabo a bit, having expected him to try and pry the answer out of them, or at least question it a bit, but that wasn't the case. "No, that was all, Yoi. You three wouldn't have to do chores until next month when we get the new schedule made, so until then you guys can just rely." Marco cut himself off when Ace, who had been sitting up straight, arms crossed over his chest, suddenly slumped back against a railing, arms falling at his side. Of course Ace would have a sleep attack now of all times. The few pirates turned to see what the thump noise Ace had made was, but Sabo had more pressing issues, namely the commander who had just seen Ace have a sleep attack mid-conversation. "Ah, don't worry about him, he gets bored easily, and has a knack for falling asleep whenever and wherever he wants." Sabo lied, hoping the commander wouldn't question it any more than that. Luffy seemed a bit worried as well, shifting a bit beside Sabo on the railing, looking like he wanted to move closer to Ace, to make sure no one got too close to him, now that he was defenseless. Sabo felt the same. "Are you sure, Yoi? He looked like he hit the rail pretty hard there. I can get whiskey if you want," Marco said, a hint of concern in his voice, contrasting his outwardly bored-looking appearance, though his eyebrow was a bit more raised now. Sabo had to bite his tongue from screaming that, no, they would not like for him to get whiskey, a nurse, to check up on their brother right now. Stopping himself though, he forced a smile, hoping he looked unfazed by the question. "He's fine, he's got a thick skull, something like that wouldn't hurt him," Sabo said, trying to smile pleasantly to the man. Marco looked at Ace another minute before he turned back to Sabo, seemingly accepting the answer, to which Sabo nearly sighed in relief. They wrapped the conversation up quickly after that, the commander leaving just as Ace began to wake up again, the same dazed look on his face that he usually had whenever he had a sleep attack. Sabo quickly recapped everything that had happened before they left, deciding to go take a nap. Obviously, Ace's attacks weren't going to get better after only one night of good sleep, but Sabo had hoped he wouldn't have to deal with him falling asleep so obviously in front of the first commander of all people. Well, at least he hadn't been standing when it happened. That would have been a lot harder to explain. Chapter 37. The first island of, hopefully, many. By the time the next day rolled around, the brothers were more than ready to go onto an island. Marco had told them over lunch that he and Isa would take them out to do the shopping for anything they would need, but after that, they were free to roam the island if they wanted. Breakfast passed by smoothly, and after, the brothers went out onto the deck, sitting where they had yesterday. It was close by Whitebeard, which, once again, did not go unnoticed by the pirates, nor the captain. They ignored them though, opting instead to watch the island that they could faintly see in the distance slowly get closer. Ace had no problem seeing it, and for once, instead of sitting on the ground, Ace leaned over the railing with his brothers, Sabo taking charge of listening for anyone getting too close. "The trees are pretty tall, and from what I can see the town's not that big, so that means there's a lot of forest to explore," Ace said, speaking softly to Sabo and Luffy, describing the details that he could see with his enhanced eyesight. Even though the younger two could only see a speck that resembled an island, Ace could see much more detail, and Luffy, curious as ever, wanted to know what it looked like so far. "Really, Sabo, we can go exploring, right?" Luffy asked, turning to Sabo with a bright smile and shining eyes. Sabo briefly paused in focusing on the pirates surrounding them, and turned to Luffy, smiling back. "We can, Luffy, but only after we do some shopping first, remember?" Sabo asked, all three of them still speaking in hushed tones. Even though it would be easier to speak in their silent language, it would mean that Sabo wouldn't be able to focus all that much on their surroundings. If he was focusing on the pirates, he wouldn't be able to take the time to decipher the different taps they used in their language, and if he focused on the taps, then he might miss someone coming. What else is there, Ace? Luffy asked, pleased by Sabo's response. Ace continued to describe different things that he could see to Luffy, how the buildings looked, how many people he could see, the different boats in the docks, even what color flowers were in one of the windowsills. Luffy took all of it in, hanging on to every word, but when Sabo signaled that Thatch was coming over, their conversation stopped, all of them turning to face the incoming chef. Hey boys, you excited to visit the island? Thatch asked pleasantly, a smile on his face. Sabo smiled back, nodding to the man as he did, while Luffy began reading his feelings. We are. We've only ever been to our home island before, Sabo said, deciding that the island that the facility had been on hadn't counted. Thatch nodded in understanding, walking up to the railing, so that he could look at the now much more visible island. Makes sense. That just makes it all the more exciting though, Thatch said, smile widening. I wish I could go with you guys though, but I'm in charge of restocking the food supply. Thatch continued, sighing a bit as he lit a cigarette. Oh well, I guess there's always next time. Maybe I'll see you guys after, Thatch said, standing and giving them a grin before waving and walking off, saying a quick goodbye as the three watched in confusion. They hadn't really said a word to the man, the chef just continuing the conversation with himself, like a monologue that they had accidentally overheard. That was weird, Ace muttered quietly, Sabo nodding in agreement. Well, whatever it was, at least I didn't have to do much talking, Sabo said as he turned back around on the railing, looking back to the island. Ace and Luffy turned as well, the island much closer than it had been when they first started looking at it. We should probably go find Marco or Izo. Everyone's getting ready to land soon, Sabo said, hearing everyone talking, some giving orders on what to do as they got closer to the island. Ace and Luffy nodded, the trio turning away from the railing and looking at a mass of people. Luffy discreetly sniffed the air, sifting through the many scents until he found the familiar trail that would lead them to the first commander. This way, Luffy signaled, turning to walk towards the upper deck. His brothers followed, trusting Luffy's nose. It wasn't hard to find the commander after that, the three easily identifying the unique haircut as they ascended the stairs. Marco was talking to someone, but by the time they reached the top of the stairs, the conversation seemed to be over, the other pirate walking away, while Marco stayed where he was, glancing around at everyone else around them. Seeing this as the perfect time, the brothers walked up to the man, the commander spotting them quickly as they did. Ready to go, Yuri? Marco asked, Sabo nodding. We saw everyone was getting ready, so we decided to come find you or Izo, seeing as we'll be going with you too, Sabo explained smoothly. We should be landing within a couple of minutes now. After that, we'll wait for Oyaji to give out the assigned tasks, but then we'll be all set, Yuri, Marco said. Do you need any help with anything? Sabo asked, feeling a bit bad as he watched everyone working around them, some getting ready to lower the anchor, others heading to get the gangplank. Marco seemed to think for a second before nodding. If you want, could you go and tell Izo that I need him to go and separate the money for the different groups being sent out to restock? I would, but I'm a bit busy making sure we don't crash into the island, Yuri, Marco said, and there was a hint of exasperation behind his words, as if this was something that could happen if you weren't here. The task seemed simple enough, so Sabo nodded, Marco thanking them as he told them where the man might be, not that they needed it. The three turned to leave, Luffy using the time to smell the air for Izo, finding the perfume scent easily over the others. Apparently, the man had just come out on deck, the wind blowing the scent right to him. The three maneuvered their way through the throngs of pirates bustling around, Luffy holding on to his brother's hands as he led them so they wouldn't be separated on accident. Once they reached the man, Sabo took charge again, putting on a smile as he called the man's name. Oh, hello you three, can I help you? Izo asked, looking a bit surprised that they were talking to him. Marco wanted us to ask you if you could go separate the money for everyone going out to restock, Sabo said, relaying the information with ease. Izo sighed, smoothing his kimono out a bit. And right after I just left too. Well, thank you for the information, I'll see you guys in a bit, Izo said, smiling pleasantly to them as he turned to head back where he had come from. Well, now what? Ace asked as they watched the door close behind the 16th commander. Sabo shrugged. Guess we just wait. And they did. They watched as the pirates bustled back and forth, listening to or giving commands as they went. Not wanting to get in the way, the three sat on the sidelines, letting the experienced pirates take care of it all. Besides, there was so much going on that the brothers were a bit uncomfortable being near everyone during it. They didn't like that, at any second, someone could turn and attack them, because with all the movement going on, this would be a perfect time, it would catch them off guard. The three weren't anywhere near trusting these pirates, if they ever would. Sure, they were a bit more comfortable near some, i.e. Whitebeard, Marco, Thatch, and Izo, but even then it was more that they tolerated being near those people better than they did the others on this ship. Many who were still complete strangers. It was also a case of the brothers not wanting to try and get close to anyone, because what if they found out about them and their past and turned on them? It would hurt if they were strangers, but if they grew close with them, trusted them, it would hurt even more, and they couldn't handle that, not when the facility was such a fresh wound. Finally, though, the ship was docking, all the preparations slowing as things worked themselves out, the Moby successfully anchoring, and the gangplank being laid down onto the dock. The pirates gathered around Whitebeard, and the trio guessed this was when everyone would be assigned their jobs. They decided to stay on the railing, watching Marco and Izo, so they would be ready to go when they were done. Whitebeard gave out the assignments, and when he finished the brothers hopped down, walking over to their escorts for the day. "Alright, let's get going," Izo said with a smile, holding a pouch of what was, presumably, money. The three nodded, following the commanders off the ship and onto the solid ground, their legs a bit shaky after getting used to the rocky ship. They righted themselves easily though, following quickly, not wanting to get left behind or lost. "So we should go get your clothes first, and then anything else after that. There'll probably be a bit of spending money left, so you three can use it however you want, but after that, you can go explore," Izo said, glancing around to find the shops they would need. Sabo nodded, listening carefully so he knew what they were doing and where they should be going. "And don't worry about the money, we've got it covered. Once you three start doing chores you'll get your own allowance to use on whatever you like whenever we dock," Izo explained. While Sabo listened to the commander, Luffy was practically bouncing with joy, looking at all the different shops, smelling the different smells, feeling the happy feelings coming from many of the citizens. Even though he didn't want to get too close to anyone, he was content sticking in between Ace and Sabo and observing from there. He may be different from 7 years ago, but his childish wonder and curiosity was still the same. Ace had to hold onto Luffy's hand a bit too tightly to keep the youngest from running off towards the first smell of food, but other than that the oldest was enjoying the excursion as well. He was glancing around, using his vision to look into the forest at the edge of the town, seeing it extend a good distance in, meaning it was big and perfect for exploring. After they put up with being a bit too close to a lot of new people, the three brothers would be able to finally relax by themselves in the forest. "This looks like the one we want, Yoi," Marco announced, breaking Ace and Luffy from their thoughts. They followed the two into the shop, looking around at all the different clothes. Izo was beaming as he practically floated away towards a shelf where he began browsing. Marco shook his head, turning to the brothers. "Go get anything you want, I'll just wait here, Yori. Oh, and you might want to hurry before Izo tries to get you to try on 20 different shirts," Marco said, the three nodding as they went off to a different section of the store. "That guy can try, but I swear, if he does I'll throw the shirt right back at him," Ace tapped, not wanting to play dress up. He wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. Sabo rolled his eyes, already lifting different shirts and pants up to Luffy to check if they would fit the small boy. "Not a good plan, we're trying to be nice, remember?" Sabo asked after putting back a shirt that was a bit too big for Luffy. Ace pouted. "Fine, I'll throw it back gently." "Happy?" Ace asked, crossing his arms as he tapped against his skin. Sabo sent a pointed look to Ace, frowning but didn't say anything. "I like pretty man. He's feeling really happy right now." Luffy tapped, a smile blossoming onto his face, and his brothers realized that, even though most of it was probably his own emotion, Luffy was probably being influenced by the overjoyed man stacking clothes over his arm. That wasn't an entirely bad thing though, because at least it was a happy emotion. Sabo smiled to Luffy, ruffling his hair. "That's good, Lou, he seems to be a nice person at least," Sabo said, meaning it. Izo hadn't done anything to them that would raise any flags. He had even helped Luffy with his hat, which was definitely a plus. "Now, Ace, try this on," Sabo said, tossing a shirt at Ace, the clothing covering the fire user's face. Ace pulled it off, revealing a glare while Luffy snickered beside him. Meanwhile, Marco watched from where he stood at the front of the shop. Izo was flitting around, clearly pleased with the situation he was in as he stacked shirts upon shirts, sometimes adding pants to the mix as he did. Marco knew he was going to have to stop the man before he ended up trying to buy the whole store, but for now, he would let his brother have his fun. The trio of brothers, on the other hand, were a bit more interesting to watch. Sabo was helping Luffy pick out clothes, more like picking them out himself, while Ace watched, looking a bit annoyed. At one point Sabo threw a shirt at the oldest, confusing Marco a bit, but it made Luffy laugh, which wasn't something he heard much at all. After that Ace began helping with the process, taking over the role of getting clothes for Luffy, while Sabo moved on to getting clothes for himself and Ace. It was interesting to watch the brothers work. They still knew next to nothing about them, like what had happened in the facility, what information the facility had gotten on the three that made the Marines want them back so bad, or even something as mundane as their favorite food. But Marco knew that they wouldn't be getting any of that information anytime soon, and that was okay. Luffy's interrogation of Oyaji had been a bit strange, and no one knew what to make of it when it had happened. Marco recalled that even Ace and Sabo seemed surprised by Luffy's questionnaire, which only made it all that much more confusing, but Marco had decided not to bring it up at the time, because Sabo had looked like he expected him to, and he knew how touchy the three were about sharing information. So he had chosen not to pry. Of course, everyone else had thought he had pried because the second he left the brothers he was bombarded by questions from anyone he saw, all of them wanting to know what the deal was. The brothers were puzzled that was rapidly increasing in difficulty, and Marco was beginning to wonder if they would ever get closer to solving it. But after the interrogation from Luffy, the three seemed to be a bit more comfortable near their captain, so that had to be a good sign, right? The first commander watched the brothers, noticing that every few seconds one of them would tap, either on their arms, legs, shelves, or even each other, and Marco was reminded of the many other times he had seen them do that. He raised an eyebrow at the gesture, still not knowing what to make of it. Initially, he had thought that it might be a nervous tic or habit, but for them to do it that frequently as if there was purpose behind it, made him think otherwise. He didn't know what it would mean otherwise, but he did know that there had to be some kind of story behind it. Eventually, it looked like the three were finished, each holding their own stack of clothing. Marco stood up from where he was leaning against the wall, and grabbed a pouch of money from his side, having confiscated it from Izo the second they reached the store. "You guys done, Yuri?" Sabo nodded at the question, following the man over to the checkout where a woman was smiling politely to them. The brothers ignored the pleasantries from the woman, instead more focused on what they had been discussing earlier. "But what if there was such thing as an underwater tiger?" Luffy asked. "And I told you, there's no way there's freaking underwater tigers. They don't exist," Ace said, this argument having been going on for most of their shopping experience now. "But what if they were?" Luffy pressed, only annoying Ace more. "Alright, both of you calm down, Marco's finishing." Sabo interjected, drawing their attention back to their chaperone who was beginning to pick up one of their bags. Ace grabbed the other two before the commander had a chance, and they began heading to the front of the store. "We're leaving now, Izo," Marco called, not bothering to look to see if the other commander heard. There was a groan, indicating that Izo had, in fact, heard him, and the brothers turned to see the man quickly returning clothes to their shelves before running after them. "Marco, you did that on purpose. You could have given me some warning," Izo whined, frowning. Marco rolled his eyes at that. "If I had, Yoi, you would have bought something. This trip wasn't meant for you to restock your endless wardrobe, remember?" Marco asked, raising an eyebrow to the man who promptly pouted, placing his arms in his sleeves. "Yeah, but you could have at least let me get that one shirt. It would have been great for Akio. He's always complaining he doesn't have a shirt with shorter sleeves for when we go to the summer islands," Izo said, a slight whine still in his voice. "Then you should come back later with Akio, Yoi," Marco said. The brothers watched the interaction with mild interest, the two going back and forth with ease. Even though they hung around the pirates, they never paid too much to how they interacted, always assuming it was like the doctors had interacted with each other, calm, cool, and professional, only saying what was needed and then being done. This, however, was different, a much easier, laid-back conversation that they hadn't been expecting. After Izo and Marco finished up their talk, the group lapsed into silence, walking through the town and admiring the beauty of it all as they did. Luffy was becoming a bit more comfortable and relaxed in their group, pleased that no one was coming up to bother them, and had eventually begun to speak aloud, pointing to different buildings that interested him or products he thought looked cool. Ace and Sabo indulged him, agreeing that, yes, that shop was really tall, or yes, that jacket with the spikes on the shoulders looked cool. The group had been walking for a couple of minutes, the shop they were looking for not close to where they had been, and at one point Luffy had directed Ace and Sabo attention towards a building on their left. Just as he raised his arm, ready to blurt out whatever it was that was on his mind, Marco suddenly grabbed the boy's wrist, shocking him into silence. Ace and Sabo almost immediately began to jump into action, not knowing why Marco had just grabbed Luffy, and not really caring. All they knew was that they weren't going to let the man hurt their brother. Were the pirates finally turning? Was this the moment they had been waiting for? "Let's go look at that over there, Yui," Marco said almost a little too quickly, lowering Luffy's arm as he pulled him onto the opposite side of the street, leading them back toward the way they had come. Ace and Sabo were just about to pull Marco off of their brother, just about to attack him when they heard Marco speak in a much quieter tone than before. "Just follow me, Marines are coming this way, Yui," Marco said softly, probably having noticed the tension in all three of them. Luffy, who had looked particularly terrified that Marco had grabbed his arm, looked even more scared after hearing those words, pulling his arm closer to his side, Marco having let it go by now. Ace and Sabo almost froze in shock, realizing now exactly what had happened. They rushed forward toward Luffy, putting him in between them once more as they tucked their own arm a bit closer to their sides. Marco had covered Luffy's tattoo from the Marine, who would have surely seen it had Marco let the boy continue with what he had been doing. Izo was following behind them, and for once they didn't care, as long as they got away from the Marine. They were silent again, and Ace and Sabo were silently cursing themselves, mad that they hadn't been paying as much attention as they should have. Of course, there would be Marines here, ones that probably knew to look out for children with numbers on their wrists, and they were walking around showing theirs off to the whole world. Sabo risked a quick glance behind him, catching sight of the familiar white and blue outfit that indicated a Marine, and quickly looked forward again, biting the inside of his cheek, as he felt the anxiety begin to well up inside him. Luffy, already shaken from Marco's sudden contact, was even more shaken by the close proximity they were in to the Marine, wanting more than anything to go hide in their room back on the Moby, or near the giant captain, the one who always had so much warmth radiating from him. Instead, he grabbed onto Ace and Sabo's hands, pulling them close to him so he could feel their arms on his, using the contact to ground himself, to feel safer. Ace was trying to look anywhere but behind him, not wanting to look at the Marine and risk gaining their attention, but wanting to know how close they were, if they were already looking at him and his brothers, wanting to see where they were headed. Were they going to follow them? Would they turn off towards another section of town? Had he already seen their tattoos? Ace bristled at the thought, clenching his fists tightly, his fingernails digging into his palm to the point that they were nearly drawing blood. He forced himself to keep his eyes straight ahead, forced himself to follow the first commander who was definitely high up on his suspicion list. Even though the man had only been doing it to help the brothers, it was still off-putting that he had so quickly grabbed Luffy, and could have hurt him in the few seconds that Ace and Sabo hadn't reacted. They had gotten lucky, and next time someone grabbed Luffy like that, it probably wasn't going to be with good intentions. Next time they would have to be more prepared, they couldn't risk letting their guard down like they had in the town. They had gotten too comfortable, forgotten about the dangers that surrounded them at every turn, too excited about the prospect of finally being alone for a bit after all of this. With those thoughts in mind, the brothers followed Marco as he led them back through the town, using different turns to get them back to where they needed to be without going by the Marine. Now that they knew they weren't near a Marine, the three calmed slightly, but they were nowhere near back to being as relaxed as they had been previously, and they didn't think they would. Anything else we'll need will be in here, Yoi, Marco said eventually as they finally reached the shop they needed. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy nodded mutely, following him inside and grabbing things almost mechanically, not really paying much attention to the items like they would normally. They couldn't help but focus on everyone around them, waiting for the next attack, waiting for someone to make their move, for Marines to come swarming in. Apparently, they had gotten everything they needed because before they knew it they were walking up to the cashier, Marco paying for their things and Sabo grabbing the bags. The group left the shop and began making their way back to the Moby to put their things away. After we get your things back you're free to roam the island if you would like, but be careful you three, we don't want the Marines spotting you, Aizo said, worry evident on his face as he spoke, concerned for the three. Sabo nodded, barely listening as he focused more on their surroundings, wanting to be ready for anything. Aizo sighed, noticing the lack of attention, the trio still looking a bit shaken up. Aizo couldn't blame them, they had only just gotten out of that facility, and they were already being faced with people who wanted to send them back. No matter the fact that he, and everyone else on the Moby, knew nothing about their past, they knew it was bad. Marco was feeling the same, but he also felt a bit bad that he had startled the brothers in the first place. He hadn't noticed the Marine coming until it was too late, and in an effort to keep the boys safe, he had to grab the youngest's arm to keep them from being caught, but as a result, it had put the brothers on edge. It was better for them to be mad at him than for the Marine to spot them, but it was a bit disappointing after they had all been trying their best to show the brothers that they could trust the Whitebeards, and he had gone and nearly ruined it if he hadn't already. Once they reached the ship the trio made a beeline for their room, bags in hand as they did, while Aizo and Marco went to Whitebeard to tell him about what happened. They didn't know if the brothers would still be going out to the island after this, but it might be a good idea to have someone go with them just in case. Welcome back my sons, how was your outing? Whitebeard asked as he saw the two commanders walking up to him. Aizo sighed, rubbing the back of his head. Well, it could have been better, Aizo admitted, Whitebeard raising an eyebrow. Oh? Did something happen? Whitebeard asked. We almost ran into a Marine, Yoi, Marco explained, sighing as well. Whitebeard frowned in understanding. How are the brats? The captain asked, concerned for the three he had taken in. Aizo tilted his head, turning to look at the door leading to the boys' room. I think they're still a bit shaken up. Marco scared him a bit too, Aizo said, glancing at the commander. Even though he understood why Marco did it, he knew that it had caused the boys a bit of extra stress. The Marine would have seen Luffy's tattoo, so I had to grab his wrist to stop him, Yuri. The brothers didn't know there was a Marine though, and probably thought the worst. Marco said in response to his captain's raised eyebrow. Before Whitebeard could respond though the door was opening, and the brothers were walking out, as silent as ever, walking over to the gangplank and making their way back onto the island. I thought for sure they wouldn't want to go back onto the island, Aizo mumbled quietly as he watched the three walk towards the forest rather than the town. Should I go after them Oyaji, Yuri? Marco asked, also watching the three leave. Whitebeard was silent for a second but shook his head. Leave them be for now. If they're not back in an hour go check on them and make sure they haven't been harmed, Whitebeard said, concerned for the brothers' safety, but not wanting to force them to have a guard with them everywhere they went. It seemed that after the outing today whatever progress the pirates had made had gone back down again. Whitebeard grinned. It was one step forward and two steps back with these brothers. Finally, it feels like I can breathe again. Ace sighed, shoulders relaxing as the tree surrounded them on all sides, not sensing anyone near them with his haki. They were finally alone. Look at how tall the trees are. Luffy said in amazement, also feeling more relaxed now that there was no one around to hurt him or his brothers. It's almost like the jungle back home, Sabo said as he looked around, having the urge to go jumping through the trees like they had done so long ago. They may not be kids anymore on their home island, but they still enjoyed running around and being free like they had back then. Ace, Sabo, I bet I can beat you in a race to the cliff. Luffy suddenly said, smiling brightly as he looked off in a direction. Ace looked as well, his enhanced eyesight allowing him to see the cliff Luffy was talking about, confusing him. How did you know there was a cliff there? Ace asked, wondering if Luffy had more powers than he was letting them in on. Luffy's smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew. I can smell the ocean. Luffy explained, but that didn't really answer the question. Luffy, it's an island, there's water all around us, Sabo said, also curious now. Luffy laughed, running off without giving an answer. I'm gonna beat you too if you don't hurry. Luffy cheered, Ace and Sabo glancing each other for a second before smiling. As if. Ace shouted, taking off after the youngest. Like you could beat us, Luffy. Sabo teased, also running after his brothers. The two oldest easily made their way past the youngest, but Luffy merely laughed loudly, charging after them. The three continued laughing loudly their entire way to the cliff, their previously bad mood gone completely, replaced with only happiness, joy, freedom. As they ran out from the tree line they slowed down, coming to a stop at the cliff's edge, looking out at the beauty of the water expanding across the horizon. Even though they were being chased down by marines, even though so many bad things had happened to them in the past 7 years, even though they would be scarred for life, there was one thing that made it all better, one thing that made it seem like, even though all of those things had happened, it would still be okay. Ace, Sabo? Luffy asked softly, holding onto his hat as he looked up at the sky. His brothers turned to look at him, humming in question. Luffy's small smile grew into a wide toothy grin. I like being free. Chapter 38. Darkness detected. Well, it was fun while it lasted. Ace said mournfully as he and his brothers watched the island they had been on yesterday slowly drifting away from them. Sabo and Luffy nodded in agreement, already wanting to be back in the forest running through the trees and sparring with each other freely. Hopefully the next island we go to will have another forest like that, Sabo said wistfully, his head resting on his arms as he leaned over the tall wall-like railing that lined the Moby Dick. And more meat. Luffy moaned, frowning. Ace and Sabo rolled their eyes at that, shaking their heads at Luffy's simple-mindedness. They watched on in silence as the island slowly became smaller and smaller in the distance, until Sabo and Luffy couldn't see it anymore. It was just after breakfast now and the brothers were back to doing nothing. They still didn't have to do chores for another few weeks, and they had no clue when they would be reaching the next island. Marco had told them that they were heading back to the New World now, but they didn't know how long it would take to get there. Sitting on the railing was quickly becoming a usual pastime for the three, having nothing better to do than that. Even though they were bored, they were okay with that, because it meant that they weren't back in the facility, fighting every day to survive. At least here, they could sit in relative peace, even if the mass of pirates around them still put them on edge. Hey there. Thatch's voice made Sabo turn, noticing once again that Ace had fallen to another narcolepsy attack. Putting on a smile, Sabo looked at the man, trying his best to look as friendly as possible. Hello, Thatch. Sabo greeted back, Luffy turning around now as well, so he could also watch the man. The chef walked a bit closer, stopping before he was too close for comfort, and began speaking. I was wondering if you three would like to go. Thatch was cut off when the ship hit a particularly rough wave, everyone losing their balance briefly because of it. The jostle must have woken Ace up because the eldest grumbled and sat up, looking around in a daze, but Sabo couldn't even begin to explain to him what was happening, because suddenly, Luffy was falling. 1 second the boy was at his side, holding onto the railing tightly, and the next he was falling backward, a small leap leaving the boy's mouth as he did. Luffy? Sabo called out, eyes wide as he turned to see the youngest splashing into the ocean. Ace flew up from where he had been laying, standing beside Sabo and peering over the railing to look for his brother. Sabo had to place a hand on the eldest's shoulder to keep him from jumping in after him. Man overboard. They vaguely heard one of the pirates call the words out, more preoccupied with looking for their brother. Do you see him? Sabo asked Ace, looking frantically around in the waves. He's trying to swim up. Ace replied, gripping the railing tightly as he watched through the water, watched Luffy begin struggling to the surface, all those tests in the water finally coming in somewhat handy. He'll be fine, don't worry, Namor's already gone after him. Thatch tried to say soothingly, but even the chef looked a bit worried. Can he swim, Yuri? Marco asked, coming up as well, shocking the brothers a bit. The attention was all on them again with this new development, but they tried to ignore it. Before Ace could spit something out at the commander, Sabo answered, trying his best to sound calm, even if he looked anything but. Not very well, we didn't have much time to practice, Sabo said through gritted teeth. Luffy? Ace's shout cut off any more conversation between Sabo and Marco, the blonde brother spinning quickly to see Luffy's head poking up out of the water, a wave immediately crashing back over him though. Luffy was very obviously struggling, and his brothers could see the terror in his eyes. At least he was above the water though. They could see Namor now, closing in on Luffy until he finally reached him, pulling the small boy along with him now, back to the ship. Someone threw the rope ladder down for them, and Ace and Sabo rushed over to it, watching anxiously as the fishermen carried Luffy back up to them. They would have to hurry back to their room to keep anyone from seeing how weak the water made Luffy. Sure, they had already waved off any doubts of devil fruits, especially since they had all just seen Luffy very clearly treading water rather than sinking, but they didn't need anyone having doubts for any reason, or even send nurses at them. Luffy, Ace and Sabo said in relief, retrieving their brother from the fisherman's arms and hugging him close. Thank you Mr. Namor, for retrieving our brother, Sabo said gratefully, Ace already ushering Luffy away to their room. There was no problem, Sabo, really. And just Namor is fine. Namor said, Sabo nodding before running off after Ace and Luffy, leaving the pirates to watch after them. Man, I thought I could finally talk to them. Thatch whined as he watched the brothers scurry off to their room, probably for the rest of the morning. Marco shook his head. I'm sure you'll find a time to talk, Thatch, Marco said, patting the chef on the back as he passed by him, on his way back to Pops. Yeah, besides, you've had tons of chances, you normally just blow 'em, Namor said, shaking the water off of himself as he spoke. Thatch pouted. Like when you had a one-sided conversation with yourself instead of letting them talk. Someone piped up, Thatch's pout intensifying. Hey, I was just trying to keep them comfortable. They don't like talking all the time, so I thought I'd do all the talking for them. Thatch defended, crossing his arms. Some laughed, Namor shaking his head with a smile and walking away. You alright, Lou? Sabo asked gently, using a towel to wipe off every drop of water he could find on the youngest's body. Luffy nodded a bit sluggishly, frown on his face. Thoughts of the facility were rushing through his brain, remembering all the times they dunked him underwater, draining his strength, forcing him to hold his breath, forcing him to move his heavy limbs. Ace frowned, noticing Luffy was shivering a bit, and moved closer, heating his body temperature up a bit to warm his brother. You did good, Lou. On the bright side, none of those pirates'll be expecting you to have a devil fruit now. Ace said with a grin, ruffling Luffy's hair, gaining a small smile in response. That's right, if anyone was suspicious they definitely aren't now, not after seeing you swim to the surface, Sabo said, setting the towel aside and picking up Luffy's wet clothes, placing them on the towel. Now that Luffy was dry and warming up, Sabo sighed, glancing at the door. Why don't we relax here until lunch? Sabo asked, turning to face Luffy. The boy nodded a bit sluggishly, leaning into Ace more and closing his eyes. Taking that as a cue that he was tired, Ace maneuvered them so they were laying down comfortably, Sabo joining soon after. Pops. Marco greeted as he came to stand by Whitebeard's chair, turning to face his many brothers out on the deck, many mingling or doing chores. Seeing as they were still in paradise, there was little they had to worry about, giving them all a lot of downtime. Son, what have you come to talk about? Whitebeard asked, knowing that something was on his first mate's mind. Marco was quiet a moment, seeming to think about whatever it was he was going to say before he spoke. I was thinking, Yoi, the brothers, they do a lot of tapping. Marco started, Whitebeard raising an eyebrow in confusion. Oh? And why do you think that is? Whitebeard asked, having a feeling Marco was having trouble distinguishing why that was himself. At first I thought it was a nervous tic, or a habit, Yoi, Marco said, Whitebeard nodding in understanding. But now you think differently? Whitebeard asked. Again, Marco went silent, thinking things over again. Before, when I saw them tapping, it looked like there was no pattern, like they didn't notice they were doing it in the first place, but then I started to realize that the taps seemed a bit deliberate, Yoi. Not only that, but when one stops tapping another starts, almost like they can't sit without tapping. Marco explained, his thoughts and theories running through his head. Any ideas as to why that might be? Whitebeard asked, encouraging his son to sort out his thoughts. Not anything that I can come up with right now, Yuri. I just thought you'd like to know. Marco said with a hint of a sigh, as if he was annoyed with himself for not having figured out one of the many mysteries surrounding the brothers. Whatever it is, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Either way though, keep an eye on them. After the littlest brat's dip in the water, they seemed a bit more skittish. We want them to be comfortable here. Whitebeard said with a bit of a sigh, looking to the door that led to the brothers' room. Marco nodded, crossing his arms as he scanned the deck. I think some will start getting frustrated soon with how closed off the brothers are. I'll try and calm them down though, Yuri. Marco said, knowing that there were more than a few of his brothers that were starting to get annoyed, that the brothers weren't being as receptive to their attempts at friendly conversation as they would like. Good. Try and get them to understand that those three have been through a lot. Sometimes your brothers can be a bit hard-headed. Whitebeard said with a fond smile, glancing to a few of his sons, that he knew to be just that. Marco huffed a small laugh out, uncrossing his arms and standing straighter, smile on his face. You've definitely got that right, Pops, Yoi, Marco said, walking off to get started on some more paperwork he had gotten earlier. He could hear Whitebeard laugh loudly behind him. Come on you two, lunch is ready. Sabo groaned out a bit groggily. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, especially when Ace and Luffy were already sleeping. But at some point when listening to a few pirates drone on and on about barrels, they had to move from the upper deck to the lower where he had fallen asleep. Giving Luffy another shake, the youngest's eyes crunched up a bit before he was blinking them open, grumbling. The same happened with Ace, and Sabo yawned, sitting back and trying to wake up. Food? Ace mumbled out, sitting up and wiping the crud from his eyes. Sabo nodded, getting out of the bed and standing. From the sounds of it, yeah. Pretty sure we're actually a bit late. Sabo said, listening in and noticing he couldn't hear a single person out on deck, only those in the crow's nest. FOOD, Luffy groaned out, getting out of bed in a zombie-like manner, and stumbling a bit on his way to the door. Sabo chuckled quietly, catching his brother before he could face plant onto the floor after tripping over his own feet. Calm down, Lu, I'm sure there'll still be some when we get there. Wake up a bit, you don't want to get overwhelmed suddenly when you walk in. Sabo said, knowing that, for all of them, their senses were more sensitive after just waking up, making it easier for them to be overwhelmed. But I am awake. Luffy whined, rubbing his eyes and pouting, trying to put on his best awake face. Sabo smiled, ruffling his hair. Yeah, and Ace isn't narcoleptic. Sabo teased, Ace shouting a hey. From where he was sitting on the bed and Luffy's pout deepening. Anyways, Thatch is apparently a bit overwhelmed in the kitchen right now. Seems a few of the chefs are sick with the flu at the moment, so it's probably a good thing we're not there right now. Sabo said as he listened in, noticing how rushed the chef sounded, though, to the man's credit, he wasn't complaining. But I'm hungry, Luffy whined again, waiting by the door as he complained. Sabo sighed at his brother's impatience. Don't worry, Lu, we'll still eat, Sabo said as Ace stood up behind him, more awake now than he had been. Doing a quick once-over of Luffy showed that he was awake now as well, to which Sabo deemed it acceptable for them to leave their room. Come on, we can head there now, Sabo said, Luffy beaming happily and flinging the door open, waiting for his brothers before he went any further. The walk to the galley was made silently, and Luffy's enthusiasm quickly dimmed down as they got closer to the crowded room, remembering just how many people were in there. They finally reached the doors, Ace pushing them opening and scanning the room quickly as they walked in. Not many looked up to see them, most having gotten over the phase of staring at the brothers wherever they went, but there was still the few that glanced up to watch them, only to turn back to their friends after a second. There you boys are, I was beginning to think you weren't gonna show up, Rikuo said with a pleasant smile, waving to the brothers as they sat down. Sabo smiled back politely. Sorry, we decided to take a nap and didn't get up until a few minutes ago. Sabo apologized easily, leaving his smile on his face. Rikuo waved it off. Don't worry about it. Rest was probably a good thing after your brother's dip in the water, we don't want him catching a cold. Rikuo said with concern, and Sabo wondered if it was genuine. A quick nudge to Luffy and he was quickly given confirmation that the man's words were indeed genuine, making Sabo wonder. That we wouldn't. Sabo agreed, Rikuo smiling as the conversation between them ended. Even if you had been here on time it wouldn't have made a difference anyway, Atmos stated from where he sat, hat in hand. Sabo raised an eyebrow at that, putting on a face of confusion. Oh? Why is that? He asked, noticing that Luffy, who had been listening for a minute after Sabo had nudged him, was now more focused on something else. Probably trying to sense more feelings. Seems some of the chefs caught the flu. Poor Thatch is working his butt off back there so lunch is a bit delayed. Blenheim said, and Sabo had to act as if this was new information. That's too bad, I hope they get better soon. Anyways, we don't mind waiting. Sabo said, knowing full well that Luffy did indeed mind waiting. With that conversation over as well, Sabo focused more on the conversations already being had by the other commanders at the table. Marco and Aiza were absent, but other than that everyone else was there, even Whitebeard. I'm adding in another 100 on my bet that it'll take a month, Juro said, sliding some money over to Haruta who happily pocketed the money. No way, did you see how mad Marco was? He's totally about to burst, 2 on mine that it'll happen by the end of Friday this week, Vista said confidently, also sliding money Haruta's way. You guys are idiots. If Marco ever finds out about this you're all going down. Namor said, shaking his head, arms crossed. Yeah, but Marco won't find out if no one says anything, Haruta said happily, smiling cheerfully to the fisherman who merely rolled his eyes. Whitebeard laughed from his end of the table, watching the commanders the entire time. Still, I can't believe you've delayed Thatch from putting those poles away for this long, in just another, little over a week, it'll have been an entire month. Curiel said with slight amazement to his tone. This had Haruta puffing his chest out proudly, but whatever he said next was ignored by Sabo, his attention was quickly drawn to Luffy. Ace looked as well, also having caught the slight shiver that had run through Luffy just a second ago. What's wrong, Lu? Ace quickly tapped out, glancing around quickly to make sure no one was watching them. Luffy frowned deeply, eyebrows scrunching up in confusion. Luffy? Sabo tried when the boy didn't respond. Luffy glanced to Ace, and then to Sabo before looking down at the table. I thought I felt the darkness. Luffy tapped a bit slowly. That was enough for Ace and Sabo to go rigid, both of them ready to jump ship that second. Even though Sabo had always tried to drill into Ace that they couldn't just go off on their own without supplies, he was ready to do exactly that. As someone on this ship had the darkness, they were no longer safe, especially not when they knew Marines were looking for them, and would probably send them right back to another facility if they had the chance. Before either Ace or Sabo could grab Luffy and run though, Luffy elaborated. I thought I felt it, but after a minute it was gone, and it was really faint. Luffy said, though he looked a bit confused. Ace and Sabo were also confused now too. As far as they knew, you couldn't just hide a feeling, especially if that feeling was darkness, so how had the feeling disappeared? They were on a ship in the middle of the ocean. If someone with the darkness had been here, they wouldn't have gone out of Luffy's range that quickly. What do you mean it was faint? Ace asked, thinking that, maybe, if the feeling was barely a feeling at all, it had gone away naturally. Luffy's frown deepened further if possible, and he looked even more confused. I don't know, it was like the person had lots of darkness, but it was muffled like they weren't here, but they were cause I was feeling the darkness. Luffy tapped out. The rigidness left Ace and Sabo slowly with the news that the threat, most likely, wasn't on board still, and even if they were, the feeling was gone. That didn't mean that they weren't going to be on extra guard now though. Well, for now, let's just be extra cautious, and Luffy, double-check the commanders again, make sure that it wasn't coming from any of them. Sabo tapped. Luffy nodded and the brothers returned to their normal formation to keep guard, Sabo trying his best to tune back into the commander's conversations, while trying to ignore the new thoughts buzzing inside his head. It was at this point that Thatch was coming out with plates on a platter, looking a little more than tired. Alright everyone, lunch is ready, get in line. Thatch called out, the pirates cheering at the announcement, tables standing and heading over to where the brothers assumed the food was. Thatch walked over to them, the commanders getting up and leaving as well. And for you three, here's your meals. Thatch said with a tired smile, placing their food in front of them, also moving to hand Whitebeard his own as well. Thank you, Thatch, but you didn't have to bring us our food. We could have gone and gotten it ourselves if it made it easier, Sabo said, not wanting to be a burden. He didn't want the tipping point for the pirates to be the fact that they ate so much. No, it's fine, really, it's just that 2 chefs aren't enough to make all these people food in a timely manner, without any of us feeling the effects. Thatch said with a sigh, sitting down heavily on the bench and pulling out a cigarette. If you need some help, I'm sure some of your brothers wouldn't mind helping, Whitebeard said with a soft smile, glancing around the lively galley. Thatch sighed. Last time we got help from someone outside my division, Hayden nearly lost a finger, and we were set back even further when Pete started a fire. Thatch said with a shake of his head. It's a shame most of your division is gone on a mission. Whitebeard said sympathetically. But well, hopefully, the others will feel better tomorrow and can help out again. For now, I've gotta head back and get started on dinner, maybe it'll be done on time. Thatch said, begrudgingly standing up. It was good seeing you three. Thatch ended with a wave, yawning as he headed to the kitchen. By this point, many of the commanders were returning with plates of food, the other pirates settling down as well. So Pops, where are Marco and Izo at? Fasa asked as he sat down. Sabo glanced at his brothers to check the progress they had made on their food so far, before turning back to the conversation. They're checking in on your brothers who are on missions, Whitebeard answered, taking a bite of his own food. Shouldn't a few of them be back soon? The commander asked, thinking back to something. Whitebeard nodded. A few, yes. We'll be meeting with some once we get back to the New World as well, Whitebeard explained, Fawcett nodding in understanding. The doors opened, Sabo only noticing because Ace's eyes flicked over to them, and he saw Marco and Izo walk in, both of them talking to each other. Tuning out of the commander's conversations, Sabo quickly tuned in to the pair talking, curious as to what they could be speaking about. Thatch's division said they would be heading back here next week. They just reached the island they were sent to check up on, Izo said as he picked at his nails for a second. Marco nodded. Good, Pops was hoping they would make it there within this week. Ryan's group should be here by tomorrow at the latest. Teachers should be back within a few days as well, Marco replied, the two of them finally reaching the table and sitting down. Hey Marco, Izo, welcome to lunch. Haruta greeted cheerily, and Sabo assumed the topic of Thatch's fishing poles had once again been brought up by how suspiciously normal Haruta was trying to act. Sabo didn't ponder on that though, as he noticed Ace and Luffy were finishing up their lunches. With that observation, Sabo quickly finished his own, the three of them standing in sync and making their way out of the room quickly, before anyone could stop or notice them. No one was out on deck yet, only the brothers, so they didn't bother to head straight to the railing like they usually would. Luffy, do you know where you might have felt the darkness? Ace asked. Sabo gave Ace a confused look, not quite sure what he was planning. Noticing the look, Ace frowned. What? If someone had the darkness, we should go check it out. Besides, no one's out here right now besides those guys in the crow's nest, but they're not even looking at us. Now's the perfect time to go snooping. Ace tapped out as if it were the obvious next step. Sabo sighed but didn't have time to explain to Ace what a bad idea that was before Luffy was answering. I don't know, it was really hard to feel, but I think it came from over there. Luffy said, pointing to the door that lead to one of the many hallways inside the Mobi. Great, let's go. Ace said, already stalking his way to the door. Although Sabo also wanted to know where the feeling had come from, he couldn't help but feel that, if they were caught snooping, this would only do more harm than good for the brothers. Regardless, he followed his brother who was suddenly filled with the determination Sabo had only seen when they were escaping the facility. Luffy was beside Ace, holding on to the eldest's hand as he guided them to where he had felt the darkness. I don't know where it was after this, Luffy said, stopping them at the end of the hallway they had been walking down. There were 3 doors that they could go through, one in front of them and one on their left and right. So whoever had a bad feeling was in one of these rooms then, Ace said, glancing at the doors. Ace, not that I want to throw a wrench in this plan of yours, but the pirates are finishing lunch, and I don't think they'll especially like that we're here, Sabo said, hearing the footsteps of pirates leaving the galley, making their way on deck. Well, are any coming this way? Ace asked, arms folded over his chest. Another quick listen told Sabo that, no, so far no one was heading their way. No, but then I'm checking out these rooms. If someone starts coming, we'll leave. Ace tapped dismissively, grabbing the handle of the door in front of them and pushing his way in. Ace? Sabo hissed angrily but followed nonetheless. His brother may be an idiot, but he wasn't going to leave him behind for that idiocy. Luffy was seeming to understand just what trouble they could get into for doing this, the youngest shifting around nervously as he glanced around the room. What about your rules? Remember one of the big ones, don't do anything to make them turn on us. I would say this violates that rule big time. Sabo hissed as quietly as he could manage with how angry and nervous he was. He had his hearing focused on every single step he could manage, praying one of them wouldn't start heading their way. The darkness from all those rules, Ace muttered as he shuffled through papers on the desk in the room. Wherever they were it seemed to be almost like an office, or filing room. There was a desk that was littered with papers and bookcases all around, files and books all over. The glance told Sabo that this was probably where the Whitebeards kept all their important information, and that only made this all the more dangerous. I don't think you understand, Ace, darkness or not, if they find us in here they're kicking us off for sure. These pirates have hockey, Ace, they don't need to see where we are to know we're in here, Sabo said, practically seething as he couldn't get through to the hothead. Ace was frowning, but Sabo had a feeling it wasn't because of him, rather he probably couldn't find anything. Ace? What are you even looking for? Sabo asked, ready to drag his brother out. Calm down, Sabo, I'm just looking for anything that might show they were calling the Marines. Ace hissed, his own annoyance raising. Luffy, who was in this room last? Ace asked, getting the smallest attention. Luffy, who had been fidgeting quietly, sniffed the air for a second. Lot of the commandeers, Luffy said hesitantly. Ace scowled as he moved to the bookcases, skimming over folders and books quickly. It's Commanders Luffy, and you Ace, let's just go, there's nothing here, Sabo said, almost mindlessly correcting Luffy's mistaken words. You're right. Let's try the next room, Ace said, leaving the room they were in and heading to the one that had been on their left. No, that's not what I meant. Ugh. Ace, Sabo said, barely containing the shout he so desperately wanted to release. Once again, Ace ignored him, making his way into the new room, Sabo making sure to close the previous door shut before following. Man, nothing in here but stupid snails, Ace muttered as he glanced around the room. It only had a big table with chairs all around it, and multiple transponder snails in the middle of the table. Great, can we go now? Sabo asked, grabbing Ace's sleeve before the teen could head to the next room. No, there's still one more. SSH. Someone's heading this way, Sabo said, eyes going wide as he slapped a hand on Ace's mouth. Ace glared at him but fell silent, the brothers quietly leaving the room and shutting the door. What do we do? Luffy asked, and already Sabo could see the terror in his eyes. Don't worry, just follow me. Sabo tapped back as he waited for the footsteps to get a bit closer. He had been too caught up in trying to leave that he had missed Vista's steps heading their way. Once he deemed the commander close enough, Sabo walked down the hallway to the intersection the Vista was coming up to. I told you we should have finished that tour with Izo, now we're lost, Sabo said, doing his best to use how annoyed and angry he was with Ace to his advantage. Catching on quickly, Ace scowled at him. It's not my fault, how was I supposed to know how big this ship was? Ace asked grumpily, arms once again crossed over his chest. Luffy stood silently between his brothers, knowing that they had things under control now, the tension quickly leaving him. There you boys are. His words had the brothers turning to look at the approaching man, Sabo quickly slipping a smile onto his face. Ah, Vista, it's a good thing you found us, we got a bit lost, Sabo said, laughing sheepishly and rubbing the back of his head, hoping the act was believable. Vista smiled and laughed, making Sabo believe it had worked well enough. We thought you had taken another swim. It's a good thing Marco sensed you before anyone could go into too much of a panic, Vista said with another laugh, Sabo laughing along as well. We're sorry to have worried you, but would you mind showing us the way back to the deck? Ace thought he knew the way to a closer bathroom, and ended up getting us lost on the way back. Sabo explained, sending Ace a smile while the eldest glared back. No problem, just follow me. I'm not surprised you got lost, these halls can be a bit confusing. The mustached commander said, turning and heading back towards where the deck was. Thank you. Chapter 39. Surprise attack suck. I don't know why you're still mad, we didn't get caught so everything's fine. Ace tapped from where he pretended to sleep against the railing. Sabo, who definitely wasn't scowling at the ocean, gripped the railing just a bit tighter in his hand. I'm not mad. The blonde tapped out indignantly. Ace nearly scoffed. Luffy? He's mad. Sabo glared at the youngest, but Luffy merely smiled back sheepishly. It was almost an hour after Ace had gone searching for the wherever the dark feeling had come from. Sabo had managed to put up a convincing act, and told everyone that asked that they had just gotten lost on their way back from the bathroom, and the pirates seemed to accept it. But that didn't mean the anger had gone yet. If you had listened to me we wouldn't have been nearly caught in the first place. Sabo tapped out, Ace rolling his partially opened eyes. We can't just ignore someone with the dark feeling. Ace defended, skimming his eyes across the deck for anyone who might be watching them too closely. We weren't going to ignore it, but going through the Whitebeard's information was too dangerous. We can't be doing things like that here. Sabo argued, and boy was he trying to calm the anger bubbling in his chest, with how stubborn his brother was being. He didn't want Luffy getting angry because of him. How else would we figure anything out? We can't exactly ask around if someone was feeling some especially dark thoughts. Ace replied. Sabo knew that Ace was right about that, but still, the freckled teen hadn't gone about things the right way. Okay, fine, for the sake of keeping Luffy from getting influenced I'll forgive you, but next time talk about the plan before putting it into action. Sabo tapped out sternly, Ace nodding minutely behind him. Fine. Lou, how are you feeling? Ace asked the semi-argument over. Luffy looked across the horizon, a small smile on his face. Good. I'm using the warmth from Big Mustache Captain to keep the anger out. Luffy explained, kicking his legs carelessly over the railing. Even though they were more careful about falling and that didn't stop them from sitting on the railing. As long as you don't take too much of it in, alright. Sabo said, Luffy nodding in agreement. The blonde sighed and focused more on the sounds around them, the brothers' conversation dropping off. Luffy was trying to look out for anyone with the darkness, feeling slightly responsible for what had happened after lunch, because he didn't know where the feeling had come from. He had never felt someone's darkness just disappear like that, and he'd never felt such a weak darkness too, like the person was far away, but how far could the person get when they were in the middle of the ocean? It was in the middle of this thought that suddenly, everyone, even the pirates, well those who were proficient in hockey, sensed the incoming danger. It was so fast that no one really had time to react, but they all knew exactly where this danger was heading, and that was right for Luffy. Luffy's eyes widened and suddenly everything was moving in slow motion. He could see Sabo's eyes going wide beside him, could hear him shouting his name, he could hear the pirates running over, he could hear Ace getting up, also shouting his name, and then he felt weightless. It had all happened so fast, yet so slow, and still, Luffy had no clue what really had happened. 1 second he was on the railing, that he knew for fact, but then he had somehow managed to get onto the deck floor, where Ace had been, and there was more shouting, still from Sabo. But this time it wasn't his name. A bit disoriented, Luffy looked over to where he had been seconds before, and only saw Ace's back. That was weird, when had Ace gotten in front of him? And what was falling onto the ground? Luffy's blood ran cold, his eyes widening now too, his breath hitching in his throat, as he slowly realized what was on the ground, and who it belonged to. In seconds Ace was falling to his knees, and Luffy could now clearly see the giant slash down the front of his chest, a diagonal cut that went from his right shoulder to his left hip. It was long, it was deep, and it was bleeding heavily. Ace, Luffy stuttered, quickly crawling forward to his brother and catching him before he fell fully. Ace. He heard Sabo shout from beside him, saw the blonde leap off the railing and join his side, examining the deep wound. He had removed Ace's yellow unbuttoned shirt quickly, showing off the wound fully now. Luffy could feel bad feelings beginning to surround them and looked up, finding who he assumed to be the one responsible for hurting Ace, the one who, had Ace not stopped him, would have hurt him instead. Right beside the Moby, in the ocean Sabo and Luffy had been looking at, there was another ship, not as big as the Moby but still pretty big, and it was filled with mean-looking people, all staring right at them. How had that gotten there? Someone call whiskey, all men on deck now, Yuri. Marco's shouting was heard behind him, and suddenly the fighting began. Ace, wake up. Sabo was pleading with Ace, slapping his cheek as he began wadding the yellow shirt into a bowl, and doing his best to cover the wound. Luffy, come hold this down, put pressure on it, okay? Sabo said, and Luffy was overwhelmed with the worry coming from Sabo. Trying to stop the tears he knew were already falling, Luffy nodded, shuffling so he was on Ace's other side rather than at his head, and leaning over his brother, applying pressure like Sabo had instructed him to. Sabo, his waves getting harder to see. Luffy cried, watching as the once bright deep red wave that connected to Ace started becoming wispy and translucent. This seemed to worry Sabo more as his attempts at waking Ace became more frantic. In the middle of him trying those, Sabo suddenly shot up, jumping over Ace and hitting something behind Luffy. Turning, Luffy saw that it was one of the rival pirates, at least that's what Luffy was assuming they were, that had been attempting to attack Luffy. Sabo had kicked the man in the chest, sending him stumbling back and onto the ground, while Sabo glared daggers at the man. "Don't you dare try and hurt my brother," Sabo hissed out angrily. Luffy was about to turn when he felt another presence getting closer once more, another one with hostile intent. Luffy felt completely useless, everything happening so fast. A pit formed in Luffy's stomach as he realized who the target was for the next attack, this one being the downed Ace. A strangled cry left him as he did his best to shield his fallen brother from whatever was to come, but it never came. Instead, a flash of blue came, a coolness surrounding him. Looking up, Luffy saw Marco shielding him and Ace from the incoming attack, his arms covered in blue flames and looking like wings. The youngest couldn't see the commander's face, but he could feel the anger rolling off him like a gas. "People like you make me sick, Yori," Marco spat out before swinging his leg into the air and kicking the man across the deck. Luffy watched with wide eyes, Marco turning to face him. "You alright, Yori?" Marco asked, the anger instantly gone and replaced with worry. Mindlessly Luffy nodded, Sabo running back to his side. "Enough." Whitebeard's booming voice caught everyone's attention, the giant captain now standing with a glare on his face as his eyes roamed across the deck. "You pirates are the worst kind, attacking down men. If it was a fight you wanted with me, then it's a fight you'll get." Some of the rival pirates looked ready to charge the man, while most looked terrified as they realized just what they'd gotten themselves into. Nobody could move though as Whitebeard sent out a wave of haki, knocking almost all of the pirates out beside one seemingly the captain. "Now get lost, you damn brat," Whitebeard growled, swinging his Bacento into the captain and his crew member, sending them both flying back to their own ship. Cheers erupted from the Whitebeards at the victory, some beginning to throw the downed rivals back to their ship, while others began cleaning up the blood and discarded weapons. A few left to get the nurses and a couple began pulling any wounded, which wasn't much, over to the side and out of the way while the commanders headed their way. "Ooh, that looks nasty," Haruto said with a wince as he saw Ace's wound. Luffy, still slightly in shock of everything, remembered the wound he was supposed to be putting pressure to, and immediately placed his hands firmly onto the previously yellow shirt, now completely covered in the red blood. "Haruto," Aizo hissed, nudging Haruto with his elbow. "Ah, sorry, I'm sure Whiskey and the others will be able to patch it up easy," Haruto said apologetically. Luffy's lip was trembling, he knew that, and the tears were coming again, because Ace was hurt because of him, and now his brother would have to go with the nurses again, and Ace's wave was getting harder to see, and it was almost as bad as when Ace had been in a coma. "Luffy," Sabo said softly, putting a hand on the youngest shoulder. The straw-hatted boy refused to look up, eyes narrowed and focused on Ace's wound, when that wasn't getting better, even with the eldest's fast recovery rate. "Luffy, listen," Sabo said again, this time a little louder. Looking over to Sabo a bit grudgingly, he waited to hear what Sabo would say. "Why don't you go get cleaned up? I'll stay here with Ace and make sure he gets help," Sabo said, glancing quickly to Ace as he said the words. There was no way he wanted to send Ace to the nurses, but this wasn't just something they could play off, it wasn't something they could just say, "Oops, he got a little scratched up, he'll be fine after a nap." They would have to get the nurses help, and Sabo really wasn't looking forward to that. Luffy was already a mess, the boy didn't need to see his seriously injured brother get carried away by people he didn't trust, and leave them to save his brother's life. "No. I wanna stay with Ace," Luffy shouted, drawing more attention to them. Sabo sighed, trying to bury his worry and send Luffy feelings of warmth. "Don't worry, Lou, I'll handle this, really, trust me. Besides, what would Ace say about our baby brother worrying about him?" Sabo asked, trying to force a smile to his lips. Luffy's lip trembled a bit more, but he regretfully nodded, slowly letting his hands release the pressure on the wound, seeing they were drenched in blood. "I'll go help him get cleaned up, Yori," Marco offered, stepping forward. Sabo hesitated, biting his tongue from telling the commander that Luffy could do it on his own just fine. He really didn't want to send Luffy off on his own, much less with someone else, but he also didn't want to send Ace off with the nurses alone, and he knew that if Luffy went with him to the infirmary, then he would probably have a panic attack with all the triggers that go along with the place. His best option was to send Luffy with Marco. Sure, the man had become much more trustworthy in his eyes, especially after today where he had saved both Ace and Luffy when he couldn't, but did that mean he trusted him to go alone with Luffy? "What do you think, Lou?" Sabo asked quickly, and even though Luffy was more than a bit out of it after everything, he was still able to look over to Marco and judge the man's intentions. "Good. Trust him," Luffy replied simply. He did trust Marco, and he knew that even if he wasn't with Sabo, his brother would still keep an ear out to make sure he was okay. Sabo looked at Luffy for a second before nodding. Thank you, Commander, Sabo said, watching carefully as Luffy slowly stood up and began trudging away. Sabo couldn't help but send him a worried glance before he could hear the nurses closing in, ready to take Ace away from him. The walk with Marco and Luffy was made in silence, the two of them heading straight to the washroom, where Marco started filling up a bucket with hot water. Luffy sat down on a bench and watched Ace's wave closely, constantly aware of how fast it was fading. He was so focused on it he almost didn't realize Marco was kneeling in front of him, the bucket at his side and washcloth in hand, dripping with hot water. I sent Izo to get you some new clothes, but for now let's get all the blood off, Yoi, Marco said. Luffy nodded numbly, putting out one of his hands and letting Marco gently wipe away the blood. Something Sabo and Luffy hadn't thought about was just how pliable Luffy's skin could be sometimes, and it was at this moment Luffy realized that he may very well get caught having a devil fruit power. Although Marco was being gentle, he was still rubbing hard enough for the blood to come off, in turn allowing the skin to stretch just a bit too much. As long as Marco didn't look too much into it he would be fine, but Luffy hoped now, of all times, wouldn't be the time that the pirates found out about his powers. Everything went well though, and soon Marco was removing blood from his face, everything else clean. Luffy had been intently watching the wave and was extremely nervous to say that it hadn't gotten better, but on the bright side, it also wasn't getting any worse. It was faint and barely visible, but it was there, and Luffy just prayed that it didn't suddenly disappear on him. He wasn't sure what happened to the wave when someone died, but he was guessing that it wouldn't be visible at all. There, that should be good, Yoi, Marco said, dipping the washcloth into the now red water, and wiping his own hands off. A knock on the door had Marco standing, opening it to find Izo. Luffy didn't bother listening to the conversation, and it was over within seconds anyways, Marco coming back in with new clothes in his hands. Here. I'll leave so you can get dressed, Yoi. If you need anything just call. Marco said, and once more Luffy nodded mutely. He watched Marco go and waited until the door was firmly shut before he stood, frowning deeply and letting his tears fall fast and hard. He hadn't exactly been holding them in on purpose, but now that there was no one there, they had just come. With blurry vision he managed to change his clothes, vaguely aware of the fact that he could smell and hear both Marco and Izo outside the room, telling him that they were both waiting for him. Wiping away any residual tears, Luffy picked up his dirty clothes and headed to the door, opening it and peeking out. Hey there Luffy, everything good? Izo asked with a small smile. Luffy nodded a bit hesitantly before he opened the door more and stepped out. He trusted Izo a bit too, but not as much as he trusted Marco. Lady Not Lady had helped him with his hat though, and he knew he wasn't all that bad. Why don't I take those from you? Izo asked, gesturing to the dirty clothes in Luffy's hand. Again Luffy nodded, handing the items over to the man and standing awkwardly. Let's head back to the deck, Yoi, Marco said, he and Izo turning and beginning walking. Luffy was a little twitchy as he followed, still unsure about everything. He was alone, without his brothers, and he just wanted to be with Ace, but Ace was in the infirmary, and the infirmary smelled like the facility, and Luffy didn't want to think about the facility right now, but now he was thinking about the facility, and he was about to start crying again. But Ace doesn't like crybabies, and one time my brother got hurt. Almost as bad as Ace did, Yuri. Marco's voice drew Luffy out of his spiraling thoughts, and his focus was on the commander now. Izo glanced over to Marco with a hint of confusion on his face, yet he said nothing, letting Marco continue. It was when we went to defend one of our islands. You know what devil fruits are, right, Yuri? Marco asked, and Luffy nodded. Well, he had one, my brother. His name's Lyle, don't think you've met him yet, Yuri. Anyways, we were in a fight with some pirates who thought they were big shots, and could take one of Pop's territories. I think it's safe to say that they were wrong, but that didn't mean we won without casualties. Marco said, and Luffy, for once, wasn't focused on the fight that had happened only a handful of minutes ago. He wasn't worried about everything that had happened at the facility. He wasn't even worried about the fact that he was walking with two people who weren't his brothers. His whole attention was put to focusing on Marco's words, listening to the story with avid interest. Lyle's a part of my division, so he was near me when we were fighting. We were almost finished, but right as I finished taking down my opponent, Yuri, I sensed someone going to attack Lyle, who was taking on a few of his own opponents. I didn't have time to reach him, and he ended up with a large cut along his hip, from armpit to the back of his knee. Marco explained, pointing along his own body where the cut had been. Luffy's eyes widened at how massive the cut was, waiting for Marco to continue, wanting to know how it ended. We took down the rest of the pirates and had Whiskey and the others come to take the injured. Lyle had to go into surgery, and no one knew if he would make it, Yuri. After a few hours, Whiskey came out and told us she had managed to save him just in time, and now he's perfectly healthy. He's even got the scar to prove he survived, Yuri. Marco said, finishing the story as they reached the deck. Really? Luffy asked in wonder. Marco smiled to him, nodding as he made his way to Whitebeard. Really, Marco said, and Luffy beamed. Ace is strong, he's gonna survive, I know it. Luffy said confidently, gripping the edges of his straw hat tightly in both hands, pulling it down onto his head. I believe that you're. Why don't we go wait by Pops? I'm sure he's got plenty more stories to tell than I do, you're. Marco said, waving a hand over to the captain. Luffy, smile still on his face, nodded rapidly. If there was anyone on this ship he trusted more than Marco, it was the captain. He knew he would be safe by the giant, and had no qualms about waiting for his brothers there. As he began making his way there, Izo stopped Marco, waiting until Luffy was out of hearing range. Lyle got that scar in a bar fight, Izo said with a raised eyebrow. Marco smiled to him, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. I know. Sabo sighed in both relief and exhaustion. It had been nearly an hour, maybe 2, since the nurses had come and taken Ace into the infirmary. At first, they weren't going to let Sabo follow them, but after a bit of arguing on his part and Whitebeard's permission, he was allowed to stand along the wall, out of the nurse's way, and watch. It had been extremely touch and go for a while, and Sabo's eyes were feeling a bit strained from how carefully he was watching every nurse's movement, making sure they were solely trying to patch his brother up, and not do any weird unnecessary tests in the process. At one point they had nearly lost Ace, and Sabo was sure Luffy was freaking out, but every time he tried listening in on his brother he heard nothing from him, just Marco or the water they were cleaning him up with. Finally, though, the nurses had finished. Ace was stabilized and Luffy was being kept occupied by Whitebeard, who was telling him stories. Sabo definitely felt his trust in Whitebeard and Marco rise after this incident, especially with everything that had happened. They had had plenty of opportunities to get rid of the brothers, be it through sending them to the Marines or just letting them die, but they had adamantly fought against all those opportunities and kept the brothers safe. Why don't you go tell your brother that this one's fine? We'll move him to a bed to rest, and you two can come back and wait with him. Whiskey said softly as she walked up to Sabo. She looked exhausted as well, her hair frizzy and forehead slick with sweat. Her gloves and clothes were both covered in blood, and all in all she looked a mess, but that's what hours of surgery does to a person. A quick glance at Ace showed his brother sleeping peacefully, a bit paler than he should be, but alive and breathing. Normally Sabo wouldn't let Ace out of his sight after this, but right now he needed to get Luffy and tell him Ace was okay for the time being. Hopefully, their brother's fast healing would kick in now, and he'd be good to go in a few days. Besides, after all of this, his trust in the nurses on this ship had also increased. It was a small increase, but it was an increase all the same. Alright, I'll be back, Sabo said, and he could even hear how tired he sounded. He left the infirmary, keeping an ear out for the nurses trying to do anything to Ace they weren't supposed to. His trust in them may have gone up a bit, but like he said, it wasn't that much. He walked quietly through the halls, using both his memory and hearing to make his way to the deck. When he reached it he beelined right to Luffy and Whitebeard, having no doubt that Luffy could smell him coming, but was too caught up in Whitebeard's story to notice. Sabo smiled a bit at that, happy that at least Luffy was able to relax instead of worry over Ace like he had been. Luffy, Sabo called as he grew closer, noticing that a few of the commanders were there too, namely Marco, Izo, Jozu, and Kirill. Sabo. And just like that Luffy seemed to remember everything that had happened as he launched up from where he was sitting in front of Whitebeard, turning to Sabo and bolting over to him. Obviously, he wasn't planning on stopping with how fast he was going, and Sabo braced himself, ready for a Luffy-sized impact. When it came he stumbled back a bit, but caught himself from falling, holding Luffy in his arms. Sabo, how's Ace? Is he okay? Can we go see him? When Sabo stopped Luffy's ramblings, laughing. Calm down Luffy, Ace is okay, Sabo said, though he couldn't really fault Luffy for worrying. Really? Luffy asked happily, relief spreading across his face. That's right. You weren't doubting him, were you? Sabo asked playfully, raising an eyebrow. Luffy shook his head, still clinging to Sabo. No? Cause Ace would get mad, and Ace is strong. Luffy said confidently. Sabo laughed again, ruffling Luffy's hair, his straw hat dangling from the string around his neck. Don't confuse strong with stubborn, Lu, Sabo said, this time causing Luffy to smile. Turning to the captain and commanders, Sabo bowed, Luffy following suit, even though he had no clue why. Thank you for helping both of my brothers, Sabo said, genuinely thankful. It was no problem, as long as you're on this ship you're a part of our family, and family keeps each other safe. Now, head off and be with your brother. Whitebeard said with a smile. Sabo stood straight, nodding to the captain and taking Luffy's hand, leading him to the infirmary. Maybe these pirates weren't so bad after all. Chapter 40. Another infirmary day. That night Luffy was riddled with nightmares. Sabo understood, he actually expected it, so every time his sensitive hearing picked up on Luffy in another one of them, he woke up and helped the youngest. Ace managed to sleep through everything and wasn't expected to get up for a few days, though Sabo and Luffy knew that he'd probably be awake by the next day. When the early morning light finally came, Sabo and Luffy both had given up on falling into any sort of peaceful sleep, opting instead to get up for the day. The nurses had let them use one of the beds beside Ace, seeing as they had more than plenty to spare. It was probably still really early. Sabo could only hear a few people up. Most of them were those on watch or beginning breakfast, meaning it was still some ungodly hour to be up. How you feeling, Lou? Sabo asked softly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His oversensitive ears were begging for silence after just waking up, but he ignored the slight ache from how loud everything seemed. Nose hurts, Luffy muttered, rubbing said appendage with a grimace. Sabo gave Luffy a sympathetic look, knowing that if his ears hurt, Luffy's nose hurt 10 times worse with the strong smells in the infirmary. Sorry Lou, hopefully it'll dull in a bit, Sabo said, rubbing Luffy's back as he got out of the bed, moving to the chair beside Ace's bed. Luffy nodded, also getting out of the bed and sitting in a chair. Bandages covered the entirety of Ace's chest, giving Sabo and Luffy no indication as to how well his wound was healing, but they were sure the nurses would come to check on it eventually. Time passed slowly, Luffy pleased to see that Ace's wave was back to full opacity and brightness, and the two began to wonder just how early they had decided to get up. Before they could think about that for long, Ace groaned, alerting them to the fact that he was waking up. Ace? Luffy cheered happily, beaming as he leaned over his waking brother. Sabo stood beside Luffy, watching with a relieved smile. Ah, geez, what hurts? Ace groaned. That would be the giant cut across your chest. Whiskey's voice made the brothers jump a bit, none of them having been aware that she had walked in, even with their senses in hockey. That was slightly concerning. Cut? What are you talking about? Ace asked, using a hand to slide himself into a sitting position. Whoa there, you shouldn't be sitting up, not with your injury. Whiskey cried, trying to urge Ace into laying back down. Although confused and disoriented, Sabo had to give Ace credit that he didn't snap at the nurse. It's fine, Ace said, rolling his eyes, but laying back down nonetheless. Whiskey sighed a breath of relief, lifting her clipboard to look at something. Regardless, you also shouldn't be up yet. You need all the rest you can get, but as long as you're up, we should change the bandages. Whiskey said, ticking something off on her board before nodding to herself, walking off, probably for bandages. Ace. I'm so happy you're awake. Your wave got really tiny and it was hard to see, and I was scared, but Marco was nice, and Mr. Captain, and once again Sabo had to cut the rambling boy off. We're both happy you're awake. Why do you always have to go and scare us though? Sabo asked, crossing his arms and giving Ace a pointed look. Hey, it's not my fault. Ace countered weakly. Sabo rolled his eyes but smiled, still happy that nothing too bad had happened. Honestly though, this had been pretty bad. Now, let's get those old bandages off. Whiskey said as she came back, Sabo and Luffy backing away a bit from the bed to give the nurse more space. All of the brothers watched her carefully, ready to stop her as she pulled anything that wasn't a bandage out. As she began unwrapping the bandages, they got themselves ready for questions that the nurse would surely have, after seeing Ace's wound being magically much better than it had been the day previous. When the bandages began unraveling away enough that they surely should have been showing a nasty gash, Whiskey was confused when she saw that the cut was much smaller than it had been, the wound having closed up a good bit during the night. It wasn't 100% healed, but after what it had looked like yesterday, this was an extreme improvement. Well, how I don't understand, Whiskey said, trailing off as she unwrapped the bandages faster, though still mindful not to hurt Ace in the process. The brothers couldn't help but be slightly amused at how at a loss the nurse was. What's wrong? Sabo asked, trying to sound worried instead of amused. No, nothing's wrong, it's just you've seemed to heal at an absolutely remarkable rate. Whiskey said, still amazed as she fully unwrapped the wound, standing back to look. What might have caused it? Sabo asked, continuing to play dumb, watching in amusement as Whiskey tried to figure it out. I don't know. This happened last time too though, with the coma. You woke up much earlier than you should have. Whiskey said, thinking for another second before snapping out of it. Well, in any case, this means you'll be able to leave by tomorrow then. Whiskey announced, moving to rewrap the wound. As she finished she took a few more notes, and did a quick checkup on all three of them before leaving. Man am I glad she's gone. Ace said as he sat up again, this time without Whiskey telling him to lie back down. She's just doing her job, Ace, but I've gotta agree with you on that one, Sabo said with a sigh, sitting back down in the chair, while Luffy had no qualms about getting into the bed with Ace. So, what have I missed? Ace asked as he stretched, wincing when he pulled his arm too far, and it stretched the wound as well, sending a pain through him. Well, Whitebeard and Marco are both good guys, Sabo said, remembering how they had taken care of Luffy yesterday. Ace raised an eyebrow at that though, wrapping an arm around Luffy to make it more comfortable for the both of them. What do you mean? I thought we already knew that, Ace said, thinking back to the fact that Luffy had deemed them good a long time ago. We knew they probably wouldn't be the ones to turn on us without warning, but now we know we can trust them, at least, to an extent, Sabo explained, only proving to confuse Ace further. What? When did that happen? The eldest asked, not quite sure how he felt about trusting anyone on this ship. Yesterday. Marco was really nice and helped me clean up after you got hurt, and he told me a story about his brother, and then Whitebeard told me all these cool stories about his adventures, while I waited for Sabo to get me. Luffy explained with a smile. Ace gave Sabo an incredulous look at that though, eyes wide. You left him alone with them, Ace practically shouted, though trying his best to stay quiet to keep from drawing attention to them. Sabo sighed, knowing this was bound to happen. I wasn't happy about it either, Ace, but there was no choice. Sabo tried explaining. Ace scoffed. What do you mean, no choice? All you had to do was keep him with you, Ace said. Sabo tried keeping calm, knowing Ace had no idea the state he and Luffy had been in yesterday after he had been attacked. I don't think you understand, Ace. After you were attacked, Luffy was practically hysterical and already on the verge of panicking. When they sent for nurses, I wasn't going to just let them take you here without making sure they didn't try doing any tests on you, so I had to follow them. But if I had taken Luffy with me, he surely would have been thrown into a panic attack. Sabo said, a bit slower than normal to make sure Ace understood every word he was saying. Therefore, I had to leave him to at least get himself cleaned up while I watched the nurses. I kept an ear on him the entire time and left him with Marco, seeing as we already knew he was a relatively good guy to begin with. But after you went down, he saved both you and Luffy from someone trying to attack you. It would have been the perfect excuse to let both of you die, because no one could blame him for not getting there fast enough, but he chose to save you too when I couldn't. Sabo continued. Ace was silent now, mulling over his brother's words, while Luffy snuggled into Ace at the mention of everything that had happened yesterday. Alright, so Marco's a good guy, and I guess Whitebeard's a pretty good guy too, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna trust them with everything, Ace said defiantly. Sabo sighed in relief, glad that Ace at least trusted the two a bit. I didn't expect you to. I don't think even I trust them with everything yet either, Sabo said, Luffy nodding his agreement silently. It fell silent after that, Sabo listening to everything else to figure out around what time it was. I think breakfast is ready by the sounds of it. Thatch just said he's coming here, probably with food, Sabo said as he focused on the footsteps of the chef. He is, it smells really good, his bacon's the best, Luffy said, mouth watering at the smell of the bacon, toast, eggs, orange juice, muffins, bagels. The food in general. Ace pouted at his brother's words, resisting the urge to cross his arms. Still think I should have gotten X-ray vision too. What's the point of supervision if I'm always limited by walls? Ace asked, glaring at the walls surrounding them. This time Sabo rolled his eyes, slapping Ace's arm. Don't say that. For all we know that was their next idea, Sabo said. Ace sighed. Yeah, those doctors were insane, he muttered with a frown. Later that day, the commanders and captain were in their meeting room going over everything that had happened, not having had time to yesterday with everything that had been going on. Do we know how the pirates got close enough to attack without any of us noticing? Whitebeard asked from where he sat. The commanders glanced at each other, wondering if anyone knew. I overheard that one guy had a devil fruit that they use, but other than that I have no clue, Jiro announced. That seemed the most logical, because without a devil fruit how else would they have gotten so close without any of them detecting them? Not to mention that the enemy's ship had literally appeared right beside theirs. Anyone else hear anything, Yuri? Marco asked, everyone shaking their heads in response. I didn't hear anything, but they had to have had some weird devil fruit for them to appear without any of us sensing them with Haki until it was too late, Rikuo said, everyone, nodding their agreement. Speaking of, how did Ace know Luffy was gonna be attacked? Blenheim asked. Thatch raised an eyebrow. Ace knew? The chef asked. He hadn't been out on deck when the attack started, having been stuck in the kitchen working on lunch since the other chefs were sick. Oh yeah, he jumped up from where he was sleeping, and pulled Luffy off the railing before he could get hit. Too bad he ended up getting hurt though, Haruta said, remembering back to the events of yesterday. I'm telling you guys, they have Haki. Remember when I was telling you all about Sabo's uncanny ability to know I was gonna knock? Thatch said in an I told you so manner. Did you ask them if they had Haki? Whitebeard asked, curiosity rising. Yeah, but Sabo had no clue what I was talking about, Thatch said, confused now too. It's rare, but maybe they were born with it, Aizo questioned. There was a collective shrug from everyone seeing as they knew nothing about the brothers. Whatever the case, it's likely that the brothers have Haki, so we should keep that in mind, Yoi, Marco said, writing something down on a piece of paper. How many were injured in the attack? Whitebeard asked, moving on with the meeting. 15, including Ace, Namor stated, having been in charge of counting heads and helping people to the infirmary. Whiskey should be by soon with her report on the injured, Josu said, glancing over to the door. As they waited for the nurse to arrive, they went over everything that had happened yesterday once more, so they could make sure everything was in order, and also making sure Thatch knew what happened. It wasn't too long into the retelling that there was a knock at the door, Whiskey announcing her presence and Whitebeard calling for her to enter. I brought the report on the injured Oyaji, she said, waving the file in the air. Whitebeard nodded and she sat down at the end of the table, opening the folder and looking at the contents. Well, for starters, almost all of the injuries were minor, just some small cuts and bruises here and there. Kid had a particularly deep cut though that needed a few stitches, and Roman got himself a pretty bad sprained ankle, so he shouldn't do anything strenuous, but other than that everyone's clear. Whiskey reported, checking over her notes to be sure she mentioned everything, not that there was much to mention. What about Ace? Atmos asked, everyone wondering the same thing. Here Whiskey sighed, slumping down a bit and confusing everyone. Is something wrong, daughter? Whitebeard asked, worried that something bad might have happened to Ace regarding his injury. Whitebeard hadn't gotten a good look at it when it had happened, but the glance he did see told him that it was a pretty bad wound. No, nothing's wrong, actually, everything's great. Whiskey said, running her fingers through her hair in slight frustration. Oh okay, so what's the issue? Thatch asked, raising an eyebrow. Everyone watched her with curiosity, wondering what had Whiskey so thrown. As I said, there's no issue. Ace's wound initially was life-threatening. After hours of surgery, we managed to stabilize him to the point where we didn't need to worry about him dying on us. I bandaged him up and left him to rest. Whiskey recounted, remembering just how bad the eldest brother's gash had been yesterday. Thing is, with how bad it was, he wasn't expected to wake up for at least a few days. Now, it isn't all that surprising that he woke up today, but what is surprising is that, when I went to change his bandages, his injury was almost completely healed. Whiskey said incredulously, throwing her hands in the air in confusion. Wait, almost healed. How's that possible? Vista asked, causing Whiskey to huff. Beats me. That kid should have a painful throbbing wound right across his chest, and now it's barely causing him any pain and nearly healed. It makes no sense. Whiskey said, looking over the notes she had about Ace's wounds again, thinking that there had to be something there that could explain this. All I know is that something had to be ramping up his cells, allowing them to multiply faster and repair the wound, but whatever's causing them to do that, I haven't a clue. Whiskey said, reading and rereading her notes in growing frustration. Maybe he's just a fast healer. Harita asked, knowing it was a stupid suggestion, but not having any other ideas. Screw fast, he's practically a miracle healer. That wound needed weeks to heal, not days, and much less two. By tomorrow, if his healing continues on this rate, he should be out of the infirmary with just as small a cut where it was deeper. There also should be scarring based on how deep he was cut, but at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if there was none. Whiskey said with an exhausted sigh. These brothers make less and less sense the more we know about them, King Du said, sitting back and crossing his arms. Really, we don't know anything about them, everything we think we know is just speculation, Yuri. Marco corrected, scribbling some more writing down on his paper. When will we get any answers about them? Thatch whined, throwing his arms back behind his head and tilting his chair back on its back legs. I'm sure when they're more comfortable around us and see we mean no harm, they'll explain the things we don't understand, Izo said, pulling out his fan to hide his face. Well, how long is that gonna take? Fossa asked. Patience, my sons, after the trauma those boys have been through, it's not surprising that they aren't willing to give information so easy, Whitebeard said, trying to soothe his sons. Boyaji's right, whatever they've been through has definitely taken its toll on them. I'd say we're lucky we even know as much about them as we do. Whiskey said, trying to find the light in their small victories. Yeah, I bet it won't be long now till they see we're not trying to hurt them. After all, just yesterday Sobel left Luffy all alone with us, right? Haruta asked, remembering that it had been the first time Luffy, or any of the brothers really, had been without the other two at their side. He did, didn't he? Maybe they're getting more comfortable here. Vista said fondly, smiling at the thought. With that there wasn't any more to be said, so the meeting was ended, the commanders and captain all getting up to go do their own things. Man, I still can't believe I missed all the fun yesterday. Thatch whined as he stood up and headed to the door. Oh, don't worry Thatch, knowing these waters we'll be having another fight in no time. Rikyu said, patting the chef on the back as he passed him out the door. Yeah, I guess you're right, but I totally missed a chance to hang out with little Luffy too. Thatch cried, crocodile tears forming fast. And there'll be more opportunities for that as well, Izo said, rolling his eyes as he also left the room. Thatch huffed, watching as the last commander left the room. Why do I always miss those opportunities? Well guys, that is it for now. Make sure to like and subscribe for a cookie and join the Discord if you want. Anyway, see you guys later.